Rise of the European Emperor by Taishan Laonyo.
Chapter 1731 Sisal and Iron Oregon. Although it is fearless, in fact, this kind of dreadnought is not really afraid of nothing. If you encounter the fire ship tactics, even if it is covered with iron sheets, wooden ships are easy to catch fire. Therefore, fearless is actually just not afraid of artillery fire. If you really want to make this kind of battleship invincible, you have to equip the battleship with super powerful artillery. For example, the 68-pound Pexon gun. This short-barreled super-heavy artillery can be said to be the terminator of the wooden ship era. Because of the Pexon gun, the world's naval warfare has entered the era of ironclad ships. But in this era, it is extremely difficult to build ironclad ships. Apart from other things, other countries will not build stainless steel that is resistant to seawater corrosion. Therefore, as long as the Pexon gun is built, the entire ocean can be monopolized. Marin remembered that there were two 68-pound short-barreled heavy guns on the British Navy's flagship Victory in later generations. These two guns, as long as they are accurate, can solve a French battleship with two guns. That is a battleship of the same class. The thickness of the side is not generally strong, at least several times thicker than the sideline thickness of warships of other countries in this era. If it is used to deal with the mainstream European boats of 200 to 300 tons in this era, it is estimated that one cannon can kill one. However, this kind of heavy cannon, even with a short barrel, is very difficult to cast. The casting of heavy cannons is not just pouring molten iron into the mold. It is also necessary to consider that there should be no sand holes on the gun body. As long as there is an unreasonable structure, the cannon will be useless. Therefore, this requires craftsmen to try a lot. Once this kind of heavy cannon is made, it will be invincible when matched with the Dreadnought-class, 1,000-ton battleship. Of course, the number must be sufficient. If the number is small, it will be difficult to achieve enough results. After all, a sailboat is a sailboat. Even if Marin has stainless steel technology, it is difficult to transform the ship into an ironclad ship. Because if the ship is too heavy, the sails can't carry it. Therefore, Marin only dared to let his men cover the wooden boat with iron sheets, and at most cover the side with steel plates. Then, there was no other action. Otherwise, there is too much steel, and the ship will crawl at a snail's pace on the sea. Even if it is covered with a little iron sheet and steel plate, it will affect the speed of the ship. For example, according to the original design of the Constitution, the ship's speed should be able to reach 13 knots. However, due to the drag of the armor weight, the speed was reduced to 12 knots. Although it is still faster than the 10 knots of an ordinary galleon, it is still dragged down. Historically, ironclad ships did not appear until the mid-19th century. In addition to steel technology, power is also an important factor. Without a large marine steam engine to provide power, don't even think about building a real ironclad ship. Otherwise, with that weight, if driven by a sail, it can only crawl on the sea surface. It should be pointed out that in addition to building a dreadnought this time, the New York shipyard also launched a modification package for 500-ton battleships covering the side with iron sheets, plus upgrading masts and sails. Covering the side with iron sheets is easy to understand, that is, covering the side of the Hoffman-class 500-ton battleship with stainless steel iron sheets to enhance the side's anti-strike capability. To upgrade the mast and sail, something special is needed, sisal fiber. Originally, because the Hoffman-class battleships used cables and canvas made of flax fibers, the sails could not be too large or too high. Otherwise, the sails would be easily broken by the wind. Therefore, the previous Hoffman-class battleships had a speed similar to that of ordinary galleons, with a maximum of 10 knots, because the sail area was not enough. But now it is different, because Cuba has begun to mass-produce sisal. With enough sisal fiber, the department responsible for the design and manufacture of sails in the shipyard can make sails with a larger area. This kind of sail is mainly made of sisal fiber, which has a strong tensile strength. Therefore, it can also be made very large and not afraid of the tearing of the sea breeze. Then, it can also bring greater thrust to the ship. This is the secret of the Constitution of later generations to break the 10-knot speed limit of the galleon, because after the Constitution of later generations was modified, it directly used nylon ropes with strong tension to make sails, which could make the sail surface very large and make full use of the wind. Marin didn't have nylon ropes, but naturally grown sisal fibers were stronger. In later generations, the only disadvantage of sisal fiber compared to nylon ropes was probably the higher cost. In terms of performance, sisal was a complete winner. So much so that many ships in the 21st century still use sisal ropes. The only advantage of nylon is probably its low cost. In other words, with enough sisal fibers, the North Sea Kingdom can now get high-strength canvas. Even the sails don't need to be made entirely of sisal fibers, they only need to be woven with sisal fibers to form the main structure. Then, fill the middle with flax fibers. With this technology, the North Sea Kingdom's ships will be able to make masts higher in the future. Then, make the canvas larger so that it can fully absorb the wind, propel the ship, and achieve a higher speed. Don't increase it too much, just 2 or 3 knots like the Constitution, that's enough. After passing Marin's acceptance and being named, Captain Hobbit drove the dreadnought back to New York with his men. At the same time, he also brought the order to build 20 more of these warships. Of course, the New York shipyard is only responsible for shipbuilding. The stainless steel sheets and steel plates for ship armor still have to be produced by the steel mills in Crumhorn. After all, up to now, the American colonies have not had their own steel bases. Cape Breton Island has the Sydney coal mine, but no iron mines. The iron mines in North America are mainly in the western part of the Great Lakes region. In other words, Marin needs to send troops to occupy the entire Pennsylvania, and even go west to Michigan before he can find the world-famous rich iron mines. The Appalachian Mountains in western Pennsylvania have rich coal resources. Pittsburgh, the American steel center in later generations, developed into a steel center because it is located at the western foot of the Appalachian Mountains, next to the coal mines, and convenient for transporting iron ore from Michigan. But whether it is to occupy the Pittsburgh area in western Pennsylvania or to reach the iron mining area in Michigan, it is still a long way off. Therefore, the steel of the North Sea Kingdom currently still relies mainly on bituminous coal shipped from the Ruhr area, processed into coke, and then imported laterite iron ore from Luxembourg to process into steel. However, the poor Habsburg family has mortgaged all the iron ore in Luxembourg to Marin in exchange for 3 batches of loans of up to 900,000 gold coins, accounting for the absolute majority of the lending business of the Bank of Siena. Moreover, judging from the emperor's intention, it seems that he does not want to repay the money and intends to directly use the mortgage of the Luxembourg iron ore area to offset the loan. Don't be surprised, the Habsburg family is so poor in this era. Because of Marin's intervention, Charles V failed to get the Spanish Empire, which owned the gold and silver mines in America, so the Habsburg family is still a poor family. Not to mention iron ore, the gold and silver mines in Austria have all been mortgaged by the Habsburg family. Among them, the Tyrol silver mine, the largest silver mine in Europe, was mortgaged to the Fugger family. Marin did not care and planned to formally negotiate with the emperor after a while to use the ownership of the laterite iron ore area in southern Luxembourg to offset part of the loan. Of course, it is impossible to offset all 900,000 gold coins. Because the iron ore is not worth that much. It's not that the iron ore with hundreds of millions of tons of reserves is not worth that much money, but because, even if there are hundreds of millions of tons of iron ore, without the help of modern machinery, there is only a small amount that can be developed. The part that can be mined and utilized every year is very limited. Therefore, its value is greatly discounted. Therefore, Marin plans to transfer the iron ore to himself at a discount of 300,000 or 400,000 gold coins, together with the territorial ownership of the red soil area in southern Luxembourg. In this way, the steel industry of the North Sea will no longer be controlled by others. Although Luxembourg's hundreds of millions of tons of iron ore are not much, that is compared with later generations. In this era, the demand for steel is very low. Even the Ming Empire, which has the largest steel production, only produces tens of thousands of tons of steel per year. Moreover, Europe's iron production at this time is far lower than that of the Ming dynasty. Luxembourg's laterite iron ore is enough for Marin to use for many years. Chapter 1732 Efficient Spring Plowing. At present, the steel production of the North Sea is relatively low. The steel plant in Crumhorn currently has only 3 10-ton iron-making small blast furnaces, which produce about 30 tons of pig iron per day. Even if it is operated all year round, the annual pig iron production is only 10,950 tons, which is just over 10,000 tons. Of course, in this era, this output is already very remarkable. Because this is already the top in Europe. Other European countries have just evolved from block iron-making technology to furnace iron-making technology. The specific time is probably in the middle of the 15th century. Before the middle of the 15th century, most of the steel smelted in Europe was the softer sponge iron obtained from block iron making. Without carboizing treatment, the strength of this iron is not as good as bronze. Moreover, even if there is a furnace for iron making now, it is still only a small furnace for iron making, and it has not yet evolved into a blast furnace, let alone coke steel making. The steel production of various countries has always been very low. A top country like France has an annual steel production of only a few thousand tons, which is not as good as the only steel plant in the North Sea. What does steel mean? It means weapons and equipment, and it means the innovation of farm tools. Because of the emergence of harder pig iron ingots, the French plate armor began to become extremely strong and no longer afraid of the English longbow. The plate armor made of sponge iron before was often shot through. With the application of artillery, France won the 100 Years' War and established its dominance in Europe. But the steel technology of the North Sea Kingdom is even better. Because of the existence of Marin, the Traverser, the North Sea Kingdom directly skipped the pig iron age and entered the steel age. If quantified by warcraft, the level of French technology is still at the level of iron armor of a base. The North Sea Kingdom has entered the steel armor age of a base 2. The annual output of pig iron in the North Sea Kingdom is about 10,000 tons, with errors, most of which are used to make farm tools and general tools. For Europe, the backwardness of agriculture at this time is all round. It is not just a problem of fertilization technology, nor is it just a problem of irrigation technology, but even iron farm tools are seriously insufficient. When Marin just crossed over, even the serfs in the Hoffman family's manor could not have an iron farm tool per person. Many serfs used wooden mattocks to turn the soil, so the efficiency can be imagined. But there is no way. Steel is a strategic material in Europe at this time. Most of it is made into swords and plate armor. How can there be any extra to make farm tools? The development of agriculture in the North Sea Kingdom is not only technologically advanced, but also has problems with tools. In the North Sea Kingdom, basically every manor has enough iron farm tools. And this is the credit of the 3 small blast furnaces in the steel plant in Crumhorn. Only a small part of the pig iron will be used to make steel. At present, the steel-making technology in the North Sea Kingdom is actually a bit backward. There are 2 main types, one is crucible steelmaking, which is mainly used to produce weapons and armor. The other is reverberatory furnace secondary refining, which is mainly used for casting cannons. The steel products of crucible steelmaking have a high carbon content and are mainly used to make swords and armor. And reverberatory furnace refining, after control, including the addition of high-purity graphite, mostly obtains low-carbon steel. If the carbon content is not controlled, it is wrought iron for casting cannons. Of course, open hearth furnaces with regenerative heat are also in use, but the technology is not yet mature and is being tested and improved, and has not yet been widely promoted. Iron farm tools are so important to agriculture that the farm tools made of pig iron in the North Sea Kingdom are not only supplied to the country, but also promoted to neighboring friendly countries. Of course, it is not cheap. You know, the cost of using a small blast furnace to smelt iron in the North Sea Kingdom is only a fraction of the cost of using an ordinary small furnace in a blacksmith shop. But because of the limestone desulfurization and descaling process, the quality of iron farm tools in the North Sea Kingdom is better than that of ordinary blacksmith shops. In terms of price, the price of iron farm tools in the North Sea Kingdom is similar to that of ordinary blacksmith shops, but the profit is several times higher and the quality is better. As a result, many blacksmiths in other countries went bankrupt and hated the North Sea Kingdom. Of course, the North Sea Kingdom did not care about these. Some blacksmiths, because they lost their jobs, even ran to the hostile countries of the North Sea Kingdom and became mercenaries. Of course, there are also smart blacksmiths who changed to importing pig iron ingots from the North Sea Kingdom, and then processed them into tools needed by the people, so as to continue to make money. In the end, the only unlucky ones were those blacksmiths who made their own iron. In addition, there were even smarter ones. They found that the quality of pig iron in the North Sea was higher than that of French military pig iron, and then they actually imported pig iron farm tools from the North Sea, and then melted them to make weapons and armor, which were surprisingly popular. But this was only limited to those countries with poor relations with the North Sea. Countries with good relations with the North Sea could directly import steel weapons and armor from the North Sea, which were of better quality, and much better. The progress of steel technology has greatly promoted agriculture. For example, the Prade plow launched last year has shown extremely brightly this year. The spring plowing in the North Sea this year is extremely extraordinary, because the Prade plow has been widely promoted and applied. The Prade plow has 3 plowshares of a curved plow, which is pulled by multiple animals together, and the efficiency is more than 3 times higher than that of a single curved plow. If it is pulled by 12 draft horses together, the daily cultivated land can reach 30 mu. Later, it was pulled by 6 cows together, and the daily cultivated land reached 15 mu. But later tests found that it seemed very dangerous to use several bulls to pull the plow together. In particular, when several bulls were together. Bulls have very bad tempers, and the breeding of hornless bulls was not yet on a large scale in this era, and most bulls had horns. Bulls have bad tempers, and putting several bulls together is even more fatal. No other actions are needed, no need to pull the nose ring of the bull, just tilt the head and stab with the horn, and a bloody incident can occur. Therefore, the final test showed that bulls cannot be put together to pull the plow. Then, people mainly choose cows with good tempers to pull the plow together. Or, use castrated bulls with good tempers to pull the cart together. The same is true for draft horses. If uncastrated stallions are used to pull the cart together, the stallions will kick each other with their hind legs, or bite each other with their mouths. Therefore, the horses that pull the plow together also need to be mares or castrated stallions. And just before the new year, Marin generously imported 20,000 ordinary draft horses from Crimea, so that Bahai state has an endless supply of draft horses for this year's spring plowing. Although the pulling power of Crimea's Eastern European Mongolian horses cannot match that of Western Europe's professional large draft horses, Eastern European Mongolian horses have good endurance. What they lack in strength, they make up for in endurance. After using 16 horses to pull the plow, the efficiency became almost the same as that of 12 ordinary Western European draft horses. Moreover, these 16 Eastern European Mongolian horses require much less feed than 12 Western European draft horses, which is very economical. More importantly, except when working, these Eastern European Mongolian horses only need to be fed with grass, and do not need expensive food. Normally, each farmer can only cultivate 4 to 6 acres of land, 4 acres is plowed by oxen, and 6 acres, which is 1 acre, is plowed by horses. Now with the parade plow and sufficient livestock, the spring plowing in the North Sea this year is very fast and efficient. It has only been half a month, and the amount of spring plowing that usually takes more than a month has been completed. Chapter 1733, Alfalfa and Ryegrass Mixed Seeding Technology. After the plowing, it was time for the harrow to perform. The harrow was more efficient, and it could sow 40 to 50 mu of land in a day, which was extremely efficient. Then, after the spring plowing and sowing were over, it started in April. In other countries, spring plowing had just been carried out for a small part. Seeing that the whole country was about to take a break, Marin felt it was a bit of a waste. Suddenly, he remembered that he could grow grass. The so-called grass planting does not mean planting the kind of grass used for greening in later generations, but planting forage grass. It is mainly alfalfa, and there is ryegrass. Ryegrass is not rye, the two are two different things. Rye, also called black wheat, is a grain crop. But ryegrass is forage grass, which belongs to another thing. The most powerful thing about ryegrass is that it grows more than 1 year. In other words, it can be harvested many times a year. Of course, it can also be directly grazed, letting cattle and sheep graze on the ground. After eating, rush to other places. After a month or so, ryegrass will grow again and can be grazed again. Therefore, in those pastures in later generations, ryegrass and alfalfa are generally mixed. For example, Australia generally adopts the technology of mixed sowing of alfalfa and ryegrass. Why do we need to sow with alfalfa? Because alfalfa is a legume crop that can fix nitrogen. Planting alfalfa can fertilize the land. Ryegrass, on the other hand, is a crop that consumes the soil. Planting ryegrass alone even requires fertilizer. By sowing alfalfa and ryegrass in fertile land, we can take advantage of the nitrogen-fixing and fertilizing effect of alfalfa while raising ryegrass. In this way, there is no need to fertilize the pasture. Moreover, alfalfa itself is a top-quality pasture. However, the grasslands in the North Sea Kingdom are mostly native weeds, and the animal husbandry effect is not good. It is difficult for cattle and sheep to grow fat after eating. Therefore, Marin came up with the idea, why not take advantage of the opportunity of spring plowing to plant alfalfa and ryegrass on the land that has not been reclaimed as farmland as much as possible. Alfalfa fixes nitrogen and fertilizes the land, and ryegrass can provide multiple rounds of fodder for livestock. As long as the pasture planting is done well, the North Sea Kingdom can raise more horses, cattle and sheep in the future. Moreover, these specialized pastures are rich in nutrients and can also be used as feed, replacing grain, and used to raise horses. In addition, Marin also plans to rotate crops. The North Sea country has enough land, but it is very fertile to grow grain on a piece of land. Although there is a complete fertilizer technology with 3 fertilizers, it is not as good as the fertility of the land itself. Marin's plan is to rotate arable land and grassland. He plans to reclaim the same or even larger grassland around the arable land and mix alfalfa and ryegrass. With the nitrogen-fixing fertilizer function of alfalfa, the grassland will become fertile in 1 or 2 years. The arable land on the side will become barren because of the consumption of fertility. But it doesn't matter. After 1 or 2 years, the arable land and grassland will be exchanged. The original grassland grows grain, while the original arable land grows alfalfa and ryegrass. In this way, the fertility of the land is maintained. Moreover, the grassland planted with specialized pasture can also allow farmers to raise horses, cattle and sheep on a large scale. Apart from anything else, the feed for horses used in arable land alone is in sufficient supply. You know, although the Eastern European Mongolian horses eat a lot of grass. However, eating professional nutritious forage grass is different from eating ordinary weeds. If the horses eat too much weeds, they will grow thin and weak. However, if they eat forage grass every day, they will be fat and strong. During the busy farming season, they will have more strength to pull the plow and cart. So, Marin ordered the farmers who had finished spring plowing and planting to continue to plow the land beside the farmland to plant professional forage grass. Why plow the land? Because the original weeds should be killed. If the soil is plowed up, the roots of those weeds will be exposed to the air and endure the spring cold. Then, they will freeze to death. There are no herbicides these days. If you want to solve those weeds, you can only do this. After those weeds are frozen to death, alfalfa and ryegrass will be mixed. In this way, the original weeds can be replaced smoothly with professional forage grass. With an order, the farmers continued to move and continued to plow the land beside the cultivated land. But after the land was plowed, Marin found an extremely embarrassing thing: he didn't have enough forage seeds. This era was not the era of highly modernized animal husbandry in later generations. Europeans in this era did not attach importance to the cultivation of professional forage at all. Only the North Sea Kingdom cultivated a lot of alfalfa and stored a lot of alfalfa seeds. However, this reserve is really insignificant compared with the huge North Sea Kingdom. You know, the North Sea Kingdom has 12 million acres of arable land. If it follows the crop rotation system, at least 12 million acres of pasture will need to be planted. But the alfalfa seeds in the North Sea Kingdom are only enough to sow 1 million acres, less than 1/10 of the demand. As for ryegrass seeds, there are quite a few in England. Because England mainly relies on ryegrass to raise sheep. But Marin sent people to purchase them, and only enough to plant 1.2 million acres. After all, there are only more wild ryegrass in England, and ryegrass is not deliberately planted and cultivated, so the number of seeds is limited. Then, Marin was embarrassed. More than 10 million mu of grassland were plowed in the country, but only 2.2 million mu of seeds were available. In desperation, Marin had to order some grain seeds to be sown on the land that lacked seeds. Originally, he wanted to sow rye seeds. However, considering the needs of animal husbandry, Marin ordered half of the more than 9 million mu of grassland to be sown with rye seeds and half with oat seeds. There are too many rye seeds in the North Sea Kingdom, and the warehouse is full of them. As for oat seeds, Marin specially sent people to other countries and regions to purchase a lot of them for sowing. Because it is sowing, not scientific and reasonable row sowing. Therefore, Marin did not expect much yield from these plowed grasslands. Fortunately, both rye and oats have strong vitality. By then, at least there will be some harvest. Anyway, whether it is these extensively planted rye or oats, they are all used to feed livestock. It would be best if there is output. If not, the straw can be chopped up and fed to livestock. But because of this year's embarrassment, Marin specially ordered to set up a seed breeding base in the North Sea Kingdom and began to cultivate alfalfa and ryegrass seeds on a large scale to prepare for the needs of next year. In the future, the North Sea Kingdom will use professional alfalfa and ryegrass mixed sowing technology to gradually transform most of the wasteland in the North Sea Kingdom into pastureland. In this way, farmers can raise a lot of horses, cattle and sheep while farming. Even the harvested pasture can be used to feed pigs. If it is used to raise horses, combined with silage technology, the horses can be raised fat and strong. Once a war breaks out, all manors can lead a group of fat and strong military horses for war. Moreover, these grasslands mixed with alfalfa and ryegrass can be exchanged with cultivated land to become fertile cultivated land. The two rotate every 2 or 3 years, and both agriculture and animal husbandry are not affected. Even after having enough pasture, Marin plans to force all farms to raise dairy cows or sheep. In this way, every child on the farm can drink highly nutritious cows or goat's milk. By then, the North Sea Kingdom will be like the Netherlands, where agriculture and animal husbandry are extremely developed in later generations, because the people have sufficient milk sources, resulting in everyone being tall and strong. In this way, once a war breaks out, the North Sea Kingdom can also pull out a large number of tall and strong soldiers. If it is a bayonet fight, height and long arms are always an advantage. The Japanese soldiers in later generations have such good military literacy and strong bayonet fighting skills, but they still suffer when they meet the Northwest Army's broadsword team. There is no other reason. It is not a problem of ability, but a problem of insufficient height and arm length. No matter how good the skills are, a height of more than 1.5 meters will still suffer in front of the tall and long-armed strong men of the Northwest Army. Only when shooting at each other, the Japanese have the upper hand. Even when facing the 8th Route Army, which is not very professional in bayonet fighting, the Japanese do not have the upper hand. At most, they can rely on their powerful skills to cause great casualties to the 8th Route Army. But in the final analysis, the Japanese still suffered. Why? The training costs of veterans who have been trained for many years and the militia recruited by the 8th Route Army from the countryside are not the same at all. Even if the casualties are the same, the Japanese have suffered a great loss. There is no way. If you are not tall enough and your arms are too short, you will be at a disadvantage in a bayonet fight. Even if you have good skills, others can rely on their long arms to fight you on equal terms. Therefore, after World War II, the Japanese became ruthless and the whole nation drank milk and ate beef. As a result, in the 21st century, the height of the Japanese was almost the same as that of the Chinese, or even slightly surpassed. During World War II, the origin of the Japanese could be judged based on their height. For example, when seeing a group of taller Japanese, the commander could conclude that these were not local Japanese, but might be Korean Second Japanese. And a group of Japanese with a height of 1.5 meters or 1.6 meters. Well, local Japanese are more difficult to deal with. Although the Japanese played by Mr. Pan is rather silly and does not conform to the facts, his height did not lie. In fact, Mr. Pan's height is a very standard height among the Japanese during World War II. Otherwise, the Japanese at that time would not be called Little Japanese. Chapter 1734, The Man Who Will Die. The reason why the Japanese are so short has been mentioned before, that is, they have been eating vegetarian food for thousands of years. It was not until after the Meiji Restoration that Ito Hirobumi was the first to eat beef in Japan and discovered the famous Wagyu breed. But the changes were not drastic at the time. It was not until World War II that the Japanese suffered too much in bayonet fighting that the official learned from the pain and ordered the whole nation to drink milk and eat meat to increase height. This is not for the appearance, but for practicality. You know, the northern militia composed of untrained farmers at the beginning could fight with the old Japanese who had been trained for many years, which was really a blow. Many people say that the old Japanese are powerful, but they haven't seen that they have been trained for 10 or 8 years. But what about the militia in North China? Not long after throwing away the hoe, they can rely on their height advantage to fight with the old Japanese. Even if the old Japanese have a slight advantage, it is considered a big loss for the Japanese. After all, it is very expensive to train an old Japanese. Just like Europe in this era, it takes more than 10 years to train a knight, and the result is that he is on par with the other peasants. This result will make people vomit 3 liters of blood. This is also the reason why muskets replaced longbows in England. In fact, the longbow has a longer range and more power than muskets. But the training cost of longbow soldiers is high. A longbow soldier trains for more than 10 years and his spine is bent. As a result, a musketeer recruit who has been trained for 2 weeks can fight you on equal terms. It is difficult to replace longbow soldiers when they die, and musketeers can just capture some peasants for training. And the advantage of height and long arms is also very obvious in the Battle of Zhenjiang in the First Opium War. In the Battle of Zhenjiang, most of the Qing army defenders were not killed by muskets, but by bayonets. At that time, Britain had completed the Industrial Revolution, and the people in the country lived a rich and well-nourished life, so the soldiers were naturally tall and strong. The Qing dynasty was in the Dark Ages at that time, and there were people with pale faces, thin bodies and short stature everywhere. Even the banner soldiers guarding Zhenjiang were of average height. Even if they practiced martial arts, they could only suffer in the face of the British Army's long-armed bayonet formation. Of course, the Swiss of this era were more cunning. I am not tall enough, but I use a super long spear of 5 or 6 meters to make up for the shortcomings of height and arms. Relying on super long spears, the Swiss are often invincible in outdoor stabbing. But later, everyone was not stupid, and they all began to learn from the Swiss and switched to very long spears. Then, the advantage of the Swiss was reduced. Although it was still very powerful, it was not an absolute advantage. Then, Marin was more cunning and popularized the use of muskets. No matter how long your spear is, it can't be longer than the range of the musket. Therefore, the Swiss mercenaries using super long spears were gradually eliminated. Even if there was no Marin, they would be eliminated by the original German mercenaries using matchlock guns. Just when the spring plowing was about to end, a big thing happened in Calais, France. An English merchant named Wilson and another English merchant named James were both killed in their homes in Calais. Moreover, the whole family was murdered, no one was spared. This kind of murder case was very bad, and it happened twice, which immediately caused a sensation. At this time, King Edward of England also protested to the French side, believing that the French officials had failed to protect the English expatriates in Calais. Then, Edward expressed his intention to send envoys to Calais to help investigate the case and appease the English in the city. King François I of France was not happy that the English wanted to intervene in the investigation. However, the English in the city were indeed panic-stricken at this time and needed to be appeased. Therefore, François I agreed that England would send envoys to appease the English in the city to avoid panic. Of course, it would be better if all these English people could be brought back to England. After all, Calais had been ruled by England for more than 100 years, and there were many English people in the city. Although many English people chose to return home after being conquered by France, many people still stayed. Even if France worked hard to increase the number of French people, nearly half of the residents in Calais were still English. Therefore, in order to ensure the stability of Calais, the English people also need to be appeased. Therefore, François I allowed Edward to send envoys to help appease them. However, the envoys were not allowed to interfere in the investigation. Edward had never thought about intervening in the investigation. After all, the perpetrator was sent by him. All he wanted was to send the unlucky envoy to Calais. So, Edward agreed to François I's request, but asked to observe the results of the investigation to fulfill his duty to protect the people. In fact, Edward didn't want to bargain, but if he listened to the French, everyone would think it was a problem. So, he deliberately made some small requests to confuse everyone. The French were obviously confused and allowed the English to observe the investigation, but they were not allowed to interfere. In this way, England obtained permission to send envoys to Calais. Then, Edward chose an unlucky guy named Robinson to go to Calais to appease the English in the city and observe the results of the investigation. Robinson was Edward's opponent and an old baron in Cornwall. He was not a remnant of the Tudor dynasty, so he was not killed by Edward during the purge. But after Edward ascended the throne, Robinson became Edward's opponent because he disagreed with Edward on many things. Under normal circumstances, Edward could tolerate him. However, last year, this guy actually harbored an important remnant of the Tudor dynasty. The man was called Marquis, a former friend of Robinson and a baron. The two were colleagues during the reign of Henry VII and had a close relationship. In fact, the two families almost married. But after Edward overthrew Henry VII, Robinson remained neutral and escaped. Marquis, on the other hand, fled England with his family and went into exile in France. Later, he served Margaret of Tudor and Margaret's fake son Henry as his main figures, and actively planned and participated in activities to subvert Edward's rule. Marquis was also a baron in Cornwall, so he was naturally sent back to his hometown to carry out activities. Last year, because of the fear that England would attack France from behind, Louis XII sent people to Wales to plan an uprising, and at the same time sent Marquis to sneak back to Cornwall to plan a riot to delay Edward. At that time, Marquis quietly lived in Robinson's country estate, sleeping during the day and going out at night to find people to move around, inciting everyone to rebel. But the accidental capture of the leader of the Welsh rebels caused Marquis's rebellion to go bankrupt before it even started. In desperation, Marquis had to board a fishing boat at night and sneak back to France. Later, this matter was accidentally learned by Edward's spies. However, the spies did not get specific intelligence and could not convict Robinson. However, since then, Robinson has been labeled a rebel in Edward's heart. Although Robinson did not directly participate in the rebellion, he took in the rebels and allowed them to contact and rebel everywhere, which could be regarded as an accomplice of the rebels. But Edward had no evidence, so he had to replace Robinson from the position of Sheriff of Cornwall and transfer him to the Foreign Affairs Department in London. You know, the sheriff is an absolute power holder in the local area. If the sheriff participates in the rebellion, the success rate is very high and the consequences are very serious. Edward transferred Baron Robinson to London to serve as aide-de-camp to Foreign Secretary Howard. In name, he was promoted, but he had no real power. After all, there is a big difference in real power between being a local lord and being an aide-de-camp to a minister. Robinson also had grievances about this, and then he often found fault with Edward in official meetings, which made Edward very annoyed. It just so happened that this time a noble was needed to go to Calais to die, and Edward thought of Robinson, the unlucky guy. Chapter 1735 Loan Shark Group. The wrangling between countries is very time-consuming. It is not that England can directly cross the Strait of Calais to do things just because it decides to send people. It has to wait for the reply from France. Of course, there is no problem for Robinson to go to Calais. Because Baron Marquis, a good friend of Baron Robinson, is currently in France and is being treated with courtesy by the French court. As long as Marquis helps to speak and shows that Robinson is one of us, it will not be a problem to allow him to enter Calais. The only problem is probably the problem of landing the army. After all, it is a landing of 20,000 troops. The Strait of Calais is indeed very narrow, less than 30 kilometers. However, landing the army is very troublesome. If the commercial dock of Calais port is used, only a few hundred people can land at a time. It is estimated that it will take several days for 20,000 troops to land. Moreover, the premise is that the French will not stop it. But because it is a surprise attack, 20,000 British troops need to land quickly and surround the Calais fortress, and capture the fortress before the French army sends reinforcements. Therefore, the landing speed is very important. So, these days, Edward's soldiers have been training for landing. But no matter how much they practiced, they couldn't change the big problem of insufficient berths at the Calais port. Marin wanted to recommend the beach landing method used by the North Sea Kingdom, allowing the army to wade in. However, the sea water is a bit cold in spring, and I'm afraid that the English soldiers are not used to it. Fortunately, among the 20,000 troops, 5,000 North Sea soldiers are used to wading in. Many of them participated in the wading landing in Edinburgh, Scotland a few years ago. Moreover, most of them are equipped with the artifact of wading landing long leather boots. Long leather boots are not afraid of moisture, and the beach is not as easy to sink as the silt in the swamp. Therefore, wearing this kind of shoes is very convenient for landing. This is made by imitating the rain boots of later generations, but the tube is longer. Moreover, the materials of the two are also different. Rain boots in later generations are all rubber products with low cost. But in this era, Marin's Cuban rubber plantation has a very small output. Scarcity makes things valuable, and rubber is obviously more precious these days. Therefore, it is better to use leather as the material for leather boots. In this way, these 5,000 people were equipped with the first batch of leather boots of the North Sea Kingdom, most of which were made of animal leather exchanged from North American Indians. In addition, since it is a beach landing, there must be a small boat that can rush directly onto the beach. There is no rubber boat, so it can only be made of wood. But normal wooden boats seem inconvenient to stack on the ship. There are at most 2 or 3 boats on a large ship. So, Marin thought about it and thought it would be better to make a raft. In fact, bamboo rafts are better and have greater buoyancy. After all, bamboo is hollow. But Europe does not produce bamboo, so rafts can only be used. The buoyancy of rafts is average, not as good as bamboo rafts. However, it is easy to make, and many can be stacked on the deck of the ship, which is convenient for the soldiers to land on the beach. Therefore, simple and low-cost rafts have become the most important tools for soldiers on most ships to land on the beach. These days, British soldiers are practicing how to use rafts to paddle from the ship to the beach and land on the beach. As long as the raft landing is well practiced, most of the soldiers can be sent ashore in one night, without delaying the time for the army surprise attack. In this way, even if the French sent reinforcements from Paris, it would be too late to support Calais. While the British were busy negotiating with the French, the spring ploughing in the two countries had not yet ended. At this time, most of the spring ploughing in the two countries has come to an end. That is, the land ploughing has basically ended, and now it has entered the stage of sowing. But these two countries do not have the plough cart introduced by Marin from the Ming dynasty, and sowing can only be done manually. That is, men and women cooperate, the male farmers are responsible for digging a small hole in the ground, and the women are responsible for sowing the seeds into the hole, and then use their feet to fill the small hole with soil. Then, step on it lightly with your feet. Of course, you can't step too hard, otherwise, the seeds will not be able to break through the confinement of the soil and sprout. This is also a technical job. If the soil is too tight, it will be difficult for the seeds to germinate. It's also not good if the soil is too loose, which will affect the rooting of the seeds. Of course, experienced farmers don't need to think so much. Just a light kick can solve the problem. This is a matter of experience. But this sowing efficiency is very low. Only 1 or 2 acres of land can be sown a day, generally not more than 3 acres, which is about half an acre. Of course, there is another option, which is to sow directly. After the ox plows the land, it directly sows the seeds on the ground. Then, use a wooden mattock to simply break and turn the clods of soil turned up by the plow. After breaking the clods of soil, dig the soil to cover the sown seeds. But this sowing effect is not very good, especially, it is very random. In some places, more seeds are sown, and in other places, no seeds are sown. Moreover, multiple seeds germinate in a cluster, which will result in competition for nutrients. Then, several crops cannot grow well. Therefore, Europeans now prefer the spot sowing technology of men and women working together. Although it is slower, the effect is much better than the extensive sowing. In terms of yield, sowing sometimes yields less than 100 pounds per moo. The on-demand sowing has basically exceeded the yield of 100 pounds per moo. At the critical moment of sowing this spring, in a castle of a large manor near Dijon, the former capital of the Duchy of Burgundy, a group of nobles from the Burgundy region are gathering in the banquet hall of the castle. Of course, they are not holding a banquet, but a secret meeting. The owner of this castle is Paul Lizarazu, a viscount of the Burgundy region. Originally, the Lizarazu family followed Charles the Bold, but after Charles the Bold died in battle, Louis XI took the opportunity to annex the Duchy of Burgundy. Seeing that the situation was not good, the Lizarazu family changed their allegiance to the French royal family. However, after all, they are fence-sitters. The Lizarazu family has never regarded the French royal family as a monarch they must be loyal to, but because they cannot resist the power of France, they have no choice but to surrender. In Paul Lizarazu's eyes, the interests of the family are obviously more important. And the theme of this secret meeting is also very interesting. This is a private gathering of nobles who lend money at high interest rates in Burgundy. Since he came up with the idea of using compound interest to cheat French farmers, Marin secretly sent a large number of spies to the disaster-stricken areas in France, secretly contacted local French nobles, and persuaded them to lend money at high interest rates to the victims, in order to achieve the ultimate goal of depriving farmers of their farmland and property. The Burgundy region has only been compliant with the French court for a few decades, and has not yet completely returned to France. After all, the bold Charles had been seeking to establish the kingdom of Burgundy alone, and the internal propaganda had always been to de-France. And Paul Lizarazu, who came from that era, naturally couldn't say how loyal he was to France. Similarly, many nobles in the Burgundy region did not have a strong sense of belonging to France. Marin's spies entered the Burgundy region, and Paul Lizarazu saw the huge benefits, so he was the first to stand up and respond. Then, all the nobles who responded formed a group headed by Viscount Paul Lizarazu, who specifically provided usurious loans with compound interest to the victims in the Burgundy region. This group was called the Loan Shark Group by Marin. The secret meeting of this Loan Shark Group was to discuss how to tamper with the seeds loaned to farmers. Chapter 1736 Seed Loan. The society of the Kingdom of France was much more harmonious than that of Germany. In France, the proportion of self-employed farmers was still very high. Unlike the German region, most farmers were serfs. The Burgundy region was a bit special. It had only been incorporated into the Kingdom of France for a few decades, and the remnants of the previous feudal system were still very heavy. The Duchy of Burgundy had actually been swinging between France and Germany. Even the bold Charles had sought to join the Holy Roman Empire, and then he had thought about running for emperor. Unfortunately, he was defeated by Frederick III, emperor, the father of Maximilian I. Because of the wavering between France and Germany, the remnants of serfdom in the Burgundy region were still relatively heavy. But after France seized the Duchy of Burgundy, although most of the nobles were retained, certain social reforms were carried out, forcing these Burgundy nobles to allow serfs to redeem their freedom and obtain certain land. It was precisely because of this social reform that the peasants in the Burgundy region were more grateful to the Kingdom of France, and naturally there was no idea of opposing the Kingdom of France. But the nobles of Burgundy were uncomfortable. Those liberated serfs and the land that the serfs bought were originally theirs. Letting the serfs regain their freedom and get land is simply damaging the interests of those nobles. But they didn't dare to say anything before. After all, they couldn't twist their arms. How could the small Burgundy region compete with the powerful Kingdom of France? Fortunately, the Kingdom of France did not prohibit land annexation. As long as there is money and the farmers are willing, they can buy back the land. But the farmers are not fools. Unless they are forced into a desperate situation, no one will easily sell the land. And the wicked idea provided by Marin hit them right in their hearts. Everyone can take the land back from those mud-legs in a peaceful and covert way, and it does not violate the laws of the Kingdom of France. Why not? Not to mention, there are many nobles who responded in the Burgundy region, even in other parts of France, that is, the old French nobles in other disaster-stricken areas in the northeast and eastern borders of France this time, and there are many who are tempted. After all, in the farming era, no one would complain about having too much arable land. This time, more than 100 nobles gathered in the castle of the Lizarazu family. Most of them were from the Burgundy region, and there were also many old French nobles who came from other places. The reason why they gathered to discuss this time was mainly to discuss how much steamed useless seeds should be mixed in the seeds loaned to farmers. Mixing steamed seeds with good seeds and then lending them to farmers, or loaning them at high interest, was a very vicious suggestion made by Marin to the nobles in the disaster area of France. According to this suggestion, the interest of compound interest is already very high and it is difficult to pay it back. If you tamper with the seeds again, so that the farmers cannot get the expected grain when they harvest in the fall, then there is only one way to go, bankruptcy. At that time, even if they are unwilling, they will have to mortgage their land to the creditors. After all, the debts of the nobles are not so easy to owe. At the meeting, many greedy nobles proposed that they should just use steamed waste seeds to lend to the farmers. By then, the peasants would not be able to harvest anything, and not only would they lose their fields, but they might not even be able to save their own people. After all, the nobles were also short of people, mainly obedient serfs. But Paul Lizarazu, an old man in his 60s, thought that using only steamed useless seeds was simply an insult to people's intelligence. If none of the seeds sown sprouted, who could not guess their negative role in it? The nobles had to save face, and they were not as open as pure businessmen. Although they were thieves and prostitutes in private, and had a lot of bad things. But on the surface, they were very face-conscious and tried their best to maintain the honor of their family. Therefore, this matter had to be done, but it had to be concealed so that no one could see the problem clearly. Then, the rationalists led by Paul Lizarazu gradually gained the upper hand. As a result, many people agreed to only mix in about half of the steamed useless seeds. In this way, although the farmers could see the seeds sprout after the spring plowing, they were just a little sparse, and they could not see the problem if they didn't pay attention. Half of the seeds were useless, and when the autumn harvest came, the harvest would definitely be halved. The interest of compound interest is higher than the normal interest, and the harvest is halved. The farmers will definitely have a big problem after the autumn harvest. At the meeting, some more conservative nobles thought that it was not safe enough to mix in half of the unusable seeds, which would be easily discovered by the farmers. So, they proposed to mix in only 30% to 40% of the steamed unusable seeds, so as not to arouse the suspicion of the farmers. Then, the radicals, the centrists, the half-adulterated faction headed by Paul Lizarazu, and the moderates quarreled in the castle and almost staged a fight. In the end, Paul Lizarazu, the initiator and leader, reluctantly announced that everyone could increase or decrease the amount of adulterated seeds appropriately, depending on their own pleasure. However, it should not be too extreme, so as not to cause trouble. After all, if most of the seeds do not germinate, no matter how stupid people are, they will realize that there is a big problem. If they grit their teeth and replant once, they can get through it. And secretly mixing in only part of the steamed ineffective seeds will prevent the people from noticing the big problem. However, the final output will definitely not keep up. Coupled with the high interest of compound interest, the nobles who participated in it will be full this time. After the meeting, the nobles who participated in the usury rushed back to their respective estates overnight, quietly steamed a batch of seeds, and mixed them into the seeds lent to the farmers, mixing them evenly to avoid people seeing the problem. There are more than 100 nobles. If they lend money at high interest rates together, God knows how many French farmers will go bankrupt and have to sell their farmland. Even more difficult to protect themselves, they need to sell themselves and become serfs of the nobles again. In short, after this autumn, some border areas in northeastern France and the east will be lively. At that time, scenes of tragedy will appear in France, and many French peasant families will lose their land and their means of livelihood. At that time, the North Sea Kingdom will quietly send people to recruit those French farmers who have lost their land but not their personal freedom. There is no need to set high conditions, as long as the most basic condition of enough bread every day is offered, a large number of farmers can be recruited. After all, even if the land was not sold, in normal years, many poor French peasants could not afford the luxurious life of enough bread every day. And those unlucky peasants who were forced to sell themselves to the nobles, Marin could also spend some money to buy them from those nobles. After all, nobles who can lend money at high interest rates are greedy. As long as you are willing to pay, you can buy people from them. Chapter 1737 The Importance of Publicity. Marin didn't know that because of his one thought, the French usury group appeared more than 200 years earlier. However, the French usury group of this era is different from the French usury group 200 years later. The usury group 200 years later is mainly composed of big capitalists in Paris, France. Among them, there are many big Jewish businessmen, such as the French branch of the Rothschild family. The famous Lafite winery in later generations was bought by the Rothschild family. The French usury group in the 19th century also lent money at high interest rates, but the main investment direction was industry and commerce, as well as overseas colonial expansion. After all, France is the second largest colonial empire in later generations. In this era, this hidden usury alliance established under the instigation of Marin was formed by land nobles and had nothing to do with businessmen. Marin's role in it was just to provide them with advice and technical support in business. After all, these land nobles are all local landlords and old money, and they know nothing about capital operations. Marin has professional financial professionals who have returned from studying in Venice, who are much more professional than these people. In other words, this 16th century usury alliance formed by the French land nobles, although the main body is those land nobles, because of the lack of professional ability, the spies under Marin help them manage the usury business. In the words of later generations, these people are shareholders, but the professional managers are spies sent by Marin. Although each of them has their own ulterior motives, the interests of both parties are the same. The French land nobles want to take back the land that was redeemed by the peasants, and even want to turn the peasants into their own serfs again. But the most important thing is to take back the land. Marin plans to help these land nobles cheat French peasants, and then get the bankrupt French peasants to help them develop America. France is a populous country with a population of more than 15 million. In this era dominated by agriculture, most of the citizens are farmers. Although these French and Germanic people are not the same, nationalism has not yet emerged in this era, and these French people may still be assimilated. What's more, those peasants who have lost their land and livelihoods due to the cheating of the French land nobles can hardly feel any sense of belonging to France and the French court. After all, they were badly cheated by the French nobles who represented the French ruling class. It is difficult for these badly cheated peasants to be loyal to France, and it is easier to win them over. As long as they go through the process of language assimilation and custom transformation, they will eventually integrate into the society of the North Sea. Just like the old Americans in later generations, the English, French, Germans, or Slavs were eventually assimilated into Americans. The premise is that they all changed to speak English and entered the old American schools to receive patriotic education. Damn, they were asked to cover their hearts and sing the American national anthem. To be honest, Marin found this very funny. Everyone is not of the same race, with different blood, but just because of interests, they gathered in the United States. What the hell is America? People came all the way here just to live a good life, not for any ideas. If you really believe this, I guess your IQ is underpaid. Every time I see Hollywood movies covering the American soldiers who died in battle with the Stars and Stripes, Marin wants to laugh. It would be better to compensate the family of the deceased with millions of dollars than to cover the corpse with this broken flag. After all, they went to America to make a fortune, but you only used a broken American flag that cost a few dollars to send them away. If there were ghosts in the world, the American soldiers who died in the war would definitely be so angry that they would come back to life to collect debts. However, after all, there are only a few smart people in this world, and there are more fools. In his previous life, Marin found many fools on the internet who really believed in the American daddy. After all, the Americans are also very good at brainwashing people. The most important thing is that the media is under their control. Especially the internet, which was created by the Americans. How can they be without professional online scammers? Just like Hong Kong Village in the later generations, why is it so noisy? Because many media there are secretly controlled by the American daddy and the British mommy. The media's butts are crooked. It is not surprising that a group of brainless young people who have been fooled by their propaganda have emerged. If you want to deal with those people, you must first clean up the media. Don't just focus on the thugs all day long. Even if they are all caught, the crooked media can still fool the next batch of thugs to take over. You can imagine that the police are trying hard to hunt down the thugs, but the TV is defending the thugs. Most civilians are easily deceived, especially the brain-dead young people. How can they not get into trouble after watching such crooked TV programs? The media is the guide of social public opinion. If you want to stabilize society, you must first grasp the media in your hands. You know, when the Japanese got rich in the 1980s, they let Sony take the lead and acquired Columbia Pictures, one of the 8 major Hollywood companies. There is no other reason, just using the Hollywood platform to help the Japanese propaganda. Of course, it is impossible for China to acquire Hollywood companies because the Americans will not allow it. Just look at what happened to Huawei. However, there is no problem in acquiring Hong Kong media. Mobil's 3 barrels of oil and so on, any one of them can buy out all the Hong Kong media. First, we need to control Gangsuan Telecom. If these media do not accept the acquisition, we will cut off their network and even power supply. After the acquisition, we can promote positive energy. In this year, there are no newspapers in Europe, so there is naturally no publicity. The main reason is that it is difficult to sell newspapers after printing. Because there are too few people who can read in this era. Only nobles and priests can read, and there are a group of wealthy businessmen who have read books and can read. Most other people are illiterate. If you print newspapers, there will be few users who can understand them. But Marin's promotion of compulsory education in the North Sea will greatly improve the literacy rate of the North Sea. When these children who go to school grow up, the North Sea can promote newspapers. Because there are more people who can read newspapers. Before the emergence of modern media, newspapers were probably the only means of propaganda. When Marin plans to join forces with the French land nobles to cheat French farmers, he will resolutely hide behind those French landlords and not be a bad guy. Those spies who help the French landlords and rich people manage their usury business also resolutely hide their identities and never let people know that they are from the North Sea. After those French farmers lost their land due to being cheated, Marin sent another group of people to appear as saviors to deceive those farmers who had nothing left. This group of people must use Marin's banner, because they are here to receive the gratitude of these unfortunate bankrupt French farmers. With this gratitude, after arriving in North America, with the free education of moral education schools and the publicity of newspapers, these people will become Marin's diehard fans and integrate into the new North American society. Chapter 1738, The Death of Robinson. In this era, this hidden usury alliance established under the instigation of Marin was formed by land nobles and had nothing to do with businessmen. Marin's role in it was just to provide them with advice and technical support in business. After all, these land nobles were all local landlords and knew nothing about capital operation. Marin had professional financial professionals who returned from studying in Venice, who were much more professional than these people. In other words, although the main body of this usury alliance formed by French land nobles in the 16th century was those land nobles, due to the lack of professional ability, spies under Marin helped them manage the usury business. In the words of later generations, these people were shareholders, but professional managers were spies sent by Marin. Although each of them had their own ulterior motives, the interests of both parties were the same. The French land nobles wanted to take back the land that was redeemed by the peasants, and even wanted to turn the peasants into their own serfs again. But the most important thing was to take back the land. Marin planned to help these land nobles cheat French peasants, and then get the bankrupt French peasants to help them develop America. France is a populous country with a population of more than 15 million. In this era dominated by agriculture, most of the citizens are farmers. Although these French and Germanic people are not the same, nationalism has not yet emerged in this era, and these French people may be assimilated. What's more, those farmers who have lost their land and livelihoods by the French land nobles will hardly feel any sense of belonging to France and the French court. After all, they have been cheated by the French nobles who represent the French ruling class. It is difficult for these farmers who have been cheated to be loyal to France and easier to win over. As long as they go through the process of language assimilation and custom transformation, they will eventually integrate into the society of the North Sea. Just like the old Americans in later generations, the English, French, Germans, or Slavs were eventually assimilated into Americans. The premise is that they all changed to speak English and entered the old American schools to receive patriotic education. Damn, they were asked to cover their hearts and sing the American national anthem. To be honest, Marin found this very funny. We are not of the same race, and we have different blood. We gather in the United States just for profit. What the hell is America? People come all the way here just to live a good life, not for any ideology. If you really believe this, I guess your IQ is low. Every time I see Hollywood movies covering the American soldiers who died in the war with the stars and stripes, Marin wants to laugh. It is better to pay millions of dollars to the family than to cover the corpse with this broken flag. After all, people go to America to make a fortune, but you just use a broken stars and stripes that costs a few dollars to get rid of them. If there are ghosts in the world, the American soldiers who died in the war must be so angry that they will come back to life to collect debts. However, there are only a few smart people in this world, and there are still more fools. In his previous life, Marin found on the internet that many fools really believed in the United States. After all, the Americans are also very good at brainwashing people. The most important thing is that the media is under their control. Especially the internet, which was created by the Americans. How can they be without professional online scammers? Just like Hong Kong Village in the future, why is it so noisy? Because many media there are secretly controlled by the American father and the British mother. The media's butts are all crooked. It is not surprising that a group of brainless young people who are deceived and lame under their propaganda have emerged. If you want to deal with those people, you must first clean up the media. Don't just focus on those thugs all day long. Even if they are all arrested, the crooked but media can still deceive the next group of thugs to take over. You can imagine that the police are trying hard to hunt down the thugs, but the TV is defending the thugs. Most civilians are easily deceived, especially the brainless young people. How can they not get into trouble when they see such crooked TV programs? The media is the guide of social public opinion. If you want to stabilize society, you must first control the media. You know, when the Japanese became rich in the 1980s, they let Sony take the lead and acquire Columbia Pictures, one of the 8 major Hollywood companies. There is no other reason, just using the Hollywood platform to help the devils promote. Of course, it is impossible for China to acquire Hollywood companies, because the Americans will not allow it. Just look at what happened to Huawei. However, there is no problem in acquiring the media in Hong Kong. Mobile, the 3 barrels of oil, etc., any one of them can buy out all the media in Hong Kong. First, we need to control Hong Kong Telecom. If these media do not accept the acquisition, we will cut off their network and even power supply. After they are acquired, we can promote positive energy. In this year, there are no newspapers in Europe, so there is naturally no publicity. The main reason is that it is difficult to sell newspapers after printing. Because there are too few people who can read in this era. Only nobles and priests can read, and there are a group of wealthy businessmen who have read books and can read. Most other people are illiterate. If you print newspapers, there are few users who can understand them. But Marin's promotion of compulsory education in Beihai will greatly improve Beihai's literacy rate. When these children who go to school grow up, Beihai can promote newspapers. Because there are more people who can read newspapers. Before the emergence of modern media, newspapers were probably the only means of propaganda. When Marin planned to join forces with the French land nobles to cheat French farmers, he resolutely hid behind those French landlords and did not act like a bad guy. Those spies who helped the French landlords to manage their usury business also resolutely hid their identities and never let anyone know that they were from the North Sea. After those French farmers were cheated and lost their land, Marin sent another group of people to appear as saviors and fool those farmers who had nothing. This group of people must use Marin's banner, because they are here to receive the gratitude of these unfortunate French bankrupt farmers. With this gratitude, after arriving in North America, they will cooperate with the free education of the Moral Education School and the propaganda of newspapers. At that time, these people will become Marin's diehard fans and integrate into the new North American society. Chapter 1739, England sends troops. It should be pointed out that although the 4 English guards chased into the alley and did not catch anyone, they brought back a broken wooden nameplate that looked like the identity nameplate of a French soldier. In addition, there was a discarded French soldier's standard one-handed sword on the ground. However, the guards were busy sending Robinson to the doctor and did not take it out immediately. It was not until Robinson died that he took it out to show General Moreno. General Moreno was dumbfounded when he saw it. He did not send anyone to assassinate Robinson. What was going on? And he sent someone to check the number on the one-handed sword and found that it was the weapon used by the soldiers in the city. He sent someone to the relevant military camp to ask according to the number, and he really found the owner, a squad leader, but they said that the sword was lost 3 days ago. Moreno believed what his people said, but the English did not believe it. How could it be such a coincidence? Why did the assassin use a stolen weapon to assassinate the English envoy? In fact, this was a spy under Marin's command. It was taken from the drunk French captain in the tavern 3 days ago and was specifically used for this frame-up. Otherwise, how could Edward find an excuse to send troops? As for the identity plate, it was stolen by a spy in Paris. But because it did not match the identity of the soldiers in the city, the handwriting on the wooden plate was deliberately damaged so that people could not see the details. But the wooden plate, whether from the workmanship or the material, is undoubtedly a French identity plate. The members of the accompanying British delegation were immediately excited. What's going on? Dare to openly send troops to kill the English envoy, is this a provocation or a provocation? Robinson's deputy Han's status is not high, just an ordinary assistant officer in the foreign minister's residence, but he is also the eyes and ears of King Edward of England, who is responsible for monitoring the foreign minister. This mission to Calais was nominally headed by Robinson, but in fact the delegation was secretly controlled by Han. Including the guards, they all acted according to Han's orders. As for why the 4 guards happened to be on the other side of the carriage during the assassination, it was actually ordered by Han in advance. Moreover, they also received a hint: if Robinson encountered trouble, they must pretend to be stunned for a while and deliberately delay time. After chasing into the alley, the escaping assassins did push down a lot of obstacles, but with the martial arts of the 4 guards, they could actually jump over them. However, these 4 guards were spies trained by England and obeyed orders from above. After pretending to chase for a while, they went back and hurried to take Robinson for treatment. In fact, they also checked Robinson's wounds on the way to escort Robinson to the clinic. Their mission was, if the wound was not fatal, they would make up for it halfway. But the few people sent to assassinate were obviously veterans. If they didn't miss, they didn't need to make up for it. Faced with this serious situation, General Moreno, the commander of the Calais garrison, was about to explode. If it were normal times, the French might not take England seriously. But now France is at war with Spain. Moreover, the new king, François I, had not yet completely taken control of the Kingdom of France. If he offended England again at this time. In desperation, General Moreno had to order a massive search for suspects throughout the entire process, and all young and strong men were taken for questioning. If no one could prove that they were not present on the night of the incident, they would be taken to prison as suspects for trial. However, how could the assassins be caught? They hid in the underground secret room provided to them by the North Sea spies, which was very hidden and had sufficient supplies. The French had no professional detectives, not even police dogs, so how could they find the assassins? As for the spies of the North Sea, they were smarter. On the night of the incident, they all went to the tavern to drink and fought with others. The tavern was a public place, and so many eyewitnesses naturally exempted them from all suspicion. In this way, the French pursuit fell into a dead end. Moreover, the alley was also tampered with by the spies of the North Sea. They deliberately made some traces pointing to a nearby military camp. The stolen standard sword belonged to the French captain in the camp, and the wound on Robinson's body was exactly the same as the blade of the French standard one-handed sword. For a moment, General Moreno was planning to use the captain as a scapegoat. At that time, he would say that the captain hated England very much and that the assassination of the English envoy was his own act. But before Moreno could take action, Han took Baron Robinson's body away. Han's reason was that if he didn't take it back, Robinson's body would stink. Obviously, a baron's body should not be ruined like this, and he must be buried in his country as soon as possible, and arrange for a priest to perform a ritual. General Moreno had no reason to stop it. After all, there were no antiseptic needles these days, and the body really couldn't be left outside for a long time. It was indeed right to bury it as soon as possible. But he didn't expect that the English would not intend to reason with him next. Because, with the death of Baron Robinson, the English had sufficient reasons to take action. Han and his party returned quickly. After all, the width of the Strait of Calais is less than 30 kilometers, and it can be crossed in half a day. After Han returned to London, he immediately rushed to the Tower of London and reported the bad news to Edward in public. Edward's acting skills also broke out at this time. He pretended to be extremely surprised, and then suddenly felt very sad for Robinson, a loyal minister, who worked hard, and died at work, and almost cried out. Then, Edward's mood changed from sadness to anger, shouting, "The blood of English nobles cannot be shed in vain." After a burst of anger, Edward ordered a large army to surround the Calais fortress, and planned to send a large army into the city to take over the investigation of the case. Of course, as a rule-abiding monarch, Edward sent someone to submit a letter of credence to France and informed the French, "Hey, we are going to send troops into the Calais fortress to investigate the case." "Well, it doesn't matter whether you agree or not, I will definitely send troops to Calais anyway." The British army was well prepared, so they acted quickly. The next day, the British army requisitioned a large number of ships for cross-sea landing. And when the British army had already launched the landing, the letter of credence was not transmitted to Paris. After receiving the letter of credence from the English, the court and the public in Paris were in chaos. They had just received the news that the English envoy was assassinated in Calais, and they were still discussing how to explain to the English. As a result, the English sent troops directly and asked to send troops to Calais. Is this possible? Absolutely not. Everyone knows that the Calais fortress originally belonged to England and was only recaptured by France a few years ago. If you say that the English are willing, then there is a ghost. If the English army is allowed to enter the city, will they return Calais to France? Obviously not. However, the French are obviously not too worried about the English siege of the Calais fortress. Because the 15,000 French knights who returned to their country with Louis XII have not been sent to Italy for reinforcement. It's just right. It can be used to support the Calais fortress. Chapter 1740 Corrosion. In just one day, the 20,000-strong English army completed the landing at an extremely fast speed. In fact, these 20,000 people had been busy training to land on the beach with rafts some time ago. After practicing for so long, this actual combat naturally made them more proficient. After the army landed, it quickly surrounded the Calais fortress and cut off all roads leading to the French inland. The British army even sent a large number of soldiers to destroy all bridges leading to the French inland, and dug up many roads to block the French reinforcements as much as possible. Then, the army began to attack the city of Calais. In order to divert the attention of the French defenders from the sewer in the northwest corner, the British army did not attack the northwest corner of Calais when launching a feint attack, but placed the feint attack direction on the 4 city gates, attracting the enemy's attention to the city gate tower. Then, the British army feinted and waited for the rain. According to the speculation of the London court astronomer, there may be rain near Calais in the next few days. Once it rains, it is time to attack Calais with the help of both sides. In Paris, France, François I and his ministers quickly calmed down after the initial panic. Because good news came from the direction of Calais, the British army did not immediately capture the Calais fortress. For a very strong fortress like the Calais fortress, the most dangerous time is actually at the beginning. Because if there is no defense against a surprise attack, even the strongest fortress is easy to fall. In addition, the monarchs and ministers of Paris are worried that there are secret passages left by the British in the Calais fortress, or that there are British lurking insiders in the city to help open the city gates. However, 2 days later, the city of Calais has not fallen. This shows that the British army has no backup, and the Calais fortress is still safe. If there is no backup such as secret passages or insiders, the French government and the opposition unanimously believe that the British will not be able to capture the Calais fortress in a few months. So, they began to gather the army with confidence. The French army is different from other countries. The army in the German region has been mercenary, and the soldiers are full-time soldiers who are off-duty. The French feudal system is more involved. Those 15,000 French knights are not usually serving in Paris. The army stationed in Paris is mainly composed of mercenaries composed of civilians. And those knights with fiefs are usually in their own manors. They will gather in Paris only when they receive the royal summons. If they have nothing to do, they generally like to stay in big cities like Paris. However, it is the spring plowing season now. Most of these knights who have their own manors are at home helping to plow or supervise the plowing, and are basically not in Paris. Therefore, it will take time for François I to summon reinforcements. As for using the Paris garrison to reinforce Calais, impossible, the king's life is not important. 10 Calais fortresses are not as important as the lives of the king and ministers in Paris. Moreover, François I and the ministers generally judged that the Calais fortress could at least be defended for a few months. Therefore, when summoning knights from all over the country, they did not ask those knights to come immediately, but left a 2-week assembly deadline. In the eyes of the French ministers, the English bandits were no match for the powerful French knights on land. Although the English were besieging Calais happily, as long as the French knights arrived, they would be able to quickly defeat the English bandits. This was indeed the case. If the English could not capture the Calais fortress before the French knights arrived, they would have no choice but to escape. Because the English army was no match for the French knights in the wild. The advantages of longbowmen were only a few decades ago. Since the advent of pig iron ingot technology, it has been difficult for the French knights to penetrate the plate armor of the English longbow. After all, the strength of pig iron plate armor is much higher than that of sponge iron plate armor. Moreover, the French army still had dozens of artillery pieces in Paris that had not been pulled out for use. However, that was under normal circumstances. However, the current situation is not ordinary. 3 days later, the rainy day predicted by the British court astronomer finally arrived. At night, moderate rain fell in Calais. Most of the torches on the top of the city of Paris were extinguished. Only in the covered buildings such as the city gate tower, the torches were not extinguished by the heavy rain. At this time, several figures came near the northwest corner of the city wall. They were the spies of the North Sea Kingdom who were responsible for corroding the iron gates of the sewers with aqua regia. They brought the newly prepared aqua regia and gas masks to prevent the release of poisonous gas during the corrosion of the iron gates. This is a second-generation gas mask. The first-generation gas mask is made of soft elephant skin. Although the effect is good, it is not particularly good. The second-generation gas mask uses vulcanized natural rubber produced in Cuba, and the effect is better. In the middle of the night, there were no people on duty on the wall of the military camp responsible for supervising the iron gates of the sewers a few dozen yards away. After all, they couldn't even use torches. But the French were still vigilant. About every half an hour, this military camp would send people to climb the wall in the rain. Although they couldn't use torches to look at it, they could use their ears to listen to see if there was any movement at the iron gate of the sewer. If someone broke the door and pried the lock, there would definitely be a loud noise. However, they miscalculated. There were a total of 4 spies sent by the North Sea Kingdom this time, 2 of whom were responsible for corroding the large iron lock of the iron gate with aqua regia in a glass bottle. As for the other two, one was responsible for holding a large black cloth umbrella to protect the other people from rain and at the same time, block the light. After all, the two people responsible for corroding the iron lock with aqua regia cannot discredit and corrode the iron lock. But they didn't use torches or candles for lighting, as that would easily be discovered by the French army. They used a very precious lighting device, the night pearl. Although the night pearl is very expensive, Marin still approved a night pearl for this operation to facilitate the spies' actions. Before setting off, the four people shone the night pearl in front of the candlelight for an hour or so. Then, this night pearl can keep glowing for several hours. Although the light was a little weak, not as bright as candlelight, it was enough to deal with the big iron lock under the black cloth. Under the black cloth, in front of the iron gate of the sewer in the northwest corner of Calais, two North Sea spies sat on a small stool. Under the weak light of the night pearl, they carefully opened the glass bottle of aqua regia and slowly poured it on the iron lock. It should be pointed out that these four guys, whether they were pouring aqua regia, holding an umbrella or holding a night pearl, all wore second-generation rubber gas masks. The aqua regia poured on the iron lock made a hissing, corrosive sound. But the sound was very small, and it was raining at night, so even on the top of the city wall, it could not be heard. During this process, a team of French patrol soldiers patrolled the city wall in the rain. They were there to prevent the English from climbing the wall in the middle of the night, but they didn't hear the faint, hissing sound coming from the iron gate of the sewer below the city. With the faint, hissing sound like the bubbles in Coke, the big iron lock of the iron gate of the sewer in Calais was corroded little by little. Chapter 1741, Seizing the Gate. The iron gate at the exit of the Calais sewer had not just one big iron lock, but several. It took the 4 team members more than 2 hours to corrode and break the locks and put them into the package. Then, they took out the lime powder from the oil paper bag and sprinkled it on the ground to neutralize the strong acid residue on the ground to prevent it from getting on the skin of the British soldiers entering and leaving and causing great damage. The acid-base neutralization releases a lot of heat. The 4 people hurriedly avoided it and waited for the heat to pass before they began to deal with the iron gate. The iron gate was inserted from top to bottom through the stone bayonet, which was very strong. Moreover, the lock was on the side inside the city. It was extremely difficult to open the sewer iron gate from the outside. You know, the steel bars of the iron gate were as thick as iron bars. Even if you hit it with a big hammer, it would not move. Before pulling the iron gate up, the 4 people took out 2 bottles. The bottles were filled with linseed oil. After opening the bottle mouth, they poured the linseed oil directly into the gap between the iron gate and the stone wall. The reason for this is to reduce the friction between the iron gate and the stone wall. Because if the friction is too great, the sound will be too loud when the iron gate is pulled out, which will easily alarm the French defenders. Pouring oil in the gap between the iron gate and the stone wall can reduce friction and minimize the sound when the iron gate is pulled out. Sure enough, after pouring 2 bottles of oil, the sound of pulling the iron gate up became very small. Under the cover of the rain, the patrol soldiers on the top of the city and the French soldiers at the nearby post responsible for supervising the iron gate of the sewer did not notice it. After pulling out the iron gate, Balk, the leader of the 4, ignored the stench and crouched into the sewer culvert. Then, he took out a tube from the package. Pulling open one end of the tube, the next person discovered that it was a fuse. They had prepared the fuse long ago, but in order to prevent rain, they put it in a tube. There is a hole in the tube, so that there is air inside the tube, so that the fuse will not go out. But after closing the tube, no fire can be seen outside. Then, he took out a candle from the oil paper bag. There was gunpowder on the top of the candle, and when the fuse touched it, the gunpowder burned immediately and ignited the candle. Then, under the cover of a small umbrella, Balk stood at the exit of the sewer culvert outside the city wall, holding an umbrella and shaking the candle to the outside. And 300 meters away from the exit of the sewer culvert, a group of British soldiers wearing rubber raincoats produced by the North Sea were quietly lying there. "Harrison, do you see the fire?" The British Captain Hughes, who was almost dozing off, immediately became alert after seeing the candlelight swaying left and right. The deputy captain named Harrison was dozing off at first, but after hearing the captain's words, he took a closer look and found that there was indeed a fire swaying 300 meters away. So he said excitedly, "Yes, it is a fire swaying left and right. This is the signal for action. Give the order, Captain." "Okay, everyone, form a team and set off. Be careful, don't make any noise," Captain Hughes ordered in a low voice. Then, 200 British suicide squads, wearing raincoats, carrying small round shields, and wearing sailors' scimitars on their waists, tiptoed to the sewer culvert. Fortunately, the French did not find them. When they arrived, Balky threw away the candle, took out the night pearl, and squatted in the culvert to illuminate the British army. Then, the British soldiers lined up in a long snake and climbed into the culvert quietly. After entering the city, they all squatted quietly against the corner of the wall, fearing that they would be discovered by the French patrol on the wall. After Hughes and everyone came in, he planned to take people to open the north gate, but was stopped by Balky. "Sir, don't go to the north gate. Go to the west gate." Balky was a Frisian and had no problem communicating with the British. "Why?" Hughes was puzzled. "There are a lot of things piled up in the north gate. You can't open the door even if you go there. You need to move those sundries first." Balky explained. "What? There are still debris piled up in the gate hole of the big iron gate? Is it that serious? Are the other gates like this too?" Hughes was shocked. "If bricks, stones, logs and other debris are piled up in the gate hole, then it's over. Because it takes a lot of time to move those debris away." Balky shook his head and said, "Currently, only the gate hole of the north gate has accumulated debris, and the gate holes of other gates have not. The French are most strictly guarding the north gate, so there are debris piled up. The south gate and the west gate are to welcome reinforcements, so generally there will be no debris piled up. But our army's original main attack direction is the north gate," Hughes said depressedly. "Then we will go to the west gate later, and send a fast runner to the vicinity of the north gate to notify the elite troops to rush to the west gate. Wait a minute, I will take you to capture the west gate." "Okay, let's do it." After that, Hughes sent a fast runner named Bolt to climb out of the city from the sewer culvert and go to the north gate to notify the assault troops. The assault force had a total of about 3,000 people. Their mission was to cooperate with the death squad to seize one of the city gates, and then guard the city gate and wait for the main force to enter the city. Among them, 2,000 were elite veterans of the North Sea Kingdom. Hughes and his men squatted under the city wall and waited in the rain for more than an hour. At about 3 a.m., Bolt came back to report that the commandos were in place. Then, Hughes and his 200 death squad members, led by Balky and 4 others, moved along the wall towards the west gate. Seeing the west gate getting closer and closer, the members of the British death squad were all happy. They took out their small round shields and drew out their sailor scimitars. However, just as they approached the west gate, an accident happened. On the city wall, a team of French patrols were patrolling. But a French soldier named Domine suddenly had to urinate urgently, so he approached the inner side of the city wall, untied his belt, and urinated down. Coincidentally, his urine line fell directly on the heads of the British death squad walking underground. F.A. Before this guy could say, "Graham, Domine," a French soldier peeing on the top of the city wall, felt something was wrong. He asked vigilantly, "Who?" Then, he stuck his head out and looked down. Hughes saw something was wrong and immediately led the team to rush to the city gate. Domine also saw a series of figures flashing under the city wall, and then suddenly shouted, "Someone is attacking the west gate. Someone is attacking the west gate. Get up and protect the west gate." Then, the French soldiers living in a large courtyard near the west gate were awakened. "What's going on? What's wrong?" A bunch of French soldiers were awakened, and hurriedly put on their clothes, and raised their weapons to attack the west gate. When the 50 French soldiers who lived in the courtyard close to the west gate arrived in front of the west gate, they happened to meet Hughes and his team. Hughes made a prompt decision and shouted, "Team 2, go open the gate, Team 1, follow me to meet the enemy." After that, Hughes led a team of 100 death squads, holding small round shields in their left hands and sailor scimitars in their right hands, and went to meet the 50 French soldiers. But it wasn't just these 50 people who were alarmed. Hundreds of French soldiers living in the tower above the west gate were also awakened. They also began to rush down the stairs towards Hughes and others. Chapter 1742, Fierce Battle at the City Gate. While Hughes led a team of hundreds of death squad members to desperately block the French counterattack, Harrison, the deputy captain of the death squad, rushed into the city gate with the second death squad, and beat up the 30 French soldiers who had hurriedly stood up in the room inside the city gate. But when they successfully dealt with the 30 French soldiers in the city gate, they came to the iron gate and were stunned. The iron gate was not only bolted, but also had an iron lock. But Harrison was immediately depressed. Balky, who came with them, was also a little speechless, but Balky quickly reminded, "Quick, turn over the pockets of these soldiers, especially the pockets of the officers dressed as squad leaders. Since it is an iron lock, there must be a key. Generally speaking, the key is on the leader who is close to the city gate." However, they were disappointed. None of the 30 soldiers in the city gate had a key. According to a surviving French soldier, the key was in the hands of the captain on the city gate tower. "Damn! This is trouble. Do we have to fight our way up to the city gate tower and find the captain?" Harrison was a little desperate. But that was impossible. By the time they fought their way up to the city gate tower and came down, the main force of the French army would probably have arrived. At this moment, Balky took out a steel wire from his arms. No, it was a steel wire saw. Balky said to Harrison solemnly, "Deputy Captain Harrison, please buy me some time. I need 2 minutes to saw open this iron lock." The iron lock was not big, and the French did not expect that the enemy could not destroy it. What they wanted was to use the iron lock to buy some time until the reinforcements arrived. Obviously, under normal circumstances, the French could achieve their goal. Harrison looked at the iron lock sadly. There were torches in the city gate, nodded, and then drew out his sailor's scimitar and said, "Brothers, follow me to help the captain and others, we must delay the enemy for more than 2 minutes." Then, Harrison led his men and rushed back to the inner exit of the city gate without hesitation. At this time, the battle at the inner exit of the city gate was very fierce. The French also knew the importance of the city gate, so they rushed forward without hesitation. The most terrifying thing was that 50 plate armored infantrymen came. Hughes and his 200 people, in order to facilitate walking, all wore not very heavy chain mail. Although there were shields, they were the most common small round shields. In terms of protection, there was a big gap between them and the French plate armored infantry. The most important thing is that the French plate armored infantrymen are all children of knights, and they have more than 10 years of martial arts. Moreover, not only are they wearing full sets of plate armor with high protection, but the weapons in their hands are also very powerful two-handed swords. In terms of infantry combat, this kind of plate armor infantry wearing full-body plate armor and holding two-handed swords is invincible in close combat. Fortunately, most of the 500 plate armor infantry in the city are deployed near the north gate, and there are only 50 people on the west gate. But if time drags on for a long time, the other 450 plate armor infantry will definitely gather at the west gate. The British death squads are already very powerful. They hold shields in their left hands to resist the attacks of French soldiers. The sailor's scimitar in the right hand attacks the enemy flexibly. It is difficult for ordinary French soldiers to defeat the attacks of the British death squads. They find it difficult to break the defense of the round shield, but they are easily chopped or stabbed by the British sailor's scimitar. But the 50 French plate armor infantry are more powerful. They are not afraid of the attacks of the British sailor's scimitar. And the two-handed swords they wield can even break the wooden round shields of the British death squads. Once the round shield was broken, the British death squads would be slaughtered. Under the strong attack of the French plate infantry, the death squads began to suffer a large number of casualties. Harrison was anxious when he saw this situation. He shouted, "Brothers, hold on. When the door is opened, our elite accomplices will come in." The wire saw was still sawing the iron lock. After 2 minutes, the lock was not cut. Bach's head was full of cold sweat, but he couldn't be impatient, because the more impatient he was, the easier it would be to make mistakes. It took a full 5 minutes for the big iron lock to be sawed off. Then, Balky called a dozen British death squad members in the back row, and they worked together to pull open the cast iron gate of the west gate of the Calais fortress. After a series of creaking sounds, the west gate was finally opened. At this time, 3,000 British elites had gathered in front of the west gate. "Brothers, charge!" The commando leader, Molson, holding a large shield and a one-handed sword, rushed in first. The commando's sword and shield soldiers were different from the death squads inside the city gate. The death squads wore chain mail for convenience. It was light, but the protection was not good. Moreover, the small round shield they used was not very strong. It was okay to use it to resist ordinary swords, but it was difficult to deal with heavy weapons. Coincidentally, the two-handed sword was more restrained by the small round shield. Most of Molson's commando soldiers wore half-body plate armor and iron helmets. The large shields used were also covered with iron sheets. Their role is to resist the 500 plate armored infantrymen in the city. Although they don't have plate armor trousers, the upper body's defense is not bad. Moreover, they also wear chain mail trousers on their legs, so they are not afraid of being chopped or cut by swords, but only afraid of being stabbed. Plate armor trousers are too inconvenient to move, so the soldiers of the commando team all chose chain mail trousers. Although the protection is not as good as plate armor trousers, it is conducive to running. After all, they are the attacking party and need to advance. Unlike the defending party, they just need to hold their positions and are not afraid of inconvenience in movement. When Molson led the main force of the sword and shield soldiers to rush into the inner side of the city gate, more than 60 people in Hughes's death squad had died. He himself also had an arm chopped off. After seeing Molson's sword and shield soldiers rushing into the battlefield, Hughes smiled, and with the help of Harrison, he led his men to retreat to the side, leaving the battlefield to Molson's sword and shield soldiers. Then, Molson's sword and shield soldiers and the French plate infantry launched a passionate and powerful collision. Bang! The two-handed sword of the French plate infantry chopped on the shield of the sword and shield soldier, making a loud noise. Unfortunately, the shield was covered with iron sheets, which was much stronger than the small round shield of the death squad just now. Therefore, the attack of the French plate infantry had no effect, and only numbed the shield-holding arm of the sword and shield soldier. But the one-handed sword of the sword and shield soldier's right hand stabbed out and stabbed the French plate infantry, which also made a metal collision sound. Obviously, it had no effect. Seeing this situation, Molson immediately ordered loudly, "Switch to the right hand to hold the shield and hit them to death." Then, the sword and shield soldiers selected from the 4th Legion of the North Sea Kingdom quickly changed their swords and shields, and then, holding the shield in their right hands, they rushed towards the French plate infantry. Molson's sword and shield soldiers had 800 people, and there were only 50 plate infantry on the opposite side. How could they be opponents? Under the repeated impact of the shields of hundreds of sword and shield soldiers, 50 French plate-armored infantrymen retreated one after another. Many of them were knocked to the ground, and then they were pounced on and subdued by the commandos. But before Molson could be happy for long, another 450 French plate-armored infantrymen arrived from the other 3 city gates. Then, on the street near the West Gate, a desperate duel between 800 plate-armored sword and shield soldiers and 450 plate-armored infantrymen unfolded. Chapter 1743 The Musketeer. General Moreno personally led 2,000 reinforcements, including 450 plate-armored infantrymen, to the West Gate, and met 3,000 British commandos led by 800 sword and shield soldiers on the long street near the West Gate. Moreno knew that if the British were not driven out of the West Gate as soon as possible, they would not be able to stop the main force of the British army once it poured into the city. Fortunately, he still believed in the 450 most elite plate-armored infantrymen under his command. So, he drew his knight's sword and shouted, "French warriors, rush forward bravely and drive the opponent out of the West Gate." Then, 450 French plate-armored infantrymen, waving two-handed swords, rushed forward fiercely. The 800 sword and shield soldiers of the 4th Legion were not to be outdone, raised their shields in their right hands, and rushed forward fiercely. The sound of bang 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 dash was endless. But the French plate-armored infantrymen were not to be outdone. Although the shields were covered with iron sheets and were difficult to damage, they still used all their strength to swing their swords and slash at the shields of the British sword and shield soldiers, making a loud noise. Although the shields of the sword and shield soldiers had a strong impact, this time there were not 50 plate-armored infantrymen, but 450. Even if someone was knocked back, it would be difficult for them to fall. Because the French plate-armored infantrymen had comrades behind them to support them and prevent them from falling. Moreover, although there were more sword and shield soldiers, the streets near the West Gate were so wide. Even on the main roads, there were only a few dozen people in the two armies. After all, the streets were so wide. Most of the others were waiting behind. Because the enemy on the opposite side was also numerous, the effect of the shield collision this time was much worse. Even if the plate-armored infantrymen on the opposite side were knocked down, the French soldiers behind them could support them in time. It was impossible to knock the enemy to the ground and then send someone to hold them down as before. Then, the battle between the two sides turned into a war of physical exhaustion, with each side using brute force to hurt the opponent. However, the French plate-armored infantry was the first to discover the weakness of the British sword and shield soldiers. A French sword and shield captain named Monch discovered with the faint light of the torches on the city gate tower that the opponent seemed to be wearing chain mail on his lower body. It is true that chain mail can prevent slashing and cutting, but it is mainly aimed at one-handed swords, which has little lethality. But the French plate-armored infantry are all holding knights' two-handed swords. It can both slash and stab. Yes, the opponent is wearing chain mail pants, but there seems to be no protection on the feet. Unlike the French plate-armored infantry, the lower body is also wearing plate armor, which has stronger protection. So, Captain Monchi shouted, "Stab their feet with swords, they have no armor on their feet." Then, many French plate-armored infantrymen stopped using two-handed swords to slash the opponent's iron shields, and instead used two-handed swords like spears to stab the feet of the British sword and shield soldiers. Because they didn't understand what the French shouted in French, the English sword and shield soldiers of the 4th Legion suffered a great loss at the beginning. Most of the 7 or 8 sword and shield soldiers in the front row who were stabbed in the feet by two-handed swords were injured and could not continue to fight. Later, several more people were hit, and a total of more than a dozen sword and shield soldiers were injured. Captain Molson, who was nearby, heard the shouts of the soldiers and knew that the enemy had discovered the weakness of his own sword and shield soldiers. So he quickly ordered a change in tactics. Sword and shield soldiers in the front row, squat down and use shields to protect your legs and feet, and the second row use shields to protect the upper part. The large shields of the 4th Legion were square, and they could completely protect their legs and feet when they were put down under their feet. Taking advantage of this opportunity, the British sword and shield soldiers helped the dozen wounded soldiers in the front row and pulled them back. The soldiers in the back row also consciously and uniformly moved sideways to make way for a passage. At this time, the musketeer Captain Van Paul, who was originally in the back, could no longer sit still. He was a West Frisian, and his name was a bit Dutch, with the word "van." He originally served in the North Sea country, but this time the British army needed musketeers for the attack on Calais, so they sent Van Paul and other Frisian musketeers, a total of 1,000 people, over. The main reason was that these people spoke Frisian, so they had no problem communicating with the British, and they could also pretend to be British soldiers to avoid diplomatic disputes with France. Seeing a passage flashing in the crowd, after the wounded had left, Van Paul anxiously led a group of musketeers to squeeze in, make way, make a way. We musketeers are best at dealing with the enemy's plate armor. Van Paul shouted while squeezing. After hearing this, the commando captain, Molson, was stunned. He quickly reacted, yes, the musketeers deal with the enemy's plate-armored infantry. So he immediately ordered the sword and shield soldiers in the back row to make way. Molson was from the 4th Legion of the North Sea Kingdom and was stationed in Newcastle. The 4th Legion was composed of English troops, and only some officers were Frisians. But the 4th Legion had no musketeers, only longbowmen as long-range soldiers. Therefore, Molson was not familiar with musketeers. When he encountered the French plate-armored infantry just now, he did not think of musketeers for a while. It was not until Van Paul took the initiative to ask for a fight that he remembered this. After Van Paul led his men to the front, he found that the streets were crowded with people. It was very difficult to get the musketeers to find a shooting opportunity in the front row. But he had a lot of ideas. Captain Molson, please arrange a few strong soldiers to hold us up to a high place so that we can aim at the enemy. Molson was stunned, but still did it. A dozen sword and shield soldiers threw away their swords and shields, and lifted up 7 or 8 musketeers, one level higher than the soldiers. Then, these 7 or 8 musketeers took out one of the 5 clockwork ignition carbines on their bodies and began to aim at the French plate-armored infantrymen on the street ahead. Bang 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 dash, after a burst of gunfire, several French plate-armored infantrymen in the front row groaned, obviously all of them were injured. Of the 6 injured French plate-armored infantrymen, 2 were injured in unimportant positions and could continue to wield two-handed swords, but the other 4 temporarily lost their combat effectiveness. Before the French could react, the 7 or 8 musketeers changed to another clockwork ignition carbine and continued to shoot. Bang 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 dash, another burst of gunfire, this time the 7 or 8 French soldiers in the front row completely lost their combat effectiveness and collapsed directly to the ground, and it seemed that they had to receive treatment. 3 of them had several ribs broken in their chests. This is not over yet, these musketeers started to change their guns again. They changed their guns 5 times in a row and hit the French plate-armored infantry in the first 3 rows. But do you think this is over? Not yet. Because the musketeers in the back row handed their loaded muskets to the musketeers standing on the shoulders of the people, asking them to continue shooting. This is not over yet. Van Paul remembered the practice in Marin's classic battle example. He sent his musketeers to climb the roofs of the houses on both sides of the street, aiming at the enemy leisurely from the roofs and shooting, increasing the density of firepower. French Commander General Moreno was about to vomit blood. What's going on? How can the enemy's muskets be used on rainy days? Could it be the clockwork muskets of the North Sea Kingdom? Moreno suddenly remembered that it seemed that the musketeers of the North Sea Kingdom were generally equipped with clockwork muskets that were not afraid of rainy days. In fact, France also has that kind of musket, but because it is expensive and difficult to maintain, only some nobles have 1 or 2 as collections. It is impossible to equip the troops. Not to mention the difficulty and high cost of making a spring. If the spring is rusted, it is easy to fail to ignite when it is used. Therefore, the musketeer needs to oil the spring more often. Or, remove the spring and polish it before starting to fight to remove the rust. But if it is polished frequently, the spring is easy to wear out. Then, it will not take too long for the expensive spring to be scrapped. Only the North Sea Kingdom added nickel metal to the spring, which made the spring not afraid of rust in the air. After all, nickel steel is one of the alloy varieties of stainless steel that is not afraid of corrosion after nickel-chromium alloy. In other words, the spring of the North Sea Kingdom spring musket is now made of a simple alloy of ordinary spring steel with nickel added. This kind of spring usually has low maintenance requirements and does not need to be oiled every day. You know, oil is a very expensive thing these days. In fact, the French garrison in Calais also has musketeers, with thousands of people, which is very helpful for the defense of the city. Unfortunately, the matchlock gun cannot be used on rainy days. It is almost the same as a fire stick. It is far inferior to the clockwork flintlock of the North Sea Kingdom, which can also shoot freely on rainy days. Chapter 1744, Calais changes hands. General Moreno knew that it was unlikely to defeat his opponent in a street duel. So he ordered loudly, "Plate infantry, step back, let the sword and shield soldiers go." The plate infantry was his trump card, and he couldn't let them be killed so easily by the enemy. The French sword and shield soldiers also had 600 or 700 people. However, unlike the elite sword and shield soldiers of the 4th Legion, the French sword and shield soldiers were just ordinary soldiers. The wooden shields they used were not covered with iron sheets, but ordinary wooden shields. They didn't wear plate armor, but ordinary leather armor. In terms of combat effectiveness, they were certainly not the opponents of Molson's elite sword and shield soldiers. But his purpose was just to reduce the casualties of the plate infantry, and also to slow down the enemy's pace. Slowly, more than 600 French sword and shield soldiers came forward and replaced the plate infantry, which was less than 400 people. Then, Van Paul's musketeers also stopped shooting. Because their clockwork muskets were not afraid of rain, but it was difficult to load. It was fine to shoot a clockwork flintlock on a rainy day, but if the gunpowder was soaked by the rain when reloading, it would be the same. Therefore, they tried not to waste bullets on ordinary French soldiers. At this moment, the elite sword and shield soldiers, who were originally beaten by the French plate-armored infantry and had difficulty advancing, regained their vitality and began to use their equipment advantages to bully the ordinary French sword and shield soldiers in front of them. And Fan Paul's musketeers hid in the houses on the roadside to reload the ammunition for the clockwork flintlocks that had been fired. They all carried gunpowder in oil paper bags with them, and as long as they entered the rainproof houses, they could reload the ammunition normally. But the two sides in the fierce battle did not see that the French commander Moreno had quietly led the remaining 400 French plate-armored infantry to retreat. Moreover, after retreating, Moreno quietly called a large number of ordinary French infantrymen to move out sundries from the houses and began to block the streets. In other words, the more than 600 ordinary French sword and shield soldiers who ran to the front and fought desperately with the handsome elite sword and shield soldiers were treated as abandoned pawns by Moreno. "General, what should we do now?" "The enemy's army has entered the city," asked Monchi, the captain of the French plate infantry. After hesitating for a while, General Moreno said, "How about this, Monkey, you divide the 400 plate-armored infantry into two parts, go through the alley next to it, and go around to the paths under the city walls on the north and south sides of the west gate, and then suddenly attack the west gate from the north and south sides. However, you have to choose the right time. It's best to wait until all the enemy sword and shield soldiers leave the west gate before launching an assault. In this way, you don't have to get entangled with those damn sword and shield soldiers. After entering the city gate, ignore everything else and close the city gate first. Then, defend the city gate. At that time, I will mobilize other troops to encircle and suppress the enemy's sword and shield soldiers." How to encircle and suppress those sword and shield soldiers? Ordinary weapons are completely ineffective against them. Monkey said depressedly. Moreno said confidently, "Don't be afraid. I have sent people to block the main road of West Gate Street. At the same time, I have sent people to gather all the hammer soldiers in the city. These hammer soldiers are originally used to deal with plate armor. Sword and shield soldiers are as difficult to break through as plate armor soldiers, but hammers can still be used. At the same time, I will send people to the city's blacksmith shops and other places to collect all the sledgehammers and distribute them to the strong soldiers to smash the enemy's shields and plate armor. As long as those sword and shield soldiers are fed pigs by the hammer soldiers, plus your cooperation, there is nothing to worry about. Then, those musketeers." Moreno sighed and said, "There is no good way, we can only fight hard. In addition, I will go to find some archers. It seems that those musketeers are not wearing plate armor. But there are no archers in our army." Monchi said a little depressed. Since the arquebusiers were equipped, the French army has gradually begun to eliminate crossbowmen. Now it's too depressing to encounter rain. Moreno shook his head and said, "There are no bows and crossbows in the army, but there are still people in the city who have them. I remember that there was a shop opened by an Englishman near the governor's mansion that specialized in selling English longbows. I sent people to forcibly requisition the longbows in that shop. That's the only way." Monchi nodded, and then divided the remaining 400 plate-armored infantry into two teams. Relying on their familiarity with the city's terrain, they went around the alleys to the north and south sides of the west gate. At this time, the main force of the British army, led by General Sabrakin, one of Edward's confidants, went around the west gate from the north and prepared to enter the city. However, at this time, the sword and shield soldiers of both sides were still fighting on the street of the west gate of Calais. The city gate was blocked, and the main force could hardly enter the city. Sabrakin thought for a while and ordered, "Since it is difficult to advance, you should make way for me and let my soldiers climb up the gate tower from the stairs on the side, and then attack the north gate tower from the city wall. Then, come down from the north gate tower and open the north gate. This is a good idea, which can bypass the enemy's blockade." But Molson stopped him, "General, I heard that there are a lot of debris stuffed in the north gate's archway. Even if we capture the north gate tower, it will take a long time to clean up the debris if we want to open the north gate, and we will also have to face the French counterattack." After a pause, Molson suggested, "I think, why don't we attack the south gate from the city wall? The south gate is the entry passage for French reinforcements, and they will definitely not put debris in the gate arch." Sabrakin nodded immediately and ordered, "Okay, let's do it. Molson, lend me 100 of your sword and shield soldiers as the vanguard of attacking the men's gate tower. My army will all go up the wall and advance towards the south gate tower. Of course, the number of people that can be accommodated on the city wall is limited. Most of the rest of the people will go around from outside the city to the outside of the south gate and wait for the city gate to open." "Yes, follow your order." Then, the commandos surrounding the inside of the west gate arch stepped aside to make way for a group of main forces outside the city gate to come in and climb up the west gate tower through the stairs. Then, 100 sword and shield soldiers in the back row also followed the city wall, and as a pioneer, they ran along the city wall to the gate tower of the south gate of Calais. 40 minutes later, the two teams of French plate-armored infantry led by Monchy had quietly come to the west gate along the city wall. At this time, the elite sword and shield soldiers of the British army had successfully defeated the ordinary sword and shield soldiers of the French army, and killed them in front of the roadblock area set up by the French, and began to move the roadblocks. There were no sword and shield soldiers with super high protection near the city gate. Monchy saw the opportunity and shouted loudly. The French plate-armored infantry at the roots of the city walls on the north and south sides of the west gate immediately rushed out bravely and rushed to the city gate hole, killing hundreds of North Sea musketeers and dozens of ordinary commandos on the spot. Then, they rushed into the city gate hole. But what Monchy didn't expect was that because General Sabrakin, the commander-in-chief of the British army, was outside the west city gate, hundreds of English knights gathered at the west city gate at this time. Although the English knights were not as many and as powerful as the French knights, there were also a group of them. As it happened, General Sabrakin had 500 rare English knights with him. Seeing the French plate-armored infantry coming out of the city gate, General Sabrakin was stunned for a moment, then immediately ordered the English knights around him to dismount, wield two-handed swords and rush forward, and fight together with the plate-armored infantry led by Monchy. You know, these English knights are authentic knights, and they are better than the French plate infantry. Although the members of the French plate infantry are basically from the knight family, they are generally eliminated members who failed to pass the knight assessment. Although their martial arts are stronger than ordinary people, they are still worse than regular knights. Moreover, these French plate infantry suffered a great loss in weapons. Although they both use two-handed swords, the two-handed swords used by the French plate infantry are made by the French from pig iron ingots, and the quality is just as so. The two-handed swords used by the English knights are all purchased from the North Sea Kingdom. The materials are all steel. The two-handed swords of the English knights are made of medium carbon steel with good toughness, and they are carbon spring steel with silicon and manganese elements added. The surface of the sword, especially the edge, has been carbonized and is extremely hard. After many collisions, the pig iron two-handed swords of the French plate infantry were no match for the steel swords of the English knights, and many of them were cut off. Then, they were naturally beaten by the English knights and annihilated. After the most elite troops of the French Calais defenders were eliminated, the French army in the city could no longer resist the British attack. Soon, the south gate of Calais was lost, and a large number of British troops poured in from the south gate and cut off the French army's retreat. After half a day of fierce fighting, the Calais fortress officially changed hands. Chapter 1745, An Uproar. The French army was still very strong, especially the 400 or 500 plate-armored infantrymen, who were the trump cards in infantry battles. But unfortunately, they ran into the few English knights of the British army. Because of the problem with the weapons and the slightly inferior martial arts, this elite French army was wronged. If it had faced the ordinary infantry of England, this army should have been a great killer, but they met their nemesis. After this unit was destroyed, the French army had no elite. Originally, 1,000 musketeers were also very powerful, especially in the battle to defend the city. Unfortunately, it rained that day, and the 1,000 musketeers were instantly abolished. They were not as good as ordinary infantry, and their combat effectiveness was no different from that of the conscripted soldiers composed of farmers. After the British army broke through the south gate again, they began to attack the French army in the city from both sides. Although the French army fought desperately, they were not in a superior number. What's more, their elite were destroyed by mistake. Therefore, General Moreno could only watch the French army retreat. In the end, General Moreno was pounced on and held down by several strong British men in the governor's palace, and was humiliated and captured. Long live! Long live! The British soldiers cheered loudly on the top of the Calais fortress to celebrate this rare victory. You know, since the late period of the 100 Years' War, the British army has rarely defeated the French army on land. This also caused the British army to be a little weak psychologically when facing the French army. But the victory of the battle to capture the Calais fortress gave the British soldiers a lot of confidence. But General Sabrakin was worried about this. He worriedly said, "What if the French used the same trick against us?" This siege opened his eyes. Whether it was easily solving the sewer iron gate or opening the city gate from the inside, General Sabrakin was a little surprised. Then, he thought worriedly, what if the French used the same trick to besiege Calais? At this time, Balky, the head of intelligence of the North Sea Kingdom, said with a smile, "In fact, this problem is very simple. We have a solution in Auric, the capital of our North Sea Kingdom." "Oh, how to solve these hidden dangers?" Sabrakin asked curiously. Balky replied, "In Auric, Grand Duke Marin added an iron door inside the city gate to prevent someone from opening the city gate. This iron door is not too thick and cannot withstand the impact of battering rams. But the Grand Duke said that this door is actually to stop small troops from trying to attack the city gate. Such small troops lurking in the city and planning to open the city gate cannot carry tools such as battering rams for siege. Generally, they only carry swords, so they can be stopped without a too thick iron door. When the time comes, the inner iron door will be locked, and the enemy's assault team will find it difficult to open the iron door in a short time. Moreover, the defenders near the city gate are not fools. When they destroyed the inner iron door, they had already come to destroy these people. The inner iron door of the city gate made by Marin is actually similar to the old-fashioned school iron door in later generations. It is not very strong and certainly cannot withstand siege equipment. However, it is no problem to use it to resist the enemy commandos in the city for a while and hold out until the reinforcements from the city gate tower and nearby barracks arrive. With this kind of thing similar to the big iron gate of the school, it is basically impossible for the enemy to attack and open the city gate from the back. After all, it is difficult for a single soldier without engineering equipment to break through such a big iron gate. In this way, there is no need to worry too much about the city gate being breached from the inside. Moreover, this big iron gate is relatively light. When the city gate is opened in the morning, the guards on duty in the city gate hole can open the lock and easily push the iron gate open without affecting the traffic inside and outside the city. After hearing this method, Sabulakin was very happy and immediately ordered to imitate it. Then, he asked, how should the iron gates of the sewers be defended? This time, the British army broke into the city from the sewers. Balki thought for a while and said, it seems, there are 2 iron gates in the sewers of Auric. Moreover, oil lamps are lit in the culvert at night. There is a sentry post nearby with a rainproof lookout hole. Unlike the French, the iron gates of the sewers in Auric are illuminated by oil lamps inside the culvert all night long. Unlike the French, they rely on torches on the top of the city wall for lighting and cannot prevent rain. There are lights in the culvert. As long as there are guards in the lookout hole taking turns to monitor at night, plus double iron gates, there is no need to worry about the enemy being able to successfully launch a sneak attack from the sewer. Marin is the ancestor of European sneak attacks, so how could he not guard against others attacking him? Therefore, whether it is the inner defense of the city gate or the defense of the iron gates of the sewers, he has taken them into consideration and will not give people the opportunity to attack him. General Sabulakin was filled with emotion after hearing this. He is indeed the best sly man in Europe, not only good at slyly attacking others, but also preventing others from slyly attacking him. If Balk knew what Sabulakin was thinking, he would probably ask for a duel. Damn, our boss is resourceful, what is slyly attacking others? Then, Sabulakin began to transform the city defense according to the Auric model, completely borrowing from the Auric model. With these 2 transformations, there is no need to be afraid that the French will use the same tactics to seize the Calais fortress. Of course, there are others. For example, drive all the French in Calais out of the Calais fortress. Sabulakin is not a fool. Most of the French in the city have moved in from France in recent years, and they are naturally die-hard fans of the Kingdom of France. Leaving them in the city is definitely a security risk. Maybe they will cooperate with the French army from inside and outside. Moreover, while driving out the French, who account for more than half of the total population in the city, the British soldiers can also take the opportunity to raid their homes and plunder the wealth of those French. After all, this is a fortress port and an important place for commerce, and the residents in the city still have some assets. Taking the opportunity to drive them out of the city, they can make a fortune. The French in the city can take away their clothes and bedding. As for property, forget it. Even the English merchants in the city were blackmailed by General Sabulakin's men. After all, these English people have done a lot of things for the French in the city in recent years, and it is reasonable to be fined. Of course, the British army was not so cruel to them. They just extorted money and did not raid their homes. After cleaning up the whole city, General Sabulakin sent an envoy to Paris to inform the French court that the Kingdom of England had taken back the management rights of the Calais fortress. Moreover, your country, including General Moreno, has a total of 2,600 prisoners, including 30 noble officers. According to the instructions of His Majesty Edward, if France is willing to recognize England's permanent sovereignty over Calais, the British side is willing to release all prisoners of war unconditionally. When the news reached Paris, the whole Kingdom of France was in an uproar. Chapter 1746, Proposal to build the Great Wall. How is it possible? The British conquered the Calais fortress in 5 days. Looking at the letter of credence, King François I of France, who had just taken power, was a little distraught. He had just begun to gradually control the various rights of the Kingdom of France, and was currently recovering the control of the city defense army of Paris from Count Cesque. As for his reputation within the kingdom, it was still being established. Unexpectedly, in just a few days, the Calais fortress that King Louis XII had finally taken back was taken away by the English, which was like a heavy slap in his face. This slap was so hard that it directly ruined François I's reputation. It was not long since he ascended the throne, and he had just started to take power, and he lost a strategic location like the Calais fortress, which was simply a shame. You know, in this idea, European monarchs are supported by reputation. With reputation, the nobles obey you. Without reputation, you may be deserted by your friends and relatives. For example, Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, had to kneel down and beg the Pope for forgiveness because he was excommunicated by the Pope. Because, at that time, he had been deserted by his friends and relatives. Of course, the loss of Calais by Francis I was not as serious as the excommunication of Henry IV. However, it was definitely a major blow to his prestige. So, Francis I was furious. He drew his sword and slashed around in the gorgeous palace. Many precious crafts were destroyed by his sword. At this time, no minister dared to step forward to stop him. Because they were also confused, except for the spy John Lafitte. Of course, John Lafitte still had to pretend to be very surprised and very angry on the surface. He remembered the instructions in the secret letter that Marin had given him a few days ago, so he stood up and said, "Your Majesty, please calm down. I think the most important thing right now is to find out how the Calais fortress was lost so quickly. Logically, the English do not have the ability to capture a fortress in 5 days. Therefore, there must be something we don't know. Only when we find out this secret can we be prepared to deal with it." Francois I's anger subsided a lot. He stopped destroying and said with red eyes, "What's the use of this? The Calais fortress has been lost, and I will become a joke in the eyes of the people." John Lafitte shook his head and said, "Your Majesty, the Calais fortress is certainly a bad thing. However, what is more important right now is how to prevent the enemy from using the same tricks to capture other cities near the Calais fortress. Only by figuring out their tricks can French cities be safer in the future." In fact, John Lafitte had long known that the North Sea spies had the means to destroy the iron gates of the sewers. But he couldn't say it, so he could only pretend that he didn't know, and he had to guide Francois I to think and investigate. After hearing this, Francois I finally calmed down. Indeed, it would be safer to figure out the enemy's strange methods. So he ordered John Lafitte to be in charge of this matter and find out the mystery of the fall of the Calais fortress. And John Lafitte, by virtue of this, gained more trust from Francois I. Then, the French monarchs and ministers began to discuss how to deal with the harm caused by the fall of the Calais fortress. And the possibility of retaking the Calais fortress. But no one was optimistic about the possibility of retaking the Calais fortress, because the French were able to conquer the Calais fortress before, because the Calais fortress did not have an iron door installed. Now, the French have replaced the Calais fortress with a thick iron door, and it is harder than climbing to the sky to break through the city gate. They are not Marin, and they don't know the formula of Aqua Regia, so naturally they can't do anything with the iron door. If the ant-like method is used to attack the city, the Calais fortress is so strong that it would take the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers to have a chance of being taken. But the worst thing is that the Calais fortress is separated from the English mainland by a small strait less than 30 kilometers wide, and the English mainland can calmly support the Calais fortress. This means that even if the French are willing to sacrifice the lives of their soldiers, they may not be able to take the Calais fortress. Otherwise, the English would not have been able to occupy Calais for more than 150 years. Francois I was a little frustrated. "My lords, if you let the British occupy the Calais fortress, the northeast of France will be unstable in the future. At that time, the British may send troops to harass the northeast of France at any time. Even, they may harass Paris. Paris is only about 235 kilometers away from Calais. If the British army lands, they can reach the vicinity of Paris in a few days. If it were normal times, the British army would definitely not dare to attack Paris. But now France is competing with Spain for Naples, and the main force needs to go south to compete for hegemony. In this way, the British army has the opportunity to harass Paris. There is no need to besiege Paris. Just a sweep of the area around Paris will seriously damage France. Basically, the Calais fortress is like a sword of Damocles hanging over France's head, which may fall at any time to hit France hard. If it weren't for the poor combat effectiveness of the English army, who knows what serious consequences there would be. Just when the French monarchs and ministers were all frowning, John Lafitte stood up again. "Your Majesty, I have a way to solve the threat of the Calais fortress." Francois I was immediately shocked. He remembered that John Lafitte was also a resourceful minister when the previous king was alive. So, he looked at John Lafitte expectantly and said, "My dear, please tell me." John Lafitte saluted, but did not immediately tell the plan. Instead, he asked, "Does your Majesty know Hadrian's Wall?" Francois I was stunned, and then replied, "Of course I know that wall, but that so-called wall is only a little better than a fence. It can't stop the enemy at all. Hadrian's Wall is indeed not very tall. It is only 4.6 meters high, which is about the same height as an ordinary room and the height of an ordinary family wall. It is easy to climb over. Its width and top width are only 2.1 meters. Soldiers standing on it are very crowded and can't spread out. Therefore, Hadrian's Wall is more like a border fence of the Roman Empire at that time, rather than a defensive fortification. But the Great Wall that John Lafitte was talking about was not a fence like Hadrian's Wall. He introduced the Great Wall of China to François I and a group of French ministers in detail, and told François I that China relied on the Great Wall to block the southward movement of hundreds of thousands of nomadic cavalry from the northern grasslands. After introducing the Great Wall, John Lafitte made an impassioned speech. Your Majesty, as long as we build a tall and solid Great Wall like a city wall next to the Calais fortress, we can restrict the British inside the wall. Even if they occupy the Calais fortress, what if we surround Calais with a wall? Even if they land their troops, they can't get out. François I and the French ministers were fascinated by what they heard, but they didn't know that this was a trap that Marin deliberately dug for France, building the Great Wall, right? Do you know how much money it would cost and how much manpower it would take? The Qin dynasty exhausted its national strength because of building the Great Wall, which led to the peasant uprising at the end of the Qin dynasty and its demise. The same thing happened during the Sui dynasty. They dug a large canal, which clearly benefited future generations, but it also exhausted the country's national strength and, to a certain extent, led to the demise of the Sui dynasty. Another reason was the failure of the expedition to Goryeo. Although the cost of building a wall to surround the Calais fortress is far less than that of building the Great Wall and digging the Beijing-Hangzhou Grand Canal, the finances of France are far from comparable to those of the Qin and Sui dynasties. France does not have a unified national tax system at the moment, so how can it afford so much money? Therefore, the strategy of building the Great Wall proposed by Marin to John Lafitte seems reliable, but in fact it squeezes the national strength of France, making France unable to do anything else for several years. In addition, with the desire to dominate Italy in the south, it can be foreseen that France will definitely have a hard time in the coming years. Chapter 1747, Blame. The manpower and material resources required to build the Great Wall are obviously huge, but Hadrian's Wall is an exception. The Roman Empire did not conscript civilians to build Hadrian's Wall, but relied on 3 Roman legions alone, more than 15,000 people, and it took 6 years to build it. Moreover, the building material that accounts for the largest part of the cost, stone, did not cost money when building Hadrian's Wall. Because the local stone resources are extremely rich, as long as the local soldiers have tools, they can mine enough stones to build Hadrian's Wall. But it is different to build a great wall near the Calais fortress, because the Calais fortress is located in the coastal plain by the sea, and there is no source of stone in the local area. If you want to build a great wall, you can only transport bricks or stones from other places. Back then, Marin only built a high-level reservoir using water power near the city of Lille, which cost more than 200,000 gold coins in just 0.1 square kilometers. Of course, that reservoir used a lot of steel bars, so the cost was high. But the Great Wall surrounding the Calais fortress is at least tens of kilometers long. Moreover, it must be at least taller than Hadrian's Wall, which is similar to a fence wall. Therefore, its cost must be high, at least hundreds of thousands of gold coins. However, when John Lafitte made his suggestion, he deliberately ignored this point and used the fact that the construction of Hadrian's Wall did not cost much. Then, the French monarchs and ministers who did not know much about these professional knowledge were fooled, thinking that it would cost a little more than Hadrian's Wall, just like Hadrian's Wall. However, they did not expect that building such a long wall of dozens of kilometers could actually empty the French treasury. These guys obviously did not understand the construction cost budget. However, they could still imagine the scene described by John Lafitte of using the Great Wall to block the British invasion of northern France. After all, the Great Wall is indeed quite effective. Some people may say that the Great Wall could not 100% defend against the nomadic peoples in the north in ancient times. For example, during the Ming dynasty, the Great Wall in the north was repeatedly breached. However, you have to consider that those are exceptions. Moreover, even if those northern nomadic peoples breached the Great Wall, they came in through some passes. They were not able to fly over the Great Wall, but had to attack some important passes. Moreover, the Great Wall is too long, so it is inevitable that there will be omissions, which is definitely difficult to defend. But if it is a small Great Wall to defend the Calais fortress, it will be easier to defend. After all, this is a large encirclement, and the situation of the Calais fortress can be seen clearly, and it is impossible for the enemy to attack it by surprise. In addition, John Lafitte suggested building multiple wall buildings on the Great Wall that can prevent rain, similar to beacon towers. Then, in the pavilions on the wall, musketeers are deployed. In this way, even if it rains, musketeers can be used to repel the enemy's attack. This practice of building pavilions on the Great Wall does seem to enhance the defense and give musketeers room to play. However, hidden behind it is a huge increase in cost. If the Great Wall is really built according to the boutique plan, let alone hundreds of thousands of gold coins, 2 million will not be enough. But François I and the ministers present did not understand. Listening to John Lafitte bragging, they all thought it was good. As for the cost, it was not something that the nobles could estimate. François I, who was in high spirits, adopted John Lafitte's suggestion on the spot and ordered the construction of a long wall surrounding the Calais fortress, which was about 50 or 60 kilometers long. Moreover, France planned to mobilize 15,000 troops and 20,000 civilians to build the Great Wall. The people who built the Great Wall were naturally civilians, and the 15,000 troops were to prevent the British troops in Calais from going out of the city to counterattack. After all, building this wall would definitely cut off the possibility of the British going out of the Calais fortress to harass France. Sure enough, when the news came back to London, Edward's face was a little dark. Because he found that it was not so meaningful to recapture the Calais fortress. However, he also had his way. Don't you want to build a great wall to surround the Calais fortress? There must be two ends of your great wall close to the sea, right? Okay, as long as it is close to the sea. When you build it by the sea, I will arrange warships to bombard it and see how you build the seaside part. After all, the ocean belongs to England. The French can complete most of the Great Wall, but if they want to build the end near the sea, it depends on whether the English agree or not. In short, this is a life and death contest between me and you. After the intelligence from London was sent back to Paris, Francois I was relieved to learn that Edward was very angry about the construction of the Great Wall. He was worried that the British didn't care about this small Great Wall. But he didn't know that the British were determined to interfere with the construction of the coastal part of the Great Wall. For this reason, Edward specially ordered 30 red cannons and warships loaded with red cannons from Marin, which were specially used to bombard the construction sites along the coast. The effective range of the red cannon is more than 500 meters. When added to the upper deck of the warship, the range is longer, which can completely prevent the French from starting construction at the coastal construction site. The small copper cannons of the French have a range of only more than 200 meters and cannot compete with the red cannons. Marin also quickly accepted the order, 30 red cannons, which can be taken out immediately now. But it was a bit difficult for Marin to get a warship carrying red cannons. If he directly sold a 500-ton warship to England, the French would know at a glance that it was sold by the North Sea Kingdom. In that case, he would inevitably face the anger of the French. Marin didn't want to provoke the French for the time being, so he thought of the Spanish caravel. The hull of the caravel was tall and sturdy, suitable for the placement of heavy artillery. Moreover, the bow and stern of the caravel had tall towers, which were very suitable for installing artillery. The higher the tower, the longer the range of the artillery. Although the current caravels are generally small, only 200 or 300 tons, a ship can only carry 2 or 3 red cannons, otherwise the hull can't bear it. But Marin happened to have more than a dozen caravels in his hands, which were originally used to pretend to be Spaniards, and now they seem to be useless. Therefore, Marin decided to modify the dozen or so carracks of 200 to 300 tons in his hands, and covered the hulls with some painted tinplate to resist the French artillery shells. Then he handed these carracks together with 30 18-pound Cufullin cannons, red cannons, to Edward, asking them to destroy the construction of the coastal section of the French Great Wall. At this time, John Lafitte was ordered to investigate the reasons for the fall of the Calais fortress, and also found out that the British army used muskets that can be used on rainy days, pointing the spearhead directly at the North Sea Kingdom. After all, these days, only the North Sea Kingdom can be equipped with clockwork muskets. So, the angry Francois I sent an envoy to the North Sea Kingdom to question Marin. Because Francois I felt that those musketeers were probably sent by the North Sea Kingdom. How can this be? Hit the face of the Kingdom of France? At this moment, if Francois I had not remained rational, he would probably have wanted to send troops to attack the North Sea Kingdom. But because of the two powerful enemies of Spain and England, Francois I held back his anger and did not send troops. Marin also knew this, but he knew that France should not be stimulated too much at this time. Otherwise, the young and vigorous Francois I might really ignore the overall situation and send heavy troops to attack him. So, Marin directly said, the North Sea Kingdom did not send troops to participate in the battle to attack Calais, absolutely not. However, a few days ago, King Edward of England did order a batch of clockwork flintlocks from me. After that, he also took out an order contract to prove that England did purchase clockwork flintlocks from him. This document was signed by Edward on the spot when Marin visited London. The purpose is to confuse the French in order to achieve the purpose of shirking the blame. After all, Marin does not want to fight with France yet. Therefore, when discussing the attack on Calais with Edward in London last time, Marin prepared for the rainy day and prepared the order contract. He also asked Edward to use the king's seal and sign it personally. Chapter 1748 Young Sergeant. The French envoy was dumbfounded. He happened to have studied seals and monarch signatures and recognized the signature of the King of England. Moreover, he could smell the special ink. But the result surprised him, this purchase contract was real. The seal and signature of the King of England, including the smell of ink, are exactly the same as the formal English documents, which is obviously real. In this way, Marin succeeded in passing the blame. Seeing that the envoy believed in the purchase contract, Marin smiled in his heart, but explained with grievance on his face, "Envoy, you know, I am also the Earl of Newcastle in England now. His Majesty the King wants to purchase a batch of muskets from me, how dare I refuse? Not sending troops to directly participate in the war, it is considered that I attach great importance to the relationship with the great kingdom of France. Seeing that they did have a formal contract, and it seemed that the time was indeed a long time ago, the French envoy had to believe that Marin was unintentional. However, he didn't know that Marin turned around and bought 30 red cannons for England. Although it was a bit cowardly to do so, the benefits were obvious. This made the French unable to vent their anger. Moreover, in this era, it was not strange to admit defeat to France. After all, France at that time was the most powerful country in Europe. Just like in later generations, is it embarrassing to admit defeat to the Americans? It is indeed embarrassing, but since everyone does it, it is not particularly embarrassing. In this way, the French envoy who was fooled was sent back in a daze. The news he brought back was obviously of no value. At this time, France was also discussing the safety protection of the sewer iron gates. Because, according to John Lafayette's investigation, it seems that the Calais fortress was breached by the British from the sewer iron gates. In addition, after the assassination of Margaret of Tudor and her son, the British escaped from the sewer iron gates, which made the French realize one thing: the British seemed to have found a good way to open the sewer iron gates. Therefore, the defense of the sewer iron gates must be strengthened. As we all know, the smell of sewers is very bad. Especially in summer, the smell of sewers is simply unbearable. Therefore, the soldiers guarding the sewers are generally deployed dozens of meters away to avoid being smoked. But after the British used the sewers to bypass the city defense twice in a row, the French learned from their mistakes and decided to strengthen the defense of the sewer iron gates. To this end, in order to ensure the safety of the city, King François I of France ordered to build a sentry post next to the sewer exit and let the soldiers stand guard directly next to the sewer exit. This made the French soldiers on duty miserable, because the smell over there in the sewer was really bad. If they were stationed next to the sewer exit, it would be so suffocating. But for safety, the French government and the opposition still decided to station troops next to the sewer exit to ensure the safety of the sewer iron gates. As for the soldiers' unfamiliarity, who cares? In fact, the French didn't know that when they were planning to use the iron gate of the sewer to attack Calais, Marin had already made plans to give up using this method in the future. Everything can be done once or twice, but not 3 times. If you use this trick once or twice, someone may be fooled. But if you want to keep using this loophole, people are not fools. So, Marin is not afraid of this loophole being discovered. Anyway, he doesn't plan to use it next time. With aqua regia, let alone corroding the sewer iron lock, you can directly corrode the big iron door. If it is a wooden door, it will be even easier. A barrel of gasoline can burn the wooden door. In this way, the French have worked in vain. However, those French soldiers who were sent to guard the sewer exit were so miserable that they had to endure the torture of the sewer odor. Especially in summer, it is so stinky that it will kill people. After sending the French envoy away, Marin went to do his own thing. At present, Marin has his own big things to do, a very, very important thing: the renewal of grassroots officers in the army. 20 years ago, when Marin founded the army of the North Sea Kingdom, he basically used mountain people in southern Germany and farmers from Alsace. Even the grassroots officers such as the company captain and the squad leader were all illiterate mountain people. Because there were no literate grassroots officers available under his command. But 20 years have passed, and the situation has changed a lot. Especially more than 10 years ago, after Marin occupied the East Frisian county, he began to open schools in East Frisia and held a crash course for young officers, and began to gain some literate people. The crash course for young officers has been running for several years, and a total of hundreds of young officers have been trained. Later, these hundreds of young officers were incorporated into the army and became the first batch of literate grassroots officers in the North Sea Kingdom. But this was not enough. Later, the North Sea Kingdom also selected a group of not very smart. The smart ones were arranged to continue to go to school for further studies, but very loyal and brave teenagers from elementary school students in ordinary schools, and continued to train them as officers. Before going to Daming, around 1508, the first batch of primary school students graduated, and a group of about 1,000 primary school graduates were sent to the part-time non-commissioned officer school for further training. Primary school graduates are generally around 13 or 14 years old when they graduate. Now 6 or 7 years have passed, and the first batch of primary school graduates have all become adults. In fact, 1,000 students from the non-commissioned officer school became adults last year, and another 1,000 people graduated and became adults this spring, which made Marin have 2,000 more non-commissioned officers at once. These are non-commissioned officers who have received education since childhood, and their level is much higher than that of the students in the previous junior officers crash course. Anyway, their cultural level is equivalent to that of junior high school students in later generations. Of course, in the junior high school curriculum, a lot of knowledge is incomplete. Marin deliberately deleted it, but at least these people have received a complete primary school education. Unlike those students in the junior officers crash course, their level of knowledge is only about the 3rd and 4th grades of primary school. There is no way, the foundation of the crash course is poor. And these 2,000 non-commissioned officers with solid disciples are what Marin values most. Marin had discovered that the hundreds of students in the crash course for young officers were not brainwashed enough, and their loyalty to them was not as good as that of the cadets who had received formal education since childhood. You know, Marin implemented a loyalty education similar to that of North Korea. These children have been brainwashed since childhood, and they are very loyal to themselves. Although the students in the crash course for young officers are more loyal than the mercenaries recruited from the southern German mountains, they are still not enough to make Marin completely at ease. Therefore, when the two batches of cadets graduated, Marin paid so much attention to them. Because these children made Marin very relieved. At least, this is the case in terms of loyalty. The only shortcoming is probably that they are too young. Unlike the first batch of graduates from the crash course for young officers, many of them are in their 20s and can be entrusted with important tasks. If these children who have just reached adulthood are rashly asked to serve as military chiefs, Marin is worried that they will not be able to do the job. After all, not everyone is a genius. Experience is also very important on the battlefield. Marin thought about it for several days before he finally found a solution. First, let these cadets enter the army and serve as deputy squad leaders or even company leaders, and learn command experience from those veteran squad leaders and company leaders. After a few years of experience, when they are capable enough, let them replace those veteran grassroots officers. Anyway, by then, many grassroots officers will be old, and it will be just right for these loyal kids to take over. Of course, not all 2,000 cadets will be assigned to the army. Marin only plans to select half of those with excellent grades to serve as deputy officers in the army for training. The other 1,000 people cannot serve as officers for the time being due to their grades. However, Marin will train them into a new army. Many military reforms that could not be implemented before can be tried in this army composed entirely of educated young people. Chapter 1749, The Foundation of Military Reform. Strictly speaking, the current army of the North Sea can only be regarded as a semi-feudal and semi-modernized army. The reason for this is that most of the soldiers in the army are illiterate and have conservative ideas. Many modern military reforms are difficult to carry out in such an old-fashioned army. Apart from anything else, the cultural level of the soldiers in the army can dispel many of Marin's ideas. These young sergeants are different. The education they received since childhood is the kind of education in later generations. Their way of thinking is different from that of Europeans of this era. They are closer to later generations and smarter. After all, they all have a certain level of education. Moreover, each of them has a very solid foundation in military skills, no less than veterans. The only shortcoming is probably the lack of actual combat experience. However, such sergeants are also very malleable. Because they have a high cultural quality and have received more than 10 years of military education, these children have the potential to be trained into elite soldiers. In addition, these teenagers have received more than 10 years of brainwashing education, and there is absolutely no problem with loyalty. This is the main reason why Marin wants to train them into the elite of the elite. With a good cultural foundation and special loyalty, this is absolutely a perfect elite soldier material. In fact, only by traveling to this era can Marin deeply feel the historical generation gap of hundreds of years between modern people and ancient people. Hundreds of years of vicissitudes have led to completely different consciousness and concepts between modern people and ancient people. The huge difference in cultural level also leads to the poor plasticity of ancient people. Marin has always been very strange. In those novels about traveling through ancient times to make achievements, the protagonist travels back in time and easily trains a completely ancient person into a modern elite soldier. Is the difference in concepts of hundreds of years so easy to solve? Perhaps, the difference between ordinary soldiers and ancient and modern is not so obvious. But the difference in the quality of officers is a world of difference. Without a certain cultural foundation, some slightly more complicated commands are difficult to understand. Therefore, in this era, an uneducated officer does not have the ability to lead troops to perform tasks alone. The kind of novel that casually trains an ancient person into an excellent modern officer is too bullshit. Especially the most bullshit is to train a house slave into a general who can stand alone. Marin also tried to train all 5 of his servants into generals, but in the end, only Schwartz, who came from a knight family, became a general because of his good foundation and culture. For a brainless person like Kahn, Marin could only use him as a fierce general like Dian Wei, and it was impossible for him to be the head coach. Garland and Tara could only go to the colonies to open up wasteland, and they were not as good as Albert. As for Saul, he couldn't do intelligence better than Kohler, who was naturally smart, but he was loyal and dedicated, and he was deeply valued by Marin. But no matter what, professional things should be done by professionals. It is too whimsical to want to train people with no foundation, even illiterates, into independent bosses. Unless, they are educated from childhood. Those adult ancient farmers can only be trained into warriors with good execution ability at best. However, it is too difficult to become an important officer with independent thinking ability. Don't think that you can train a powerful person by opening a literacy class in the army. Of course, there are such cases. But those who can be trained into powerful characters in literacy classes may all be geniuses who have been delayed. Marin lived in the countryside in his previous life, and he had seen literacy classes in the countryside. In fact, most illiterate farmers entered literacy classes, but the final result was that they were useless. They should be rough, or rough. Only a small number of people with good talents will have an effect. This is because many people have a fixed way of thinking after adulthood. The most important thing is that they are used to thinking without using their brains. Although their IQ is not necessarily low, their brains have become a decoration. It is as difficult as climbing to the sky to educate such people into talents who are good at thinking. Only those geniuses who are very talented and used to using their brains, but are delayed by family conditions, have the ability to stand out in literacy classes. Most of the rest of the people, at most, learn to write their own names in literacy classes, and then know a few more common characters and a few place names, so as not to take the wrong bus or something. These are all what Marin saw with his own eyes in later life, not bragging. Literacy classes and the like are just to fool people who don't know anything about it. The real effect is not that good. But when it comes to publicity afterwards, the effect of literacy is exaggerated at the suggestion of the superiors. People who don't know the truth read the reports and think that all the members of the literacy class have been trained to become doctors. Of course, this depends on age groups. For literacy for minors, the effect is very good. After all, the worldview of minors has not yet been finalized and is more malleable. As for adults, the older they are, the more so-called life experience they have, and the closer the literacy effect is to zero. For example, in the early years, when agricultural technicians began to appear in rural areas to teach farmers to farm scientifically, many old farmers did not take it seriously. They said, "I have been farming for decades, don't I know more than you, a little kid," and refused to accept new agricultural technologies. Only after visible results are achieved in the experimental plots will these old people be willing to accept new technologies. Therefore, there is a term in later generations, called agricultural demonstration fields, which is to show the actual results to those stubborn old farmers. In short, the older you are, the less value you have to cultivate. Because their worldview and cognitive ability have been solidified, it is difficult to make a breakthrough. Only minors, because they have not yet formed a complete worldview, can be easily transformed. As for the later film and television works, our army carried out literacy for illiterate soldiers. Well, the screenwriter will never tell you that it is only effective for a small number of people. Just like Marin's uncle in the future, a poor student, joined our army for several years, took a lot of literacy classes, and returned as a poor student. Although he had made meritorious contributions in the Vietnam battlefield, because he was a hopeless poor student, even if he acted as a platoon leader for a period of time after the platoon leader was injured, he could only be arranged to work in the factory as a worker after his retirement. Workers were still popular at that time. Otherwise, he would have been promoted long ago. Moreover, it needs to be seen that many famous generals of our army before the founding of the People's Republic of China actually graduated from Huangpu. For example, among the 10 marshals, He Lao, who had the worst culture, also studied in a private school for 5 years, which was equivalent to the level of elementary school graduates. And Zhu Lao and Chen Lao and others directly studied abroad. In addition, during the anti-Japanese war, many college students in Beijing and Tianjin went south to participate in the anti-Japanese war after the fall of North China. They were absorbed by our army and became important military commanders. Many people also studied at the anti-Japanese university. Therefore, although the main force of our army at the grassroots level are farmers, there are actually many high-level generals at the commander level. Otherwise, Chiang Kai-shek's millions of troops could not be dealt with. Just give an example of data, there are more than 60 generals who graduated from the Huangpu Military Academy, not including the teaching staff of Zhou Laoda. This is just a Huangpu Military Academy, not including the military academies in various places. There are also generals with low cultural levels like Li Yunlong in the novel, but not many can really get to the top level. Moreover, they have also studied with the big guys who graduated from Huangpu and other schools. Without the guidance of professionals, how can you know so much? In addition, why do workers, who are a minority in number, dominate the alliance between workers and peasants? Because many workers can read. Why don't you let an illiterate command tens of thousands of troops? I'm afraid they can't even remember the unit numbers, or count the food and grass, let alone command the battle, and can't even do daily management. So, soldiers can make do, but officers can't. Those who traveled through ancient times and relied on a group of illiterate people to build a modern army are a bit too ridiculous. Of course, that is a pure YY novel, which does not pay attention to rationality. If you really want to care, most novels have various bugs. After all, the threshold for online literature is very low. Many people who don't understand history at all and have only watched a few nonsense costume TV dramas dare to write historical novels. In fact, the ancient ancestors of China knew this problem. Therefore, there is a saying that, it is easy to get thousands of soldiers, but it is difficult to get a general. In other words, the quality of officers determines the upper limit of the army. It is precisely because of this that Marin had to wait for the growth of those children's non-commissioned officers. Because the generals before, the cultural and ideological levels could not keep up. And these teenagers who grew up with new-style education have also become the basis for Marin to carry out modern military reforms. Chapter 1750 Young Guards. Strictly speaking, the current Beihai army has not yet deviated from the category of ancient armies. Although many modern training methods have been adopted, muskets have been promoted, and modern tactics have been adopted. However, because most of the officers are still indigenous officers of this era, even if various new gadgets are adopted, it still cannot change the fact that this is an ancient army. Just like the army in the late Qing dynasty, it was clearly equipped with many advanced guns and cannons, including machine guns and cannons, but was still beaten to a pulp by the Eight-Nation Alliance. There is no way, if the officers' thinking does not change, the nature of the army will be difficult to change. Just like during the Meiji Restoration in Japan, the shogunate purchased a large number of modern guns and cannons from France, but because it still reused conservative samurai as officers, it did not fully exert the power of new weapons. On the contrary, most of the officers of the anti-shogun faction came from more open areas such as Kyushu, and their ideas were very different from those of the conservative old-school samurai. The most classic one is probably the Northern Expedition in 1926. At that time, the Guangzhou regime was not superior to the northern warlords. But Guangdong was the most advanced region in Chinese thought at that time, and it was cultivated by professional modern military academies such as the Whampoa Military Academy. The main backbone of the Northern Expedition Army at that time was the student army composed of Whampoa students. This group of Whampoa student army had advanced and solid theories, and accumulated practical experience in the crusade against Qin Jiongming. Therefore, although the weapons of both sides of the Northern Expedition looked similar, they were two armies with a generation gap. As for the current Beihai Kingdom, the Beihai Kingdom army is actually a bit like the warlord army at that time. Although it copied the modernized, should be modernized, but it was modernized at that time, military system and used advanced weapons and equipment. However, it can only be regarded as a semi-modernized army. Because the officers in the army are still the same group of people, they just took off the old uniforms and put on new uniforms. This kind of army is certainly stronger than the pure Manchu army, but because of the officer factor, the combat effectiveness can only be regarded as between the old army and the new army. The current Beihai Kingdom army is also in this state. Because they have adopted new weapons and new tactics, they are indeed stronger than the contemporary European army. However, they are not that strong, and they cannot push all of Europe. Therefore, Marin did not have the confidence to fight a group of people alone, and could only pretend to be honest. He wanted to fight against the sky, the earth, and the air, but after crossing, there was no beep sound in his mind, and no invincible plug-in was sent to him. If you really dare to be so arrogant, even if you can win temporarily, the consequences will not be good. No one can understand the principle of the first bird to stick out its head more deeply than the Chinese. If you don't cheat, it's best to hide first and then explode. Among them, the best ancestor to learn from is Zhu Yuanzhang. He pretended to be a grandson at the beginning, and even accepted the amnesty and enthronement of the Yuan court. That's not all. Zhu Yuanzhang even accepted the enthronement of the Han Song regime from Han Liner, who was also one of the anti-kings. At that time, Han Liner, as the Little Ming King, was the nominal spiritual leader of the various righteous armies at the end of the Yuan dynasty. Although Zhu Yuanzhang was not controlled by Han Liner's regime, he accepted the other party's canonization to govern the Jiangnan province. Later, Zhu Yuanzhang accepted the canonization of the Yuan court. Morally speaking, Zhu Yuanzhang's behavior is a typical double-faced. But it works. Through this somewhat despicable practice of being humble, Zhu Yuanzhang successfully survived the most vulnerable early stage and ensured that he was not targeted. Originally, Zhu Yuanzhang was just a very inconspicuous one among the various righteous armies, and even Zhang Shiqing was much more famous than him. But through the policy of building high walls, storing grain, and slowly claiming the throne, he managed to survive until the later stage, grew into a new overlord, and finally swept the world. It can be said that what Marin is learning now is Zhu Yuanzhang. It's okay to be shameless at the beginning, and it doesn't matter if you pretend to be a grandson. Now, he is accumulating strength for the future outbreak. And the non-commissioned officer education system he promoted is the basis for his outbreak. These non-commissioned officers began to receive the simplest Q training as early as elementary school. After graduating from elementary school, they entered the non-commissioned officer school and began to train combat skills. By the age of 18, the two batches of 2,000 non-commissioned officers had all become military talents with extremely solid military basic skills. Of course, they lacked experience and prestige. It would be absolutely difficult to convince the public if they were arranged to serve as chief officers in the army at this time. You know, even the Huanpu student army established its confidence and prestige by defeating Qin Jiongming. Therefore, Marin did not intend to force the growth of seedlings, but to let them serve as deputies to those old officers first. First learn how to control the troops, and then try other things. A few years later, as those old officers gradually aged, they also served as adjutants for several years and had enough qualifications to serve as chief officers. And when they were in their prime, the religious war was about to break out, which gave them the opportunity to show their talents. However, not everyone is suitable to be an officer. To be an officer, one must not only have solid military skills and knowledge, but also the ability to convince the public. If a person who cannot convince the public is allowed to serve as an officer, then the army may be difficult to manage well. Therefore, Marin did not let all 2,000 cadets serve as adjutants at the grassroots level of the army and take over as chief officers in the future. He assessed these 2,000 people. In addition to assessing basic military skills and knowledge, he also assessed management ability and prestige. A person who can establish prestige among cadets can also establish prestige in the army. Prestige can also be called aura. People with strong aura can make others unconsciously convinced of him and willing to accept his leadership. Some people who are too introverted may be suitable for being civil servants, but they are definitely not suitable for managing those big soldiers. The big soldiers in the army, especially the veterans, are very slippery. They are used to looking at people and serving them. When they meet people with strong aura, they will listen to their orders honestly. If they meet a weak officer, these old oils will have all kinds of small actions. Not everyone is suitable to be an officer, and similarly, not everyone is suitable to be a teacher. The two are actually very similar in some aspects, especially in management. Some teachers are obviously very talented, but because they can't control their students, the classroom is noisy and no one can study at ease. This is not a problem of personal level, but a problem of management ability, which is related to personal character and aura. The same is true for officers. If they manage a purely recruited army, it's better. If you encounter a unit with many veterans and your aura is not strong enough, you will be backfired. Therefore, when Marin selected military adjutants from these 2,000 people, in addition to knowledge and skills, he also looked at prestige. Those who have high prestige, aura, and can convince others will be selected first. Aura is mostly innate. Some people are born with strong auras, but they can convince others with poor abilities. For example, Liu Bang, a little gangster, was obviously a straw bag, but he united talented big men such as Xiao He and Qiao Shen around him, laying the foundation for the establishment of the Han dynasty. And those who have no aura, even if they are full of knowledge, can only work for others. Perhaps, this is the so-called turtle spirit. Therefore, when Marin selected officers from 2,000 non-commissioned officers, he gave priority to those with strong auras of turtle spirit. And Marin did not give up on those who were eliminated. Because he formed a new team with these 1,000 people, the Young Guards. Chapter 1751 The difference between the old and new armies. To be honest, it is extremely luxurious in this era to form an army composed purely of non-commissioned officers with high cultural quality. But Marin doesn't care, because the North Sea has promoted compulsory education throughout the country, and thousands of non-commissioned officers graduate every year. In the future, even if half of the thousands of non-commissioned officers are selected as adjutants in the army every year, 500 people will be left to join the youth guards. Because there will be no shortage of people in the future, there will be no luxury. How terrible is an army composed purely of non-commissioned officers with extremely solid military skills? In this era, it is probably the elite of the elite. Learn about the Huanpu student army that defeated the warlords. Moreover, this unit has been educated in a military style since childhood, unlike Huanpu students, who only received 1 or 2 years of education in their youth. In terms of professionalism, this student army is many times more professional than the Huanpu student army. In the future, Marin plans to make the youth guards the real trump card of the North Sea, replacing the First Corps and becoming the most capable army in the North Sea. After all, the First Corps is mainly mercenaries, and its reliability is not very strong. This group of people can fight a favorable battle, but if the North Sea Kingdom encounters difficulties and cannot even afford the commission, it is difficult to say that these people from the southern German mountainous areas are loyal. Only this group of young non-commissioned officers who have been brainwashed since childhood will remain loyal to the North Sea Kingdom and Marin as always. And Marin is not bad for them. Because of full trust, Marin intends to equip this trustworthy non-commissioned officer unit with new firearms that use rotatable single-headed bullets, making it the most powerful army in the North Sea. Previously, Marin had drawn 100 older non-commissioned officers, late to school, from the young non-commissioned officers to form a young sharpshooter unit, all of which use single-headed bullets with long range and high accuracy. However, the scale of this army is too small to have enough impact on large-scale wars. Therefore, Marin formed a non-commissioned officer unit of thousands of people this time to replace the original small-scale troops. Thousands of sharpshooters are enough to tear a huge gap in the enemy's formation, making it easier for the army's assault soldiers to defeat the enemy. After using smokeless gunpowder, the effective range of the steel core single-headed bullet can reach about 200 meters. It should be pointed out that this 200 meters can be aimed and shot, unlike a smoothbore gun, where the hit rate is halved after 50 yards and bullets fly around after 70 yards, with no hit rate at all. In the previous battlefield against the 8-power Allied forces, Marin's 100 young sharpshooters actually appeared. However, because of their limited number, they can only be used to attack the enemy's artillery positions and kill as few enemy artillery as possible. Although it played a big role, it did not play a decisive role in the overall situation of the war. Because, for many armies, artillery is not important. Even if the artillery is exhausted, it may not affect the combat effectiveness of those armies where artillery is not important. At most, it only forms a certain deterrent to the enemy. The situation of thousands of sharpshooters is quite different. 1,000 sharpshooters can kill at least several hundred enemies with one round of volley fire. After 2 or 3 rounds of shooting, more than 2,000 people can be killed. What is the concept of more than 2,000 enemies? In an army of 10,000 people, more than 2,000 people are equivalent to more than 20% of the soldiers. As for the ancient army, most armies are prone to collapse after more than 10% of the personnel are injured or killed. If the casualties are more than 20%, the probability of collapse is very high. Even for an army of more than 20,000, more than 2,000 people have reached the critical point of collapse of 10%. This is still the first batch. With 1,000 young cadets and the original 100 young sharpshooters, Marin has 1,100 sharpshooters who can accurately kill the opponent within 200 meters. Starting next year, 500 people will be added to the young guards every year. 5 years later, the young guards will have 3,600 sharpshooters. After 2 or 3 rounds of shooting, there will be several thousand casualties. This was a huge amount of casualties that any European army of that era could not bear. Even the Ming Dynasty army, which could easily reach hundreds of thousands of troops, could not withstand such casualties. Because most of the Ming Dynasty troops were just making up the numbers, and the only ones who could really fight were the servants and personal soldiers that the generals focused on training. The rest of the people were just following behind the elite composed of these servants and personal soldiers. It was okay to fight a favorable battle, but if it was an unfavorable battle, as long as the servants and personal soldiers were severely damaged, the others would inevitably collapse. The largest personal soldier group of the Ming Dynasty, Li Qingliang's family cavalry team, Liaodong Iron Cavalry, had only 3,000 elite cavalry. Later, Li Rusong relied on these thousands of cavalry to beat Toyotomi Hideyoshi severely in Korea. Generally speaking, to deal with the Ming army, which could easily reach tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, as long as their most core thousands of people, or even only a few hundred people, were crippled, the others would be sent to their heads. Not to mention the Ming army, even the European army was similar. Generally speaking, the first 3 rows of European mercenaries were the most elite. Historically, the first 3 rows of German mercenaries were all veterans, who usually wore half armor and iron helmets. These veterans were elite, well-equipped, and had the strongest combat effectiveness. Those hiding behind the battle formation were often the old, weak, sick, and new recruits, and their combat effectiveness was very average. Even the Swiss mercenaries who crisscrossed Europe were similar. Therefore, in the Battle of Lübeck, Marin sent a large army to attack the old, weak, sick, and new recruits of the Swiss mercenaries from the rear, causing chaos in the Swiss battle formation and leading to the Swiss' final defeat and surrender. Therefore, the European army was actually similar. As long as the elites in the first 3 rows were killed, the ones behind were basically sent. This was the common problem of the ancient army: unbalanced strength and too much reliance on elites. This situation changed after the army began to modernize and even modernize. Because a unified drill manual was used to train the entire army, everyone's training level was generally not much different. Of course, there were elites, but the strength of most armies was relatively average, and their ability to fight independently was good. After all, even platoon leaders in later generations were trained in professional military academies. In this way, a modern army, a single unit, can be pulled out to perform tasks independently. For example, while attacking a provincial capital, the modern army is fully capable of dividing several regiments to sweep nearby medium-sized cities, without having to wait for the army to conquer the provincial capital and then remove them one by one. But the ancient army was different. A small number of elites led the entire army. The rest of the troops, without the elite leading the way, many would not fight. They can only wait for the main force to conquer a certain place, and then the elite will lead the way to conquer other places. The same is true for Marin's North Sea army. Because of the fear that small-scale troops cannot complete the task independently, Marin basically acts according to the legion during combat, and rarely sends out phalanxes or even companies to perform tasks alone. Unless it is just a task of going to the countryside to collect grain or looting, which is not a hard battle. The newly formed young guards of Marin are different. Here, every soldier is an elite with thinking ability. Even if they are split into multiple 100-man teams, each 100-man team has the ability to perform combat tasks alone. Moreover, they have good understanding and execution. After all, these young men have received many years of military education, and their execution ability is absolutely impeccable. The secret lies in the different abilities of grassroots officers. Many of the grassroots team leaders in Marin's current legions are illiterate. If there are senior generals commanding on the spot, they can still lead the army. If they are given a task and asked to lead their respective teams to perform the task alone, they will definitely be at a loss. In modern armies, every team leader is an educated professional, and their execution ability is by no means comparable to those grassroots officers. What's more, the non-commissioned officers of the Young Guards have received many years of military education, and they are not ordinary professionals. Chapter 1752, just a defective product. In the Beihai National Army, 1,000 non-commissioned officers were arranged to serve as deputy positions in the army, which did not cause unrest. After all, Marin had greeted them a long time ago, and many people knew that there would definitely be such a day. Moreover, Marin also made it clear that these non-commissioned officers were too young to take on the main responsibility all at once. They will learn for many years from the old officers who are now promoted by military merit, and then they will take over when someone retires due to age. In addition, these 1,000 people mainly serve as deputy captains and company captains of the squad, who are grassroots officers and do not touch the interests of those nobles. In fact, Marin has preferential treatment for the military nobles of the Beihai Kingdom. The children of military nobles who are knighted for military merits go to higher level schools than the schools for civilian children. At least, the teaching staff is different. For example, most of the schools attended by these 2,000 non-commissioned officers are taught by wounded retired junior officers or even soldiers. These instructors themselves have little culture, and they can't read many military textbooks themselves, let alone teach those civilian children non-commissioned officers. In the special school for noble children in Auric, the military theory courses are taught by middle and senior generals, and the difference in teaching staff is not ordinary. Therefore, Marin eliminated half of the 2,000 non-commissioned officers. In addition to personal character and aura, poor military theory foundation is also one of the important reasons. After all, a general's lecture and a veteran's lecture are two completely different concepts. Moreover, when allocating official positions, in addition to grades, when the grades are similar, noble children should also be given priority to higher positions. For example, this time the main arrangements are squad adjutants and company adjutants. Generally, those who are arranged as company adjutants are noble children with good grades. As for the children of civilians, only a few with very excellent grades will be arranged as company adjutants like the children of nobles, and will take over as company commanders in the future. The starting point is much higher than those squad adjutants. According to the difference in the number of people under their jurisdiction, the difference between the two is 10 times. Because a squad has only 25 people, and a company has 250 people. There is no objection to the 1,000 excellent students being selected as grassroots officers and adjutants in the North Sea. After all, the North Sea Army has long been accustomed to the difference from the old army. A corps commander like Steindorf, who was born a civilian, is completely impossible in other countries. But for the remaining 1,000 non-commissioned officers, being organized into a separate army by Marin made many officers jealous. They are all high-achieving students who have received 10 years of education. Everyone understands being an officer, but what about being an ordinary soldier? Even Schwartz expressed dissatisfaction with Marin's separate army of the remaining 1,000 non-commissioned officers. What they are dissatisfied with is that it is too extravagant to let so many educated, high-achieving students serve as big soldiers. You know, in this era, the literacy rate in Europe is extremely low, only about 1%. Moreover, priests account for a large proportion of them. After all, people also need culture to preach. In such an environment, every scholar who has studied for many years is a treasure. In some small places, these scholars, even the children of commoners, will be hired by local officials to serve as bookkeepers, equivalent to secretaries, or ancient Chinese teachers. After all, in ancient Europe, commoners could not be officials. But the children of nobles are not all academic masters, and there are many more who are unlearned than academic masters. After they become officials, they need educated people to help. In addition, they share their workload. And those educated children of commoners who serve as bookkeepers of nobles are not without benefits. With the opportunity to access those official documents, they have a lot of opportunities to get benefits for themselves. Even the whole family can follow. After all, the identity of the people around the officials is also very powerful. One person gets the way, and the chickens and dogs rise to heaven. This is where Schwartz and others are dissatisfied. These are all educated, high-achieving students. Even if they can't serve as officers, it's not bad to be thrown into the local area as a bookkeeper or something. Why waste talents like this? How could Marin not know this? But the talents cultivated by Beihai National School are not only these people, but also college students. When those college students graduate, they will be the core of politics. These non-commissioned officers with average cultural level are indeed slightly better than the current official clerks. But compared with the college students who will graduate in 2 years, they are not worth mentioning. After all, the first batch of college students are the best group of people selected from the first batch of elementary school graduates. Therefore, although it is a bit of a waste to use this batch of non-commissioned officers as soldiers, Marin does not feel bad. Because there will be more powerful college students in the future. It is not a pity to waste a few non-commissioned officers. Moreover, the grades of these eliminated non-commissioned officers are not good. It is not all their fault, but when Marin founded the folk craftsman school to train the children of civilians, he could not find qualified teachers, so he just made do with it casually. Many semi-literate people who can only read a little were also pulled into the craftsman school as cultural teachers. It would be strange if they could teach powerful students. But there is no way. When Marin just got the East Frisian county, there were only tens of thousands of people in the country, and the literacy rate was 1%. That is to say, there were only a few hundred literate people in the country at that time, not counting the poor students among these hundreds of people. And most of these literate people worked in the government and the church. Therefore, you can imagine how many people can serve as teachers. To be frank, most of the teachers in the artisan school were basically just making up the numbers, and their level was very poor. It was considered excellent to be able to recognize all the words in the Bible. Under such a background, you can imagine what kind of students were trained. In Marin's eyes, the first few students were just semi-finished products of education, belonging to defective products. Only when the first batch of college students came out and Beihai had teachers with a solid cultural foundation, the students trained in the future could be considered real finished products. Of course, it is not necessary to have college students. For example, Beihai actually established a secondary technical normal school. That is, after 3 years of junior high school, the best batch was selected to go to high school and university. Then, the rest went to secondary technical normal school. After graduation, go to the countryside to be a primary school teacher or something. Because they were eliminated once after graduating from primary school, the group of people who studied in technical secondary normal schools were not poor students, but had average grades. They may not be able to teach junior high school, but they are more than enough to teach primary school. Now, the first batch of students from technical secondary normal schools are almost graduating. In the future, Beihai will have professional primary school teachers, instead of just pulling someone who knows a few words to be a teacher. As for the previous batch of unqualified teachers, Marin plans to give them a sum of money as severance pay. After all, they will not be used in the future. Of course, this group of people has also played an important role in the education of Beihai. Marin will definitely arrange good jobs for them and will not treat them unfairly. For example, they can be arranged to work as accountants in the manor. Marin remembered that every village in the future will have a special accountant to calculate the statistics of money and grain. Although these eliminated teachers have a poor cultural level, they can at least write and calculate. Arranging them as accountants in the manor is also a good use of people. To put it bluntly, Marin was disgusted by the low cultural level of the first batch of cadets. In his eyes, these first batches of cadets, not to mention their military capabilities, could only be considered defective products in terms of cultural education and were not necessarily better than the later generations of scumbags. It was too much of a stretch to use them as cultural people. But it was a bit of a waste to leave them unused. After all, they were considered cultural people in this era. Therefore, it was most appropriate to use them to form a high-quality elite army. Chapter 1753, Personal Action. In fact, this group of cadets who were considered defective by Marin were already very good. At least, they had mastered the commonly used words and understood many military terms. In this era, they may not be comparable to those geniuses, but they are definitely qualified to be called talents. These cadets may have average thinking ability, but they have a good grasp of basic knowledge. In East Frisia, there were originally 10,000 primary school students in the first year. But when the third grade was promoted to the fourth grade, an exam was conducted, and 4,000 people were eliminated. Those 4,000 people were the real scumbags. Many people could not recognize all the words, and they could not calculate simple addition, subtraction, multiplication and division. Even so, those 4,000 people were snatched away by many craftsmen as apprentices. After all, they can also write and calculate simply, which is much better than those apprentices who have no cultural foundation at all. Of course, of the 4,000 people who were eliminated, only the front part was worth training, and the back part was better than the illiterate ones. After that, after the remaining 6,000 people graduated from elementary school, only 2,000 continued to study, and the remaining 4,000 were eliminated. But strictly speaking, these 4,000 people are no longer considered bad students, but average students of this era. As mentioned above, Marin felt that they were worse than the bad students in later generations. It's not that they are stupid, but because they are dragged down by unprofessional teachers. After all, many of the first batch of teachers in Beihai Kingdom were very bad in themselves. In terms of talent, these non-commissioned officers are not very talented, but not low, and belong to the average level. Each of them can write a smooth composition. Although the words are not beautiful enough and the words are very immature, they can definitely express the meaning clearly. And those who can't express the meaning clearly in their essays will be eliminated and they are promoted from the 3rd grade to the 4th grade. Like the education Marin received in his previous life, this group of Beihai elementary school students also started writing diaries in the 2nd grade and writing essays in the 3rd grade. The requirements for diaries are very low, just a few sentences are enough, just record the running accounts. The requirements for essays are higher, and you need to write articles with fluent language and clear meaning. It is not required to have literary talent, but only to be able to explain things clearly. This is very important in the army and can be used when writing war reports. With this level, you can also be competent for clerical work when you go to the local area. As for literary talent, I am afraid that only civil servants in the Ming dynasty pursue those in this era. The literacy rate in Europe is already very low, and the requirement for officials is to be able to write documents and reports with fluent language and clear meaning. It just happens to be the minimum requirement for these non-commissioned officers. In fact, other nobles in the North Sea Kingdom are very surprised that everyone in this group of non-commissioned officers can write articles with fluent language and clear meaning. Therefore, Schwartz and others think that it is a waste for Marin to let them serve as soldiers. Only Marin, a time traveler, who is used to seeing college students in later generations, will be so picky and demanding. But this can't be considered wrong, because Marin is confident that after a new batch of teachers are trained to replace those unprofessional temporary rural teachers, the education of the North Sea will be greatly improved, and talents that will satisfy Marin, the traverser, will be trained. Therefore, Marin would rather wait for a few years than release this group of defective, non-commissioned officers, so as not to lower the standards for nothing and make it difficult to deal with in the future. After the new youth guards were successfully formed, Marin was also very excited. Because none of these 1,000 people have poor comprehension. After all, they are also people who have experienced elimination. Although the teaching staff is poor, being able to survive the high elimination rate of 40% proves that the qualifications are still good. At least, it is better than the illiterate mountain people recruited by Marin from southern Germany. Because of the importance of these little guys, Marin personally went out to train. To be honest, since becoming the Grand Duke of the North Sea, Marin has never personally trained the army again. But because of the particularity of this army, Marin made an exception and personally served as an instructor. Sure enough, Marin felt very comfortable during the training. Because these cadets were so cooperative. As long as Marin gave any instructions, he didn't have to explain it a second time or even several times, and these cadets could complete his requirements without compromise. Of course, they originally had a background of 10 years of military education, and they were not unfamiliar with the orders in the army. For example, in shooting, few people missed the human-shaped target within 50 yards. Although the human-shaped target has a large area, it is not easy to miss the target when shooting with a smoothbore gun within 50 yards. After all, the characteristics of the smoothbore gun are there, which is not conducive to aiming and shooting. With this good foundation, the next thing will be easy to handle. Marin asked the Beihai National Military Factory to take out a batch of the best quality flint guns, all of which have thickened barrel walls. The reason for the thickening of the barrel wall is mainly to prevent the explosion of the barrel. After all, if smokeless gunpowder is used, the chamber pressure during shooting is higher than that of black gunpowder. If you don't use a firmer barrel, it is easy to have problems. As for the problem that the thickening of the tube wall makes the musket heavier, it is not a big deal. Because these teenagers have been trained to hold the gun since they were young, and they can not only hold the musket, but also hold the hand without shaking. When they were in elementary school, they were still young and could not hold the real gun. Therefore, in the military class in elementary school, the children stood at attention with wooden sticks that were supposed to be muskets, and held the sticks motionlessly to aim and shoot. After several years of training, naturally few people had hand tremors, which was very conducive to accurate shooting. When they reached the NCO school stage, equivalent to the junior high school stage, when they were practicing holding the gun and standing at attention, the instructors would tie a small brick to the front end of their wooden sticks, adult soldiers directly tied a hole or even several bricks to the muzzle of the gun, to exercise their arm strength and prevent hand tremors when shooting. You know, when shooting, as long as the muzzle moves a little bit, the deviation after shooting may be very large. The impact may not be too great for 10 meters or 20 meters, but for shooting over 100 meters, if the muzzle shakes a little, it is impossible to hit the target, even if it is a huge human-shaped target. Therefore, hanging bricks from the muzzle of a gun, in addition to exercising the arm strength of holding a gun, is mainly to exercise the ability to hold a gun steadily. Only when the gun body is as still as possible at the moment of shooting, can it be possible to shoot more accurately. After 10 years of training, even soldiers with low talent will not be much worse in shooting level. And those who are really shaking hands like patients with cerebral thrombosis were eliminated as early as when they graduated from elementary school. At the beginning, 4,000 people were eliminated from 6,000 elementary school graduates, and only 1,000 were sent to the non-commissioned officer school. At that time, special elimination was carried out. Those who are born with shaking hands when holding a gun are not suitable to be musketeers, so they must be eliminated naturally. But they also have a future, because they are snatched away by various factories in the North Sea to be apprentices. After all, they are also considered to be high-achieving students of this era with culture. Therefore, the non-commissioned officers who stayed in the end all have good shooting talents. At least, after a few years of training, they can reach a good level. In this way, Marin arranged them to be sharpshooters, which is also considered to be the best use of people. After the clockwork flintlock guns with a total weight of 5 kilograms, the standard flintlock gun weighs 9 pounds, or 4 kilograms, were issued, no one complained about the weight of the guns. After all, they practiced hanging bricks from the muzzle every day in the NCO school, and they had already developed a pair of unicorn arms. Marin did not treat these guys badly in the NCO school. Especially in terms of meat, because they had a large amount of training, Marin specially allowed them to eat meat every day. Even the First Legion did not have such treatment. Of course, most of the meat here is fish. After all, fish is cheap. If it were pork, beef or mutton, Marin couldn't afford it. And there is no competition from other countries' fishing boats for fish these days. The medium-sized fishing boats of the North Sea Kingdom crisscross the North Sea fishing grounds, and the supply of fish is very sufficient. Since Marin introduced the pickling technology of Chinese cabbage and sauerkraut. From the Ming dynasty, sauerkraut fish has become a standard dish often eaten by young men in the NCO school. Because of eating sauerkraut fish every day, many NCOs now feel like vomiting when they see sauerkraut fish, they really eat too much. In addition to personally serving as an instructor to train these NCOs, Marin also made an exception and took out the sleeve bayonet that only appeared in the 18th century, so that these NCOs can practice assassination. Chapter 1754, Sleeve Bayonet. The sleeve bayonet probably appeared at the end of the 17th century. It was invented and promoted by the French. Although there had been classical bayonets that inserted broken spears into the barrel for stabbing before, that kind of bayonet was very poor in practicality. Once the spearhead pierced the enemy's body, it was difficult to pull it back. Because when it was pulled back, the broken spear and the barrel were separated. Once this happened, the musketeer would lose the ability to fight back and give the enemy a head. Therefore, although the prototype of the bayonet that inserted the broken spear into the barrel appeared in the 16th century, it was very poor in practicality. It was not until 1703 that French Marshal Vauban promoted the sleeve bayonet with a clip in the French army, and the bayonet really had mature combat capabilities. In the Battle of the Bayerbach River that broke out that year, the entire French army charged with bayonets and defeated the Prussian army, which had just been promoted to a kingdom at that time. In the past, Marin had always kept the bayonet as a confidential technology and had never been willing to release it. But later Marin figured it out. Although the bayonet was a good technology, in this era, the bayonet technology was actually not that important. Because, in this era, the spearmen had not yet withdrawn from the stage of history, and they were still the main force of the armies of various countries. With the presence of spearmen, the role of bayonets was actually very small. The reason why the bayonet was so popular in the late 17th century and the 18th century was mainly because the spearmen had withdrawn from the stage of history at that time. Without the suppression of the spear, the musketeers equipped with bayonets were naturally more ferocious than the musketeers without bayonets on the other side. Therefore, it is actually wrong to regard the bayonet as a magic weapon for victory in many novels. Of course, this refers to Europe where spearmen were popular. If you travel back to the Ming and Qing dynasties, the bayonet is really useful. Because, in the Ming and Qing armies, there were fewer long weapons, but there were many swords and muskets. In the face of swords and muskets, the musketeers with bayonets are indeed more advantageous. Why? The musketeers with bayonets are naturally longer than swords. As the saying goes, an inch longer is an inch stronger, plus the stabbing is more lethal than the chopping, so it is naturally powerful. As for the musketeers of the Ming and Qing dynasties, they are even more advantageous. After all, a matchlock gun that is too late to be reloaded is just a fire stick. In the Battle of Zhenjiang fought by the British Army during the Opium War, the bannermen guarding Zhenjiang mainly used waist knives. This thing is very common in pigtail dramas, and it is also light and beautiful. However, this thing is more than enough to suppress the common people, and using it on the battlefield is to seek death. Even if you have practiced swordsmanship, you will still have to suffer in the face of an opponent with bayonets. After all, the battlefield is not a one-on-one duel. You can use a waist knife to push away a spear, but you can't resist other spears stabbing from the side. Of course, there are also spearmen in the Qing army. But the spears used by the Qing army are not as long as European spears, and the spearmen in the Qing army are out-and-out cannon fodder soldiers, purely to make up the numbers and wave flags and shout. Therefore, those Qing army spearmen obviously have an advantage in weapons, but because the people who use them are not good, they can't beat the bayonets of British soldiers. As for those elite bannermen who were skilled in martial arts, their martial arts skills were wasted because they liked to use the high-end waist knives. Just like Napoleon said, 2 Mamluk cavalrymen can definitely defeat 3 French cavalrymen, 100 French cavalrymen and 100 Mamluk cavalrymen are evenly matched, but 300 French cavalrymen can generally defeat 300 Mamluk cavalrymen, and 1,000 French cavalrymen can always defeat 1,500 Mamluk cavalrymen. They were restrained in weapons, and even if the bannermen under Hai Ling were the rare elites of that era, they could hardly resist the bayonet formation of the British army. Of course, it does not mean that all the bannermen under Hai Ling used waist knives, they also used matchlock guns. But those who used matchlock guns were even worse, because the Qing army matchlock guns did not have bayonets, and they could only be beaten when they encountered the British bayonet charge. However, those bannermen who had close combat capabilities used waist knives. There was no way. The Qing army officers and elites loved to use waist knives, and waist knives were also a symbol of status in the Qing army. The Ming army was similar, because iron and steel smelting was very developed in the Ming dynasty, and the supply of iron and steel was extremely sufficient. Therefore, the Ming army also had an adequate supply of swords. For example, the embroidered spring knife of the Jinyui and the Yenling knife of the Ming army were already very popular and famous. Therefore, the bayonet did make a difference in the Ming and Qing dynasties. This was caused by the characteristics of the times, but if you try with a bayonet in the early Tang dynasty, the Modeo formation can definitely kill the bayonet formation in seconds. There is no other reason, they are just longer than you. In other words, the sleeve bayonet is not particularly powerful in this era. After all, in a fight, the bayonet formation cannot beat the spear formation. But the bayonet is not useless. At least, with the bayonet, the musketeer has the ability to counterattack. Unlike before, when there was no time to reload ammunition, the musketeer without a bayonet was a fish that could be slaughtered at will. After the sleeve bayonet was installed, the musketeer could become a type of soldier that could act alone, and no longer necessarily needed the protection of the spearman. As for the problem of not being able to fight with the pikemen, as long as you are not stupid, you will not let the musketeers fight with the opponent's pikemen. The correct way to open it should be, if you see that the opponent is a pikeman, shoot the opponent from a distance. If you see that the opponent is a musketeer, charge with a bayonet. In short, there is no one trick on the battlefield, and adapting to local conditions is the kingly way. But no matter what, the sleeve bayonet that Marin took out still amazed everyone. The sleeve bayonet is very simple to put on the bayonet. As long as there is a protruding clip near the muzzle, there is a corresponding notch at the bottom of the sleeve bayonet. When putting on the bayonet, the notch at the bottom of the bayonet is inserted along the clip, and then twisted. The clip just catches the turning part of the notch, and the bayonet is tightly stuck on the muzzle. In this way, the bayonet will not fall off, and it can be used for fighting with confidence. It is different from the bayonet of the later generations, because an iron rod is inserted under the barrel of this era to facilitate ammunition loading. Therefore, in order not to affect the extraction and insertion of the iron cleaning rod, the sleeve bayonet is not hung below the muzzle after it is fixed, but on the side of the muzzle. In this way, it will not affect the musketeer to extract the iron cleaning rod to load ammunition. Moreover, this bayonet is really a bayonet. In order to prevent the soldier's hand from being cut by the bayonet when loading ammunition at the muzzle. Therefore, the sleeve bayonets in the early years often had no blades. At least, the part near the muzzle was not sharpened. In this way, it can prevent the soldier's hand from being accidentally cut when loading ammunition. Only the front part of the bayonet, far away from the muzzle, is sharpened. The musketeer and others fight with bayonets, and they also rely on the front edge and the tip of the knife to fight with people, and injure or even kill the enemy. And as a traverser, Marin naturally knows how to kill the enemy more efficiently. Therefore, the sleeve bayonet of the North Sea Kingdom has a deep blood groove. Once the enemy is stabbed by the bayonet, blood will gush out of the blood groove. Then, the enemy who was stabbed would bleed to death very quickly. In fact, the triangular bayonet of later generations was based on this principle. But the triangular bayonet was troublesome, so Marin simplified it by only opening 2 deep blood grooves on both sides of the ordinary bayonet. Chapter 1755, Stab Training. Because it uses a twist-type clip that is very common in later generations, this bayonet is very fast to put on. Before putting on the bayonet is inserted into the scabbard at the waist. When necessary, the bayonet can be taken out and used as a dagger. After all, the front end of the bayonet is also sharp. When putting on the bayonet, just pull out the bayonet from the scabbard from the waist and put the iron ring with a notch at the end of the knife into the front end of the barrel. Then, the only notch on the iron ring is inserted from the front sight, and then twist and lift it, and the sleeve bayonet is very firmly installed on the muzzle, and the bayonet is put on very quickly. Therefore, when shooting, sharpshooters do not need to put on the bayonet in advance. Instead, they can shoot with peace of mind first, and it is not too late to put on the bayonet when the enemy approaches. Anyway, putting on the bayonet is just a matter of one set, one twist, and one lift. If you load ammunition with a bayonet, the musketeer will inevitably have to pay attention to not being injured by the bayonet, which is a bit of a hindrance. In fact, Marin also knew the principle of the later bayonet. However, that requires the use of spring latches, which in this era requires high processing and cost requirements. Therefore, Marin simply used a sleeve bayonet that was not very beautiful, which did not affect the use anyway. In this era, it was stupid to use a bayonet and a spear. Therefore, Marin never considered letting musketeers and spearmen poke each other. The real opponent of the bayonet is those who hold segment weapons or use two-handed swords. In particular, the two-handed sword is very popular in the field of close combat in Europe. Spearmen can only appear on the battlefield, because European spears are several meters long and it is extremely inconvenient to move around. A single person using this kind of spear is far less flexible than a two-handed sword. As long as the first stab of the spear is separated, the spearman will wait to be slaughtered by the two-handed swordsman. Only when rows of spearmen cover each other and the spears are like forests, it is of practical value. Generally speaking, if it is a small-scale conflict or street fighting, the two-handed sword is more powerful. The main opponent of the bayonet is the two-handed sword. Therefore, when designing the bayonet, Marin's first requirement was that the total length of the rifle and the bayonet must not be shorter than the two-handed sword, so as not to suffer a disadvantage in the stabbing. The total length of the North Sea clockwork ignition rifle is generally about 1.4 meters. Therefore, it is enough as long as the bayonet protrudes 30 centimeters from the barrel. But together with the ring and handle at the back, the total length of the bayonet reaches 50 centimeters, which is half a meter. In other words, this bayonet can no longer be considered a dagger, but should be called a dagger. But in order to prevent the musketeer from being cut, the blade of the back half is not sharpened. Only the very short part at the front end is sharpened. Therefore, this bayonet can only be regarded as a long-handled dagger with a length similar to that of a dagger. When they are free, the soldiers will not carry the musket on their bodies, but they can carry a bayonet with a sheath. It can be used for self-defense and as a knife when they are free. For example, it is okay to peel a fruit. Moreover, after the bayonet is installed, the length of the whole gun has reached 1.7 meters. This length is almost the same as the flower spear used in martial arts routines in the red tassel spear. The battle between the two depends purely on the technique. The stabbing technique of the young guards is the PLA bayonet method that Marin saw on the internet in his previous life. This stabbing technique was actually learned from the little devils at the beginning. It is simple and efficient. When Marin just created the mercenary group and fought for the emperor, he promoted this stabbing method. Of course, at that time, the soldiers under Marin practiced stabbing with spears. However, because of the huge difference between spears and bayonets, Marin was also scratching his head during training at that time. He tried many times before he mastered the method of transforming the bayonet technique into a spear stabbing. Among them, the most important difference is probably that when using a spear to stab, you can only use a flick to defend against the opponent's stabbing, instead of using the horizontal gun body commonly used in bayonet fighting to hit the enemy's stabbing. Because the spears in Europe at this time were too long and could not be horizontal at all. Once horizontal, it is easy to hurt teammates. Therefore, the technique of using the rifle barrel to knock away the enemy's weapon in a bayonet fight is useless in a spear stabbing, and it can only be changed to knocking away. After the promotion of the sleeve bayonet, this fighting method of defending against the enemy's stabbing was restored. Marin personally went into battle to demonstrate bayonet fighting. Of course, he used a wooden spear for training, and he wore a wire mesh mask on his head and a double-layer mahjong mat protective suit on his body. When the sergeant on the opposite side raised the training wooden spear and stabbed over, Marin did not push away the opponent's wooden spear, but held the barrel with his left hand, held the gun handle with his right hand, stepped forward with his left foot, and suddenly pushed the back of the wooden spear forward with force, hitting the barrel of the wooden spear stabbed by the opponent at a side angle. Suddenly, the wooden spear of the sergeant who had just raised the wooden spear to stab was offset to one side. Moreover, because Marin bullied himself and gave a lot of force, the sergeant on the opposite side even staggered. Good opportunity. Marin saw his opponent staggering, took another step forward, and continued to hit the opponent's gun with the gun body. The opponent's footsteps were even more unstable. Taking advantage of the opportunity when the opponent was stabilizing his body, Marin immediately turned the wooden gun horizontally and stabbed the opponent with the gun head. There was only a crash sound of wood chips hitting and rubbing, and lime spots were left on the double-layer mahjong mat protective gear worn by the opponent. Obviously, he was defeated. If it was a real assassination, he should have more blood holes on his body at this time, and because of the blood groove, blood would keep gushing out. See? This is the difference between bayonet fighting and spear fighting. Bayonet fighting can block with a horizontal gun, and even if the strength is stronger, it can actively smash the opponent's gun body, making the opponent unstable, so as to find an opportunity to assassinate. Although these non-commissioned officers received military education since childhood, they also practiced stabbing. However, the stabbing they practiced was all spear stabbing at the beginning, which could only push away or block the opponent's spear stab. But it is useless to just deflect the opponent's spear or bayonet. If the opponent is an old hand, the weapon can be quickly reset after being deflected. Even, he can counterattack and deflect your bayonet. Those clanging fights in movies and TV dramas are mostly your sword deflecting my sword, and my sword deflecting your sword. But before you can deflect the opponent's sword, use the empty door to stab the opponent, and the opponent's sword will quickly reset, or even deflect your sword in turn. This kind of horizontal spear hitting the opponent's weapon is different, because it not only smashes your weapon, but also your person. If the weapon is smashed, as long as the lower body is stable, it can be swept back quickly, and even the weapon you want to sneak attack will be immediately deflected. But if the person's footsteps are unstable after being hit, then the problem is big. After being hit, the first step for most people is not to swing the weapon to counterattack, but to stabilize their footsteps. Just now, Marin hit twice in a row, causing the opponent to lose control of his lower body. In a hurry, the opponent's first reaction was not to block Marin's attack with a wooden spear, but to stabilize his footsteps first. Marin took advantage of the opponent's lack of time to block, and stabbed out the wooden spear, killing the opponent in one fell swoop. Moreover, this trick is not only effective against the opponent's bayonet, but also against the opponent's spear. In fact, because of the torque, the spear is more likely to be knocked off course. Once an overly long spear is blocked and knocked off course by the enemy's weapon, the spearman is in danger. Because the spear is too long and difficult to reposition. At this time, if the bayonet man takes the opportunity to bully him, the spearman will be close to death. But this is a one-on-one fight, but if the spearmen line up and fight in a battle formation, the bayonet man will be beaten like a dog. Because if you smash one spear, the other spear will also stab you to death. Chapter 1756 Smallpox. In fact, when fighting in groups, Marin's requirement for the cadets is to learn to take advantage. In addition, try to use 2 or 3 people to deal with one person on the other side to form a regional advantage in numbers. No matter how strong the individual's fighting ability is, it can't withstand a group fight. In addition to solid personal basic skills, the bayonet tactics required by Marin are to learn to steal chickens. For example, if a bayonetist who has just filled in addition to blocking or pushing away the enemy's bayonet with a horizontal gun, you must also pay attention to observe the enemies who are fighting with their comrades. If no one comes to attack you at this time, it is best to sneak attack those unprepared enemies and knock them down one by one. In short, there is definitely an advantage in having more people against fewer people. The opponent can resist your attack, but it is difficult to withstand the simultaneous attack of 2 or even 3 people. In particular, the bayonet is a very insidious and dangerous weapon. When Qi Jiguang dealt with the Japanese pirates, he found that using the 3 talents formation, or 2E formation, to deal with a single Japanese pirate was very effective. Don't be fooled by the name. In fact, one of them holds the opponent, and the other stabs the opponent with a spear from the side. The Japanese swords of the Japanese pirates are blocked by the wolf whip and rattan shield, and it is difficult to resist the spears that suddenly stab out. Similarly, if a bayonet man on the opposite side blocks and parries with you, and the other 2 stab from different directions, it will be extremely difficult to resist. At this time, the only thing that can save you is the armor on your body. But, to be honest, Marin thinks that these stabbing tactics may not be useful. Because, on the battlefield, these young guards will definitely be protected by the spearmen. Practicing stabbing is actually just a precaution to prevent the young guards from having no fighting ability when they are alone. But under normal circumstances, the young guards actually stand in the middle of the hollow square formation and enjoy the protection of national treasures. According to Marin's arrangement, during combat, the young guard sharpshooters will have at least 3 rows of spearmen in front, and a row of Udayo chariots will be placed horizontally in front to prevent the enemy from forcibly charging. As for how the young guard sharpshooters attack the enemy, let's take a look at the bench. According to Marin's requirements, each of these young guard sharpshooters will be equipped with a bench. During combat, they only need to stand on the bench to aim at the enemy over the heads of the first 3 rows of spearmen. In order not to hinder the sharpshooters from aiming at the enemy, the spears of the first 3 rows of spearmen must be placed flat and pointed forward, so as not to lie horizontally in the air and accidentally block the bullets. Needless to say, the spears in the front row can be directly raised and pointed forward. The spears of the last 2 rows were placed directly on the shoulders of the front row soldiers, forming a dense spearhead formation of 3 rows of spears, which looked more difficult than hedgehogs. At this time, after the soldiers of the young guards loaded their ammunition, they could stand on the stools and aim at the enemy's elite from a high place for precise shooting. If there was no shooting mission, they could even sit on the stools to rest. So, in the following training, the generals of the North Sea Kingdom were surprised to see that this group of young guards not only trained with bayonets enthusiastically, but also carried a bench and ran around without anything to do. This reminded Marin of the situation when the village showed movies when he was a child, and the villagers also carried stools to the threshing ground where the movie was shown. Because of this feature, the young guards were later nicknamed the Bench Corps. Because everyone carried a bench and ran around. When fighting, they also stood on the bench to shoot. The funniest thing is that these benches are not only tools, but also weapons. Because in a melee, swinging a bench and smashing it can sometimes be more lethal than a sword. Later, in a battle, when the young guards faced the enemy's spear formation, they first used benches to disrupt the enemy's neat formation, and then took the opportunity to charge with bayonets, and actually won. Of course, these benches were usually placed on carts, not carried by themselves. But before the battle, everyone would receive their own bench to help in the battle. It was a bit extravagant when shooting, because they all used handmade steel-core single-headed bullets for shooting training. These bullets were carefully made of lead bullets with molds by several skilled craftsmen under the arrangement of Marin, and every step was very careful. In particular, the wind grill on the top of the bullet cannot be damaged. Otherwise, it will not be able to rotate after being shot out. The difference between a single-headed bullet that cannot rotate and an ordinary spherical lead bullet is not very big. There is no need to mention the range. Therefore, in order to prevent the wind grill on the top of the soft steel core single-headed bullet from being damaged, each steel core single-headed bullet will be placed in a padded wooden box after it is made to avoid damage. Before each shooting, the shooters would open the tightly packed box and carefully take out the steel core single-headed bullet. When loading, they dared not use too much force, for fear of damaging the wind grid structure on the bullet head. And the shooting effect of this precision bullet is naturally very gratifying. At a distance of 200 meters, as long as there is no accident, they can hit the human-shaped target. And this heavy lead bullet, as long as it hits the target, not to mention a single shot to kill, but as long as it is hit, the person will be ruined. After all, the bullet is so big. Just when Marin was busy training the young guards, suddenly the North Sea spy in Italy sent back a very terrible new smallpox broke out in Italy. It broke out in Venice, and its source came from the Greek region occupied by Turkey. After entering May, this warm season, not only everything grows, but even the virus has become active. For some reason, smallpox suddenly broke out in the Thrace region in northeastern Greece. Originally, this had nothing to do with Italy. But the Venetian merchant ships were all over the eastern Mediterranean. When a merchant ship passed by the port of Kavala in Thrace, the sailors on the ship went ashore and brought back the smallpox virus. But the people on the ship did not find it at the time, because the sailors' smallpox was lurking and did not break out immediately. After the ship returned to the Dalmatia region of Venice, the Dalmatia region of Croatia belonged to the Republic of Venice in this era, smallpox began to break out and spread rapidly in the Dalmatia region. Fortunately, the governor of the Dalmatia region of Venice, Tolini, had heard of Marin's quarantine and epidemic prevention theory and immediately ordered the isolation of all areas in Dalmatia where people who had contact with smallpox patients were located. Moreover, quicklime was sprinkled everywhere in the epidemic area for disinfection. Originally, this matter would have ended here, and the smallpox epidemic area would have been controlled in the Dalmatia region. However, Tolini didn't know what he was thinking. He was probably extremely hostile to Spain for robbing Venice's spice trade. He actually sent a few people who had smallpox and sent a group of smallpox patients to quietly land in the Naples area. Moreover, he landed in a small fishing village only a few dozen kilometers away from Mount Vesuvius. Obviously, Turini wanted to spread smallpox in the Naples war zone and use smallpox to destroy the Spanish army. Turini knew very well how the French army was defeated in the First Italian War. The French army was not defeated in the war, but was defeated by syphilis. This time, he planned to use smallpox to infect the Spanish troops stationed in the Mount Vesuvius area. Then, he would severely hit Spain, the enemy that robbed Venice's spice business. However, Turini played a big game. Because once smallpox spread, it would not only be the Spaniards who would be harmed. Chapter 1757 The Angry Pope. Sure enough, after smallpox spread to the Kingdom of Naples, it spread to the Papal States before it had time to spread to the Spanish army camp. Why is this so? Because a fishing boat in that small fishing village went ashore at the port outside Rome to purchase supplies when it went out to sea to fish. The fishermen on the boat did not find smallpox when they set out from the fishing village because smallpox was lurking. The incubation period of smallpox is more than 10 days. The fisherman was infected with the smallpox virus by the mysterious person from the village without noticing, and then went out to sea to fish. More than 10 days later, the fishing boat approached the waters near Rome. So, out of necessity, the fishing boat docked and the fisherman went ashore to purchase daily necessities. After the purchase, the fishermen on the boat went to the tavern on the dock to drink for a while and boasted to people for an afternoon. The problem is here. When they purchased supplies, they had a short contact time with people and did not infect people with smallpox virus. But in the tavern, following a group of drunkards close to the table, when they were happy, they hugged each other. Then, the tavern became a virus-infected disaster area. When smallpox broke out in the port area outside Rome, Pope Julius II, who was in Rome, was almost scared to death. Smallpox actually spread to the headquarters of the Holy See. Fortunately, influenced by his son-in-law Marin, Julius II knew how to fight the epidemic. So the Pope ordered a citywide curfew. At the same time, all priests who had survived smallpox were mobilized from all over the country to gather in Rome. After the city was under martial law, all residents were not allowed to go out. The soldiers patrolling the streets also put on full sets of protective clothing and masks. Not only that, 7,000 mercenaries from the North Sea Kingdom were also ordered to carry bags and sprinkle quicklime on the streets and alleys of Rome for disinfection. As for the food supply of the people in various areas, Pope Julius II ordered 87 middle-aged and elderly people who had smallpox to push carts every day to deliver food to various residential areas. When they came back, they had to change their clothes and take a shower as soon as possible to avoid spreading the smallpox virus. After selecting 66 mercenaries who had had smallpox when they were young, Julius II sent these people to block the dock area and began to trace the source of smallpox. With the help of the highly professional spies from the North Sea Kingdom, Julius II finally tracked down the small fishing village called Chimens in Naples and captured several smallpox patients from Dalmatia who were living in seclusion outside the village. At this time, 2 of the 6 smallpox patients sent from Dalmatia had died, and the other 2 were afraid that they could not hold on. However, there were 2 young people who were probably in good health and managed to hold on. Although there were pockmarks on their faces, they survived after all. Moreover, there was no need to worry about smallpox in the future. The people of the Vatican caught the 4 people who were not dead yet, tortured them severely, and soon learned the truth. Although Tolani's original intention was to deal with the Spaniards, this matter endangered the Papal States, which still made Julius II furious. The furious Julius II immediately announced the excommunication of Tolini. Moreover, he strongly demanded that the Republic of Venice extradite this person to the Holy See for trial. Otherwise, the entire Venice will be excommunicated. At the same time, Julius II sent letters to France and Spain, which were at war, informing them of the bad news of the appearance of smallpox in the Kingdom of Naples, and urged them to temporarily cease fire and jointly resist smallpox. Because the smallpox in the village of Chimens has spread from the village to the outside world. After all, the people in the village also have exchanges with the outside world. When the Holy See's punishment decision reached Venice, the Republic of Venice was stunned. Because the Venetian authorities did not know about this at all. At the same time, the Venetians were very dissatisfied with the Pope's overbearing demands. Because the Venetians did not take the Holy See seriously. In the eyes of the Venetians, the Papal States is just one of the Italian states. How can it have the right to order the Venetian officials? Therefore, the members of the Republic of Venice intend to reject the Holy See's request. After all, that is a governor. However, what the Venetian councillors did not expect was that the citizens and merchants of Venice stood on the side of the Holy See this time. Why? The Republic of Venice is a commercial country, and its citizens do business all over Europe. The outbreak of smallpox in other regions will also affect their business. For example, smallpox is now spreading in the Kingdom of Naples, and Venetian merchants dare not go to Naples to do business. In this way, how much profit will be lost? Therefore, the spread of smallpox not only threatens the lives of Venetian merchants, but also seriously affects the business of Venetian merchants. Therefore, more than half of the Venetian merchants jointly wrote a letter requesting the Venetian officials to severely punish Torini's inhumane evil. Otherwise, the merchants will refuse to pay taxes to resist the inaction and carelessness of human lives of the Venetian officials. Soon, the Venetian officials compromised. It is true that they are the top leaders of the Republic of Venice, but they are also elected by the Venetian merchants, not hereditary. Strictly speaking, the top leaders of Venice are just representatives of the interests of the Venetian merchant class. If they refuse the demands of most merchants, not only will they not be able to collect taxes, but they will also lose the next election. In desperation, the Venetian officials could only compromise. However, sending the governor of the country to Rome for trial would hurt the face of the Republic of Venice too much. Because, if Tolini was sent to Rome for trial, he would most likely be burned to death in public. It is very shameful for the governor of a country to be burned to death in public by another country, even if the one who did it was the Pope, the spiritual leader of Europe. However, Venice did not dare to disobey the pressure of public opinion. In addition to the anger of Venice's own residents, other countries also sent people to Venice to protest. Because once smallpox spreads, the whole of Europe will be under great threat. How powerful is smallpox? Just look at Haiti. When Columbus arrived on Haiti, there were 1 million Taino people on the island. But decades later in 1544, due to multiple outbreaks of smallpox, there was no Indian on Haiti, and all died of smallpox. This is not the nonsense lie that the Americans in later generations fooled the world and said that the North American Indians died of smallpox. The North American Indians were killed by the Americans. But the Taino people on Haiti definitely died of smallpox. Because there were 1 million Indians on the island, and the Spanish colonial army had at most 1,000 or 2,000 people. Even if they killed people every day, it would be difficult to kill all 1 million Indians. Moreover, they also wanted Indians as labor. The Spaniards were different from the Americans. In the United States, white people directly plundered the Indians' land and legislated to reward the scalping of Indians. Although the Spaniards were very cruel, they did not kill all the Indians because they had few people. At most, they killed people to establish their authority. Therefore, the death of millions of Taino people on the underwater island could not be caused by the massacre of Spanish colonists. The outbreak of smallpox was more reasonable. Moreover, the Spanish colonization of Haiti was indeed the first time that the Indians came into contact with smallpox, and it was normal for them to lack immunity. As for the boasting of the Americans that most of the Indians died of smallpox, it was pure nonsense. After all, after hundreds of years, the Indians would have some resistance to smallpox and would not be wiped out like the Taino people on Haiti. Moreover, the Indians on Haiti were different from the North American Indians. The Indians on the island of Haiti, millions of people, live on a small island with an area of only tens of thousands of square kilometers. The space is small and it is easy for everyone to be infected. In North America, the territory of the United States alone is more than 9 million square kilometers. How can smallpox spread quickly? In order to spread smallpox, people must first come into contact with each other. However, the productivity of North American Indians is backward, and there is little contact between tribes, so there is no basis for the spread of smallpox. Of course, Europe was different at this time, especially in the Mediterranean region. Maritime trade was developed here, and people's exchanges and trade were very frequent. Once smallpox broke out, even if Europeans had a certain resistance to it, they could not resist it. Only those who had smallpox would not be afraid of smallpox. And those who had not had smallpox were still full of fear of smallpox. What's more, Kong Matsi was able to become the emperor of the Qing dynasty because he had had smallpox and was able to live safely to adulthood, not because he was wise and brave. After all, how can children tell good from bad? Eryueha described Kong Matsi as smart when he was a child in Kangxi dynasty. Which was purely a lie for Kong Matsi. If you go to the kindergarten and see, can you see a few people who were very awesome when they were young? This is pure nonsense. Of course, the Qing dynasty historians also wrote this way. After all, if they didn't write this way, they would be easily killed. Therefore, Tolani's deliberate spread of smallpox was indeed very bad in people's eyes. Because once smallpox spreads, the number of deaths will not be dozens or hundreds, but tens of thousands. Venice merchants, citizens and officials from various countries also realized this, so they collectively put pressure on the Venetian officials to severely punish Torini to prevent the same tragedy from happening again. Even France and Spain, which were at war, sent envoys to Venice to protest and strongly demanded severe punishment for Torini. After all, no one is stupid. If this thing is used on oneself, it will be very terrible. And as the spiritual leader of Europe, Pope Julius II does not want to see this happen again. Therefore, he must kill the chicken to scare the monkey to prevent such a bad thing from happening again. Chapter 1758, Spreading Maliciously Again. Marin was also shocked by the surging public opinion in Europe, because he had thought about using smallpox to harm hostile countries before. Unexpectedly, the reaction of the Holy See and other countries was so strong. If he did this and was discovered, he would probably be in trouble. Thinking of the fate of being hostile to all of Europe, Marin shuddered. However, smallpox broke out, and the opportunity was rare, and Marin didn't want to let it go. After thinking again and again, Marin finally made a decision: this matter can't be done by himself, but you can persuade others to do it. So, Marin sent a very reliable spy, and a spy who had had smallpox, to the Naples area of Italy, secretly instigating the Spaniards to spread smallpox to France. If possible, I hope the French can use this trick to deal with Spain. After all, between France and Spain, Marin is more afraid of Spain, a maritime power with Indian spice trade. However, Marin also knows that the sea power of the Mediterranean west of the Apennine Peninsula is controlled by the Spanish, and it is difficult for the French to spread smallpox to Spain. On the contrary, the Spanish controlled the sea power and could do it easily. But what Marin didn't expect was that before he took action, the Venetians did it for him. Under pressure from all of Europe, the Venetian officials finally decided to severely punish the Dalmatian governor Torini, who spread smallpox privately. However, for the face of the Venetian officials, the Venetian governor and the parliament decided to let Torini commit suicide. In this way, he would avoid being humiliated in Rome, and to a certain extent, it would also save the Venetian officials from embarrassment. Torini knew that he would die, and he was desperate. However, in order to protect his family from being ruined after his death, he made a private deal with the Venetian parliament. The content of the deal was simple: Torini hoped that after his death, the parliament would take good care of his 7-year-old son Tony and protect Torini's Con's family from being bullied and divided. In return, Torini decided to take the infamy and pressure and make a last effort before his death: send someone to spread smallpox to the Spanish mainland. Anyway, before he got into trouble, Tolini was the governor of the Dalmatia province of Venice and had considerable power. Spain certainly controlled the sea power west of the Apennine Peninsula, and the French could not take the sea route at all. But the Venetians were not subject to this restriction, because Venice was confident. Spain is certainly a maritime power, but there is still a certain gap compared to the old maritime power Venice. At least, in the Mediterranean, if the Venetians get angry, the Spaniards can't stand it. After all, the Mediterranean is different from the Atlantic. The sails are the main power in the Atlantic, but in the Mediterranean, because the wind is small and sometimes there is no wind, the paddle boats are the mainstream. It just so happens that Venice is the country with the most paddle boats. If there is a conflict in the windy ocean, Spain may have some confidence. But in the conflict in the Mediterranean, the Venetians will have the upper hand. In addition, in order to blockade the southern coast of France, most of the Spanish warships were sent to the Mediterranean coast of France, and the control over the waters near the coast of Africa in the south was not very strong. Torini's method was very simple, just send a few ships along the coast of North Africa to quietly spread smallpox to the Spanish mainland. Anyway, Torini's infamy was already sealed, and he was about to commit suicide by taking poison. So, why not take advantage of his death to deal with Venice's mortal enemy Spain? The Venetian parliament finally agreed with Torini's approach. After all, they hated Spain too. The spice trade worth millions of gold coins every year was snatched away by Spain and Portugal. How could the Venetians not resent it? The Portuguese were far away in the Atlantic Ocean, and with the Strait of Gibraltar blocking them, the Venetians could not retaliate. However, the Venetians were still happy to retaliate against the Spaniards. What's more, Torini, a dying man, was willing to take all the blame, and they didn't take any risks, so why not do it? After the two sides reached an agreement, Tolani publicly drank the poison that had been prepared long ago in front of the governor's palace in Split, the capital of Dalmatia province, and cursed the enemies of the Venetians, Spain and Portugal, loudly before taking the poison, and claimed that even if he died, he would drag the Spaniards down with him. This was clearly a hint that he was going to deal with Spain and Portugal. In fact, Tolani did send 5 ships to Spain and 1 ship to Portugal. He also wanted to try to trick Portugal, another mortal enemy of the Venetians. As a result, the Portuguese naturally did not trick him. Because the ship was intercepted by Spanish warships in the Strait of Gibraltar. But 3 of the 5 speedboats sent to Spain successfully arrived at the coast of Spain and successfully spread smallpox. Their means of spreading smallpox were simple. They sent people ashore to capture a few local Spanish people, let the smallpox patients kiss these people fiercely, and hug them for a long time. Then, these people were naturally infected with smallpox. And these unfortunate Spaniards who were infected with smallpox still didn't understand what was going on, and thought they had encountered perverts. Because those smallpox patients even kissed men. How could they know that the Venetians believed that kissing was an important means of spreading syphilis? Index, the smallpox patients sent by Tolani, after receiving a large sum of money at home, were willing to act as a death squad and go to Spain to kiss people everywhere. The most serious thing is that they probably also know that the elderly, the weak, the sick and the disabled are more likely to be infected, so they specifically choose the elderly, the weak, the sick and the disabled to kiss. Many old men were tragic and kissed enough by these smallpox patients. In addition, many Spanish women were also kissed. However, these women only thought they had met perverts, and did not know that they were infected with smallpox. Marin also heard about Tolani sending ships to Spain to spread smallpox before his death. After all, in order to take the blame on himself, Tolani publicly said that he would pull the Spaniards to take the blame, and the Venetians did not keep it secret. Therefore, the spies of the North Sea Kingdom in Venice soon learned of this information. Moreover, the North Sea spy accidentally found out the inside story of the news. Tolani had made a request to the Venetian parliament before his death. Marin simply associated it and understood Tolani's plan. Anyway, he was going to die, so he might as well do something before he died, help Venice deal with Spain, and exchange it for the care of the Venetian parliamentarians for the Count's family. After figuring this out, Marin realized that the Spaniards were going to be unlucky. However, Marin was not happy to let the Spaniards be unlucky. If only Spain was unlucky and France was not unlucky, wouldn't the French suppress Spain and take away the Kingdom of Naples? If France stabilized the volcanic ash in Naples, the agricultural output would explode, and the consequences would be serious. Therefore, after thinking about it, Marin decided to send someone to notify Langton, a spy who had been sent to Italy, to tell the Spaniards that Tolani, the governor of Dalmatia in Venice, had sent ships to spread the smallpox virus to the Spanish mainland under the instigation of the French. Spain would be doomed, but if the same method was used to spread smallpox to France, then everyone would be doomed, and the French would not be able to gain an advantage in this war. Chapter 1759, Bewitching. Things went more smoothly than Marin had imagined. After Langton arrived in Italy, he contacted his fellow spies in Rome and got Marin's new instructions, delivered by pigeons. After arriving in the Kingdom of Naples, the Spanish army camp was already in a panic. Fortunately, smallpox had not yet broken out in the Spanish army camp. But in order to prevent the spread of smallpox, Gonzalo de Córdoba ordered that any unknown person was strictly prohibited from approaching the camp, otherwise he would be shot immediately. At the same time, he selected hundreds of people who had had smallpox from the army to be responsible for contact with the outside world of the camp and the transportation of supplies. Like the treatment method in Rome, Gonzalo also strictly prohibited soldiers from going out at will. At the same time, a large amount of quicklime was purchased for disinfection of the camp. And the hundreds of veterans who had had smallpox had to change clothes and take a hot bath for disinfection every time they came back from contact with the outside world. Because Gonzalo studied in the North Sea Kingdom. At the beginning, Marin's self-created Marin phalanx, Spanish phalanx, amazed Europe, so Gonzalo was sent by Spain to learn the phalanx from Marin. At the same time, learn the training methods in Marin's army. Although Marin was reserved to Gonzalo and concealed the most important method of selecting soldiers, everything else was open to Gonzalo to learn. For example, Gonzalo had learned measures to deal with infectious diseases from the North Sea Army. So, in the face of the epidemic, he did a good job. As the commander-in-chief of the Italian War, Gonzalo also adjusted the Spanish warships in the Naples waters. All captains who had not had smallpox were temporarily sent to Sicily. Those captains were temporarily replaced by the first mates, second mates, and third mates who had had smallpox. The person Langton contacted was the acting Captain Morientes on the Spanish warship Sanchez. Morientes was originally only the second mate on the Sanchez. He was a civilian and had no hope of promotion. But the sudden outbreak of smallpox forced the captain and the first mate to take refuge in Sicily. So, he, the second mate of German smallpox, became the acting captain on the warship, responsible for cruising the southern coast of France. At the same time, he occasionally went to Capri Island near Naples to receive new orders from Gonzalo. For example, going to France to catch people or something. Most of the sailors on his ship have been replaced by sailors who have had smallpox. Therefore, they can enter and leave the epidemic area without scruples. Langton sneaked to Capri Island in the middle of the night by boat and met Morientes, who was drinking in the tavern. Morientes was not in a good mood. He was fascinated by the taste of being a captain now, but he knew that once the epidemic was over, he would return to his position as second mate. Like other European countries of this era, Spain is very particular about identity and bloodline. Although the Navy is the branch of the army that least considers bloodline, there is still a ceiling for advancement. For example, a second mate like Morientes, who was born as a fisherman, is almost impossible to be promoted to the position of captain. Not to mention the captain, even the possibility of being promoted to the first mate is not great. It should be pointed out that as managers on the ship, the gap between the second mate and the captain and the first mate is very large. Because the captain is generally a person with rich knowledge, at least a cultured person, and even generally very proficient in astronomy. Not only is he good at choosing routes, but he can also record navigation logs. The first mate is also cultured, and they are actually the captain's substitute. Because sailing in this era is very dangerous, the captain may die of illness at any time, and the first mate is the substitute captain, who is generally cultured and knows how to sail. The second mate is different. The second mate of this era is different from the second mate of later generations. The second mate of later generations is mainly responsible for managing all kinds of navigation instruments and equipment on the ship, and is a person who understands technology. But the second mate of this era did not have any advanced instruments and equipment for him to manage, only managing the sails and stern rudders on the ship. In addition, he also managed the lives of the sailors on the ship. After all, the captain and the first mate are high above and don't manage much. Or, they all tell the second mate to do it. The second mate is generally not necessarily cultured. After all, it is not like managing advanced equipment in later generations, but only managing sails, ropes, and classical equipment such as rudders, which does not require much knowledge. Many times, the second mate is an outstanding person selected from the sailors. For example, Morientes was selected from the sailors. Originally, Morientes had no culture and no ambition to respond. But later, he went to the captain's school for 3 years of special training and mastered a lot of navigation knowledge. With his original experience as a sailor, he began to be competent for some jobs that captains and first mates can do. For example, observing astronomical phenomena, determining the direction and position of navigation. In addition, being able to record the log in writing. From then on, ambition began to sprout in Morientes' heart. After a few years, Morientes knew that he already had the ability to command the ship's navigation. At least, there is no problem in the Mediterranean. But what prevented him from becoming a captain was his origin and bloodline. Although many of those captains are not nobles, half of their ancestors are also nobles. Otherwise, at least they are descendants of wealthy businessmen. Otherwise, they can't afford to go to school. And the descendants of civilians rarely have the opportunity to receive education. Many captains are excellent astronomers and meteorologists themselves. For example, Amerigo and Columbus were both navigation and astronomy masters who were capable of becoming court scholars. In other words, those who can become captains are generally either children of declining nobles or children of wealthy merchants, and they have very strong knowledge. Of course, not every captain is a scholar. For example, some children of nobles rely on connections to become captains. Generally speaking, such captains who rely on connections will not take on the task of going to unfamiliar waters, but will only perform tasks on mature routes. Just like the Sanchez, it mainly operates in the northern half of the western Mediterranean. This kind of sea conditions are simple, there are no big waves in the Mediterranean, and there are old routes with rich records. Generally, it is a hot spot for noble children with connections to compete for positions. Just like the original captain and first mate of the Sanchez, both of them are from declining noble families. Although their families have declined, they are still children of nobles. Therefore, their abilities may not be better than Morientes, but they just occupy the positions of captain and first mate, which makes Morientes secretly hate them. Langton had asked other drinkers in the tavern about Morientes before, so he made targeted arrangements. It was very simple to chat up with drinkers, just buy them a drink. Sure enough, after buying Morientes a glass of medium-quality wine, Morientes became enthusiastic. Langton carefully made up a lie, claiming that his name was Tony, and that he was an Italian mercenary and had served as a squad leader. However, because he was not of noble birth, he could not be promoted to company captain, so he resigned in anger and became a businessman. After hearing Langton's experience, Morientes immediately regarded him as a confidant. Because he was also a victim of his bloodline. Under the stimulation of alcohol, the two talked more and more speculatively. Finally, Morientes told Langton about his distress, there was no hope of promotion. Compared to the army, the navy actually has more opportunities for promotion than the army. Because sailing is too dangerous, many noble children are unwilling to join the navy. Generally, the noble children who enter the navy are mostly children of small nobles or declining nobles. Real nobles rarely want to join the navy. Unless they want to be a fleet commander or something like that. Positions like captain are basically only sought after by the children of fallen nobles. But for a second mate like Morientes who comes from a fisherman's family, the captain and even the first mate are insurmountable mountains. Unless they have military merits. The military merits of the army are not given to the children of commoners, because there are too many children of nobles in the army. The navy is different, because there are relatively fewer children of nobles, so part of the military merits can always be shared with the children of commoners, and the future is better than that of the army. However, the risk is also great. Once the warship is sunk, everyone is finished. It is difficult for someone like Morientes, who has become the second mate, to be promoted to the first mate and captain under normal circumstances. But if he has made contributions, it is not impossible. So, Langton began to instigate Morientes to take this opportunity to do something to make the Spanish royal family happy. For example, spread smallpox to France. What? Spread smallpox? Are you crazy? You will be excommunicated by the Pope. Morientes shook his head repeatedly after hearing the advice of his new friend Langton. After all, the precedent of Tolani is there. Langton said with some disdain, you didn't do it, but the French did it. Don't you know that smallpox has been spread to the Spanish mainland? Morientes hesitated, wasn't it done by Torini from Venice? Langton pretended to be disdainful, naive. Torini is about to die, why did he do this? Isn't it because someone is supporting him to do this behind the scenes? You mean? Morientes began to imagine. Yes, it was secretly supported by the French. I heard that before Torini sent a ship to the Spanish mainland, he was contacted by a French envoy. Langton whispered mysteriously. You mean, this was instigated by the French? Morientes widened his eyes. Almost, but no one has evidence, alas. Morientes was immediately angry, the French are so shameless. If I, alas, really want to spread smallpox to France, I will be excommunicated if the Vatican finds out. In the end, Morientes was still scared. But Langton had already prepared a plan for him. I heard that you captured a lot of French miners at Mount Vesuvius. The French had originally mined volcanic ash at Mount Vesuvius, and had dispatched a lot of volcanic ash miners from the southern coastal areas. After Gonzalo's army occupied Mount Vesuvius, these people were captured by the Spanish and forced to dig trenches and build fortifications by the Spanish army. For example, on Capri Island, the Spaniards expanded the local dock here to dock Spanish warships. And the expansion of the dock required hundreds of French workers. What do you mean? If you were asked to send smallpox patients from Naples directly to France, you would definitely be criticized. But if these French workers contracted smallpox themselves, and you sent them back home without knowing it? Langton said slowly. His strategy was to arrange for smallpox patients to come into contact with these French workers on the island, so that these people would be infected with smallpox. Later, Morientes used the warship Sanchez to send these people back to mainland France, in the name of releasing them to go home and reunite with their families. In this way, he could clear himself of the charge of deliberately spreading smallpox to a certain extent. Of course, it is unlikely to completely clear the charge, but Langdon would not tell Morientes this when he was fooling him. Instead, he would try to pick out the good things and never mention the bad things. Stimulated by the bright prospect of being promoted to first mate or even captain after making meritorious service, Morientes finally lost his mind and, under Langdon's instigation, decided to do this. Chapter 1760, A Serious Epidemic. There are indeed hundreds of French laborers on Capri, who were transferred from Mount Vesuvius. Now, they are all locked up in the military camp on the island. When there is work to do, they will be monitored and come out to work. Modest did not take away the rights of these French laborers, so he began to lobby the Spanish official on the island, Cullis, to gain control of these French laborers and quietly revealed his plan. To be honest, Cullis also supported this plan in his heart. But thinking of Tolini's fate, Cullis did not dare to mess around. So he reported the matter to Gonzalo. Gonzalo is worried about the smallpox infection in mainland Spain. He is worried that Spain, which has been baptized by smallpox, will be suppressed by France. For strategic reasons, Gonzalo decided to support Modest's approach. Indeed, this is a good way with the lowest cost. However, Gonzalo also knows that this matter is very risky. Tolani has already risked his life for this matter. Whoever does this will be in danger. But if he doesn't do it, the French will happily watch Spain suffer misfortune and take the opportunity to suppress Spain. Even in the conflict with the Kingdom of Naples, Spain will eventually lose. After thinking about it, Gonzalo secretly ordered Cullis to acquiesce to Modest's approach, but never publicly support it, especially not to leave any written traces. Obviously, Gonzalo intends to sacrifice Modest, the unlucky guy. And the unlucky Modest didn't know that after Cullis hinted that he could act, he sent people to Naples to find smallpox patients to infect the hundreds of French laborers. And Cullis also tacitly withdrew the guards on the edge of the labor camp to prevent the guards from being infected. Then, Modest's sailors who had smallpox took over the management of the labor camp. Without knowing it, hundreds of French laborers worked together with a dozen patients who were infected with smallpox but had not yet broken out. Because it was too hot, many people were shirtless, which made it easier for the smallpox virus to spread. A few days later, seeing that the smallpox patients were about to get sick, Modest quietly sent them away. Subsequently, these French laborers were declared pardoned by Modest and sent back to France by ship. These French laborers were very excited when they heard that they were pardoned and could be sent back to their hometown. But they didn't know that they had already worsened several smallpox patients for several days. After Modest sent a ship to send them to the southern coast of France, these French laborers whose illness had not yet broken out rushed back to their respective villages excitedly. After Modest finished this big thing, he came back and waited for the reward. But he didn't know that Gonzalo had already talked to Juan III and planned to give up this guy. However, Juan III was also humane and promised that Modest's eldest son would become a knight in the future. Half a month later, smallpox broke out in southern France. And Gonzalo promptly pushed the responsibility to Modest. When the unfortunate Modest learned that Gonzalo was going to commit suicide by taking poison, his face was full of confusion. The ending shouldn't be like this. The ending shouldn't be like this. If you are willing to commit suicide and take all the responsibilities, your eldest son Modest can become a fief knight in the future. This is not my promise, it is the promise of the one above. Gonzalo pointed to the sky, indicating that it was an instruction from above. The meaning is very simple, it is the king's promise. Obviously, the king is also satisfied with his actions, but under pressure from public opinion, he dare not reward him. Therefore, the reward can only be given to his child. Fief Knight. Modest's eyes finally lighted up. That night, Modest committed suicide by taking poison in the prison on Capri Island, and wrote a confession, taking all the charges. Gonzalo is an honest man and feels sorry for Modest. So, after Modest's death, he openly condemned this behavior, but secretly sent Modest's younger brother Vagara to the captain's school, intending to train him as a future captain, which was also a disguised compensation for Modest's family. After all, Modest's eldest son, Modest Jr., was only 10 years old. It would take more than 10 years for him to grow up and find an excuse to be knighted. In the past 10 years, their family has no pillars, and it is easy to collapse. So Gonzalo began to train Modest's younger brother Vagara. Wait until Modest Jr. is an adult, and then train him. Of course, maybe he can't wait for that day, but Juan III will definitely wait. After all, Juan III is still young. However, Juan III has no energy to think about anything else at this time, because smallpox broke out in Spain. Because it was not discovered in time, although Spain took some measures, it was still too late. When Gonzalo brought back the methods of controlling the epidemic that he had learned from Behaiguashue, the smallpox epidemic in Spain was out of control. Several coastal villages that were originally infected with smallpox brought smallpox into the city when residents with latent smallpox entered the city to purchase daily necessities. Then, it was taken to all parts of the country by merchants in the city. Although Juan III and Ferdinand II both issued orders to ban the movement of the population across the country, it was still a little late. After all, there were no telegraphs in this era. Many orders were passed to the local areas several days later. And during this time difference, there were merchants traveling north and south to spread smallpox. In desperation, Juan III and Ferdinand II could only make up for it as much as possible. While cutting off the trade routes of various cities, in order to ensure the supply of food, thousands of able-bodied men who had had smallpox were selected to transport food to various cities to avoid starvation. As for rural areas, there is no need to transport food, because rural estates generally have food storage. Only urban residents need a continuous supply of food. However, Spain is so large and mountainous. In some mountainous areas, the message transmission is not smooth, and there is no time to block the roads to prohibit the entry of outsiders. In short, the epidemic has become a big problem in Spain. And France is even worse. Because the French have a bad relationship with the North Sea Kingdom, they are not very familiar with the advanced epidemic prevention and control measures of the North Sea Kingdom. Therefore, when smallpox broke out in the coastal areas of southern France, the French failed to take appropriate measures to control the epidemic in time. Marseille, a famous coastal city, became an important disaster area for smallpox because of the passing of merchants. Because there was no restriction on residents' travel, smallpox patients ran all over the city. Half of the residents of Marseille, a large French city with a population of more than 20,000, were infected with smallpox. Then, a large number of residents fled Marseille to avoid contracting smallpox, a vicious epidemic. But some of the people who escaped were also infected with smallpox. As a result, smallpox continued to spread to surrounding areas. In a relatively short period of time, almost all areas along the Mediterranean coast of France were affected by the smallpox epidemic, and the number of people affected was as high as 1 million. There was no way, France had a large population.